Earth, fire, air, water. When I was a boy, my favorite show, Avatar, told me the story of how Aang and his friends heroically ended the 100-Year War. Michael Dante DiMartino and Bryan Konietzko transformed the series into one of the greatest shows of all time. A show where children and adults from all over the world could enjoy and vibe together in peace and harmony. They named this great series Avatar: The Last Airbender. Mike and Bryan accomplished many remarkable things with their show, but sadly, its time in this world came to an end. But like the cycle of the seasons, the cycle of the Avatar began anew. Well, what have we here?
Gay.
So, as many of you probably know, I've garnered a bit of a reputation for myself in the Avatar community as the defending Korra guy. It's a title that I didn't really ask for, but I'm kinda stuck with it now anyways, so, fuck me, right? I know a lot of you are probably subscribed to this channel from that original video, but if I'm being completely honest, that video has been one of my biggest regrets. iDubbbz moment. Now, I'm not saying I don't agree with it anymore, because I am still very based and I still agree with many of the points in it, but my problem with this video was that the point of it when I made it was to put to bed all of this division within the Avatar fandom about the series, because I saw that it was often overhated and that many of the minor criticisms of it were undeserved. Even if I wasn't an Avatar fan, just an outsider looking in, I still probably would have thought that that shit was overblown most of the time. Kind of like Star Wars, except that shit gay. All that I wanted to do was get people to think more rationally about how they criticized it and other media in general. But in doing that video, I think I've made the divide even worse. Probably because I was like exaggeratedly and comedically angry in it, but yeah, nostalgia critic moment. Hey guys, nostalgia critic here. People who liked the show and people who hated the show both misinterpreted the video, and it just made everything worse in my opinion. At least at the time. I think it's gotten better recently, but at the time it was fucked. People who already liked the show saw it as validation for why they should continue to like it and stand up against the haters, while people who hated it or were even just mildly critical saw it as some fanboy reeing that not everybody likes a show that they do. Viewing this show through the lens of trying to defend its name from people who happen to not like it is one of the worst things that I have ever done as an Avatar fan, and today, I aim to fix that. Today, I want to do this show justice and talk about it properly. I've never really given my true, raw opinions on this series as a whole, despite talking about it a lot over the years. So now, we're gonna do just that, in a video that's very overly long. We are talking the good, the bad, the ugly, just everything about this show, and why at the end of the day, I feel that it is a worthy addition to the Avatar series. Ladies and gentlemen, I am your host, MattCMG, and this is the Legend of Korra video. The Legend of Korra video. The big one. It's the video. Nobody has ever made a video about this series as good as mine. I'm gonna die on this. I will. I'm gonna suck a dick and die. Suck a dick and fall asleep. So let's flash back to 2010. It had been 2 years since the prolific Avatar: The Last Airbender concluded its run and altered the animation landscape forever. Then, a guy named M. Night Shyamalan came through and said, "Nah." In an effort to capitalize on the series' popularity and to redeem themselves from the panned live-action film, Nickelodeon came to series creators Michael Dante DiMartino and Bryan Konietzko to develop a mini-series set in the world of Avatar. Unlike the original series, where the duo was essentially creating an entire world with history and lore from scratch, things were pretty cut and dry this time around. They already had the world and lore and all of that shit already established, meaning they could focus more on characters and story this time around, with opportunities to expand the world further than they already have. Naturally, they eventually decided to focus on the Avatar after Aang, resulting in Korra. After the live-action film was as panned as it was, it's actually somewhat surprising that Nickelodeon would even want to touch the franchise again, and while I think their willingness to is a testament to the original series' quality and impact, I also think it indicates something else. The Legend of Korra was the Avatar series' shot at redemption. Korra was, in many ways, meant as a response to the original series, because at the time, there hadn't been much good Avatar content since the original series ended in 2008. So, while the initial development of Avatar was no doubt difficult, it seems to me that Korra's might have been even harder, since not only only did they need to evolve the world they've created and create compelling characters to fit that world, but they also had to prove that their original creation wasn't just lightning in a bottle. It's often rumored that Nickelodeon offered Varrick an ultimatum between an animated adaptation of The Search or The Legend of Korra, which doesn't really make a whole lot of sense considering The Search didn't release until 2013, which was a whole year after Korra's release, meaning it's unlikely they had things planned out this far ahead. But true or not, the fact that they chose to do Korra instead of revisiting the characters that we already know worked indicates to me that this show was in no way a cash grab. If they were in this for the money and nothing else, they would have just made more of the gang, but they chose not to do that. There was real passion behind the show, right? They wanted to try something new and tell stories that these creators wanted to tell. And through all of this discourse around the show these days, I think this is something people often forget. Korra was just as much of a passion project as Avatar was, and that's how we get true art. The Legend of Korra might not have the most interesting or detailed creation, but I think this is a very important context to view the show through. And with that Wikipedia bullshit out of the way, let's really get into it. Of course, The Legend of Korra would not be worthy of its legendary title without its titular character, Avatar Korra. She is rightfully the focus of the story, with her character development absolutely carrying the entire show. Wanna know why she's so fucking ripped? It's from carrying this entire show on her fucking back. In fact, I would even argue that she is one of the most complex and interesting characters in all of Avatar because she has so much going on. I've talked about her character arc here and there in the past, but this time I am leaving no stone unturned. Because to truly understand this show and what it is truly about, you need to understand every facet of Korra's character, including her big fat tits. I should not put that in the video. That is not going in. When following up a series of the caliber of Avatar, a show known for its character building, it's no wonder that Varrick came out the gates guns a-blazing when it came to constructing Korra. From her very introduction, it is made clear that though she is the reincarnation of our beloved bald boy, she is nothing like him. In fact, it's pretty common knowledge within the fandom at this point that making Korra as opposite to Aang as humanly possible was their intention, which is shown in several interesting yet really obvious ways. Firstly, the most obvious, bending. While Aang began his journey only knowing airbending and slowly learned the other three elements along the way, Korra was the exact opposite. She could perform simple water, earth, and fire bending at just the age of 4 and slowly masters them over the course of 13 years, yet has no aptitude for airbending at all. Through this display of bending ability in this brief introductory scene, though it is a bit annoying, we do get an immediate sense of Korra's personality. We know from Avatar that each element represents different states of mind and reflects the user's personality. Aang's airbending represented many things, such as his connection to his culture and his identity as an air nomad, but also his free-spirited nature. Aang was a free, fun-loving kid, and this aspect of his personality is represented through air, which, as we all know, is the element of freedom. You're gonna hear me say that a lot throughout this segment. By learning the other elements, he learns discipline and to be able to confront the parts of himself that he never has before. Korra is the exact opposite. Though her water bending seems to only be there out of obligation to the audience because, she is a water tribe avatar, so that would only make sense, her ability to bend earth and fire represents two major parts of her personality. She is stubborn like earth and passionate and hot-headed like fire. For Aang, these were good things, but only because of the order in which he learned the elements. Because Aang was who he was before learning the other three, he was able to learn such valuable lessons from them and gain a more balanced view of himself. Though he was a free spirit at heart, he could also learn to deal with change, be unmoving like a rock, or be furious like fire. But because Korra already had these three elements from the start, she never had to learn those same lessons. They come easy to her because they already suit her personality, but because of that, she doesn't have any of the nuance that Aang had to learn. Air is the only one that doesn't fit her personality, hence why she cannot bend it and doesn't really live that way. And this leads me into major difference number 2. Aang and Korra's upbringings and journeys shaped how they viewed their avatar status. As we all know, Aang traveled the world at the age of 12 and learned 3 elements in just under a year because of the literal fire under his ass to fulfill his destiny. And because of the way he was raised with the monks and the help of his friends, he was able to do all of that. His experiences during his journey made him the avatar that he was destined to be, even if it was something that he never wanted to be. Again, Korra is the exact opposite. Ever since she found out she was the avatar, that was all she ever wanted to be. But because the world has changed so much since Aang's time, Korra was never sent off on a journey like her predecessors were, instead being locked away in the South Pole to train with the White Lotus and do things the right way. Notice how I say right way in quotes, because it was obviously not the right way, because the avatar needs that real world experience. Korra is often described by detractors of the show as bratty, but you probably would be too if you were locked away for your entire childhood, had no real world experiences, and had everything handed to you from a young age. From as early as she could remember, being the avatar was Korra's biggest joy in life, and it shapes her identity in a major way. She was raised to be the avatar, so she grew up thinking that she had had to be, and it became so intertwined with her perception of herself that being the Avatar is her entire personality by that point. You know, it's commonly said that Aang was a good person who had to learn how to be the Avatar, while Korra was an Avatar who had to learn how to be a good person. And I think that sentiment holds pretty true. Like I mentioned, Aang's journey is what shaped him and made him. Same goes for the other past Avatars, but Korra is the first one to not have had that life experience that is crucial to being the Avatar. By being locked away, she can't see the world that she's meant to protect, so this lack of freedom in any aspect of her life keeps her from reaching her fullest potential. And there's that word again. Freedom. It's made apparent from just the first episode alone that Korra does not feel free. Yet another reason why she is unable to airbend. One of my favorite scenes in the whole show is the scene of her riding Naga across the tundra while the fucking music swells in the background. It's just perfection because it shows how desperately Korra wishes to be free, but simply cannot be. It's almost melancholic in a way. It's a great scene. This is precisely the reason that Katara lets her run away, because she knows how Aang's journey mattered to him, so she believes the same should be for Korra. Even upon arriving in Republic City, being quite literally freer than she's ever been, her continued inability to airbend reflects that she does not feel free. For one thing, she's living in Aang's shadow, both in and out of universe, which creates a mental block. Aang was such a prolific figure to the world, so people in the Avatar universe love and respect him even after death. When Korra arrives in the city, she feels like she needs to live up to his legacy, and constantly thinks that she is failing at doing so, which is something that carries through the entire first season. This also works in a meta context, since fans back then and even now see Aang, and by extension the entirety of Avatar: The Last Airbender, as these untouchable, larger-than-life entities, so Korra struggles to live up to those standards both in universe and real life. Well, there's a little double entendre there. Her devotion to her role as the Avatar keeps her too focused on being the next Aang, when she should have been focusing on being a better Korra, the latter of which somewhat defines her character in Book 4. We'll get to that a little later, I tell you what. Another thing holding Korra back throughout the first season is her fear of Amon. I'll talk about him on his own later, but for right now, the premise of the character is really all that matters. As a man who can permanently take bending away from people, he quite literally threatens Korra's very identity. Since she's not very spiritual at first, her only real concept of her Avatar duties is her ability to bend the four elements, and she has an extremely limited and warped view of what that entails, again, because they came so easy to her. Bending is the one thing she's best at, so of course she holds that close to her chest, you know what I mean? We know from Avatar that bending is a part of who somebody is on a deep personal and spiritual level. You know, it shapes everyone's identity, and this is true for Korra more than anybody. Amon threatens all of that, so it's no wonder that Korra fears him as much as she does. As early as the 4th episode of the series, Korra is in denial of this fear, made all the worse by her stubborn and arrogant personality. This constant fear of losing who she is to Amon keeps her from ever being free, hence why she can't airbend or enter the Avatar state. You know, she finally escapes her solitude in the South Pole and makes it to the city where dreams come true, only to almost immediately learn that there is a guy out there who threatens her very existence. So her freedom gained from coming to the city is immediately overshadowed by this deep-seated fear of losing it all that she doesn't even really know about yet. She constantly fears something throughout this season, often many things at once, to the point where she doesn't even know what she's afraid of anymore. It's her fear of Amon, her fear of losing her identity, her fear of not being liked by the public or being a good Avatar, and her fear of losing love. She deals with all of those things at once, and they are all deeply intertwined. Of course, her most prevalent of these fears is the fear of losing her bending to Amon, which she is forced to face when Amon does the very thing she's been afraid of for so long. Her entire life, her whole identity as the Avatar is taken away from her in an instant. This is obviously an incredibly debilitating moment, but even in the face of this hopeless situation, Korra finds the strength to keep fighting like the bad bitch that she is. In a last-ditch effort to prevent what happened to her and so many others from happening to Mako, Korra unintentionally unlocks her ability to airbend that she's been struggling with for the entire season. While we can certainly question how this makes sense lore-wise, as many people already have, believe me, I fucking know, this scene is thematically one of the best in the whole series. Look at the context of the situation, right? Korra has been unable to airbend all season as a clear representation of all the things in her life that are holding her back, whether they be external threats like Amon or internal ones like her messy love life. Every time she tried to make things in the city better, she ended up just making them worse. A child who spent her whole life believing that her identity is being the Avatar, having that entire sense of self taken away by a crazy man with powers that she believed to be beyond her own. All of this comes into a head in this final fight with Amon, but now the tables have turned. She is no longer confused about her feelings for Mako. She now understands firsthand how truly evil it is to take someone's bending away, and she is no longer afraid of losing her bending because she has nothing left to lose. How much freer could you be when you know what you want and have nothing else holding you back? Korra unlocking airbending is symbolic of her breaking away from the shackles that have been holding her back her whole life, because now she is free just like air. Except, not really. Even though she has unlocked airbending, the damage has already been done. She is unable to restore the other elements, putting her into a similar position to Aang 70 years ago. No longer viewing herself as the Avatar, she has a bit of an existential crisis. Who is Korra if she is not the Avatar? This is an answer that she doesn't have right now, with her struggles to connect with her past lives still proving to be a major hindrance to achieving her role as the Avatar. While in the moment she was able to free herself from her troubles, long term there are some more dire psychological effects. In a depressive bout, Korra stands at the edge of a cliff staring off into the horizon as she begins to cry. Some fans interpret this as her contemplating suicide, and while I don't think that was what the writers were intending, I can definitely see why people would think that. You know, the imagery of a single tear falling off the edge symbolizing the sorrow that would all go away if she just jumped. It makes sense, I just don't quite buy it. Anyways though, Korra is without a doubt at her lowest point here. But then something crazy happens. Okay, this is crazy. After struggling all season to connect with her past lives, Korra is approached by a vision of Aang and all of the other past avatars. And in a display of energy-bending fuckery, he restores Korra's bending and gives her access to the avatar state, which also allows her to undo the effects of Amon's super chi block. And okay, I get it, right? There's a lot to criticize about this scene. Believe me, I'll get into the logistics of this later, but in terms of just pure vibes, this scene fucks so hard. You know, the initial surprise of Aang's appearance, all of the past avatars showing up, Korra getting her bending back all while her theme swells in the background and she unlocks the avatar state for the first time. I don't give a fuck how little sense that makes. That is goated as fuck and you cannot convince me otherwise. This is actually the first time we hear Korra's avatar state theme, and I love how at first it's the same melody as Aang's, but then it transforms to become a little bit different, reflecting how Korra is now her own avatar, but still with those little connecting threads to the original show. One of these connecting threads is also found in Aang's famous line.
When we hit our lowest point, we are open to the greatest change.
This is probably the most iconic quote to come out of the Legend of Korra, and it's clear to see why. Aang keeps it real, as we all know, so of course he'd spit some fucking heat like this, you know? But in the context of the series as a whole, I think this perfectly describes Korra's journey in the following seasons. Every time she loses something, whether that be literal or emotional, she reaches a new low point in her life, but she is always able to overcome that by embracing and overcoming the greatest of changes. Whether it be losing her bending, losing the past avatars, or being crippled by Zaheer, she always found a way to bounce back because it is at our lowest points that we find the strength to go on. There's some indomitable human spirit type shit. That all being said, Korra's arc throughout book 1 is also about patience. Something you're gonna need to have if you want to fucking make it through this video. She's quick to jump into situations without thinking them through or considering the consequences, and it's one of her biggest flaws as a person. Through Tenzin's teachings and the whole conflict with the Equalist, she learns to become more patient and level-headed in times of stress. She's upset with herself for not being able to airbend right away and for not being very spiritually inclined, and takes that out on others and herself. She finds that when she actually takes the time to absorb these things, she can grasp them, but again, it takes time. While she got fed up with her airbending training, she still ended up finding a method that worked for her, and she continues to practice it even with everything going on. She's determined, but patient. When she is captured by Amon, she takes this as an opportunity to connect to her past lives, and because she actually needed real wisdom this time, she was able to connect to Aang. This patience is also demonstrated in this very same scene, where to escape the Equalist, she quite literally waits for her time to strike. And this is a philosophy that carries through after Amon has taken over the city. It makes sense why she was the way she was because of how she was raised. You know, she's a little bit spoiled in many ways, but just because she's naturally talented in one area doesn't mean she's talented in another, and to become skilled at them, she needs to be patient. This is something that Korra continues to struggle with throughout the series to a much lesser degree, and she becomes much more conscious of it and is better able to control it after the first season. Going into season 2, Korra has a slight reboot for her character, and I use the term reboot very loosely because it is the writers kinda soft resetting her after her book 1 character growth, which again, I'll get into my criticisms of later, but if you look at things from her perspective, it kinda makes sense why she starts this way. The ending of book 1 has Korra getting her bending straight up given back to her by Aang with the avatar state as a bonus. And knowing who Korra is as a person, it makes sense that she would take this for granted. She begins book 2 more arrogant and self-centered than ever because now that she's a fully realized avatar in the most standard sense, she thinks that nobody can step to her. It's not that she thinks the 4 elements are tools again, because she knows that's not the case, but she feels that she's on a roll since defeating Amon, that her arrogance gets the better of her. At this point, she thinks that if any new threat to the world were to arise, she would be able to handle it with her new powers. Her abuse of the avatar state throughout the early episodes of this season is often a point of criticism for the character, when I feel that this is one of the most important parts of her character because it's what triggers this spiritual awakening within her. Throughout book 1, Korra's lack of spiritual ability seemed like it was meant to be a major focus, but is only touched on a few times throughout and is never properly resolved, even counting that Aang scene. She still has not had any proper spiritual training or really touched that side of being the avatar at all yet. In dealing with Unalaq, she is forced to confront this stuff. You know, she is forced to acknowledge acknowledge that her abuse of the Avatar state and her generally un-Avatar-like actions have put her in a bad place with the spirits, and therefore have put her in a bad place as the spiritual bridge. Seeing Unalaq in action shows her that she still has a lot to learn about spirituality, hence why she is so eager to learn from him. This doesn't really settle in fully until she meets Wan, and by seeing the origins of the Avatar, she understands why the Avatar is the bridge between humans and spirits. To fulfill that goal, she can't be focusing all of her time on human conflict and has to take the needs of spirits into account. She has to understand that there is a balance between the Avatar's duties, and she has not been maintaining that balance thus far, especially considering her very shallow view of spirituality by this point. I think one of the most important and honestly underrated things that Korra learns throughout the series comes at the end of Book 2. People love to shit on Book 2 for a lot of reasons, but I find it hard to agree when it carries so much thematic weight at the end. I am of course referring to Korra meeting Wan and losing her connections to the past Avatars. This was a move that, again, not a lot of fans were too fond of. I personally hate it, and I will discuss why at length later, but I love what it means thematically and for Korra's character. In meeting Avatar Wan and learning of his story, she gains a much greater respect for what it means to be the Avatar. In her fight with Unalaq, she fights to protect that for the sake of the whole world, as she now understands how necessary the Avatar is. She finally sees that her powers aren't some toy to be played with in trivial matters. When that power is not enough and she loses Rava and subsequently her connections to all of her past lives, she fully faces the consequences of abusing the Avatar state and believes that she has failed. Bro, when she apologizes to Tenzin for losing her connection to Aang, that shit fucks me up, bro. Like, I get a little fucking moist. My eyes get a little moist. A little bit sexually moist. But through a classic Tenzin motivational speech, Korra comes to realize that the true power of the Avatar was never Rava's spirit magic, but rather the power of humanity and the ability to keep going when things get bad. Again, lowest point, greatest change. And sure, giant spirit laser beams are pretty dumb, but this represents Korra's newfound belief in herself. Not in the Avatar, but in herself. Korra becomes a legend because of who she is, not what she is. But without a doubt, one of Korra's most pivotal decisions in the series is her choice to leave the spirit portals open, allowing humans and spirits to travel between the two realms as they please. She comes to this conclusion after considering what Unalaq's true goal was at its core, which was to reunite humans and spirits. More importantly, this choice is ultimately the culmination of her meeting with Wan and losing the past Avatars. She says in her final speech,
"I've realized that even though we should learn from those who came before us, we must also forge our own path."
Put simply, or I guess more complexly because I'm a pretentious fuck, it may have been the right decision at the time for Wan to close the portals, and it's great that the Avatar has always had access to the experiences of their past lives, but those things that happened in the past, are not the end-all be-all. We can learn from the past, but it does not always have the answers.
You ain't got the answers, man! You ain't got the answers!
Sometimes the past is an example of the wrong thing to do, and if we want to create a better future, we need to accept that the past and its teachings can be flawed. Leaving the portals open is one of Korra's most important decisions, because not only does it show that she's learned that the past isn't always right, but also that even if she's making the wrong decision, she's going to stick by it and make it work regardless of the consequences. In this particular context, there will never be peace between humans and spirits if they are separated all the time, so leaving the portals open gives them opportunity to interact and therefore understand each other better. Korra fulfills her duty as the spirit bridge by destroying the bridge entirely. It's a very mature conclusion for her to come to, since this is truly the first major decision that she makes as the Avatar completely on her own. Regardless of if you agree with it, this is without a doubt an important moment. Facing the consequences of her choices becomes a much larger focus in Book 3. Leaving the portals open had a severe butterfly effect, with spirit vines overtaking Republic City and displacing hundreds if not thousands of people, along with a slew of other effects. Airbenders have returned to the world as a result of harmonic convergence, which is great, but now one of those airbenders is a crazy man who wants to kill the Avatar and throw the world into chaos. This one decision by Korra brought back an entire nation, but also led to the rise of arguably her greatest enemy, Zaheer, the actions of whom also led to the rise of her other greatest enemy, Kuvira. Korra indirectly creates her enemies based on this one decision, and though this resolved in her own suffering, it's suffering that she was willing to go through if it meant staying true to her vision as the Avatar. She is going to stand by the decision that she made, even if it meant she would suffer for it. And let me tell you, she fucking does. So now let's talk about arguably the biggest draw to Korra's character, severe mental trauma. I know, right? Such an overdone thing to talk about with this character, and even just in general these days. You know, it's such an overdone thing. But in this context, it is certainly important to talk about her PTSD.
Post-traumatic Down syndrome.
After her immense display of badassery against Zaheer, where she fucks this dude up in the Avatar state while fighting off a deadly poison, Korra is left crippled and weak, unable to perform the most basic of tasks, let alone her Avatar duties. Though the Airbenders will take over in her stead, it's clear that Korra has more than just her physical wounds to deal with. While she tries to repress and deny it, Korra is constantly haunted by her near-death experience with Zaheer. Anytime she tries to do anything related to being the Avatar, she is brought straight back to that moment where she was almost brutally killed. And honestly, who could blame her? This entire encounter encounter with the Red Lotus was stressful as fuck, since it begins with Korra literally giving herself up to the enemy, fighting back and thinking that her father is dead, being chained up, tortured, and poisoned, and being forced into the Avatar state to keep herself alive, culminating in her almost losing the fight by getting the air ripped out of her lungs. It ain't exactly picnics and fucking daisies, right? This is without a doubt the hardest thing Korra has had to go through, so of course it fucking ruins her mental state. As we all know, Korra loves being the Avatar, but now that she can't be right now, she feels useless to the world. She feels like the world doesn't need or want her anymore, with all her friends off fixing the world in a way that she can't, and many common folk not really caring about the Avatar anymore. Being the Avatar is central to her identity, her own self-image, so how does she react when the world doesn't want her for who she is anymore? With the world moving on without her, she feels as though there is no place for her anymore. So what does she do? She goes off to find a new place. As the title may suggest, the episode Korra Alone explores Korra's initial healing process. Before she is able to heal her physical wounds, there is a mental barrier she first must get past. She doesn't believe that she can come back from this, which leads to a form of depression. But through Katara's coaching, she is able to come out of this and be able to function again. What Katara teaches her is that it all starts with a mindset. A grind set, if you will. In order to get better, you have to want to get better. And if you really want it, you gotta work for it. This sentiment is later reinforced by Toph, who also tries to help Korra through this very process. Toph tells her that if she's still being haunted by her past, she'll never be able to face her future. She then takes her to the Banyan Grove tree where Aang learned about everything being connected, and it's here that Korra learns to reconnect with the world. And later, Korra bends the remaining metal poison out of her body without any help from Toph. Toph's lessons are very important here because they represent some very important aspects of the healing process. Firstly, you gotta let the past go. I know it's easy to say, hey man, just forget about your traumatic experiences, but that's not what she's saying at all. Letting the past affect you in the present will only keep you from the future. In accepting that her old enemies have wronged her, Korra realizes that there's no way that they can harm her now, meaning that she can now move on with her life without that fear. Toph's next lesson is about reconnecting with the world, specifically the people who love you. One of the best ways to improve your mental state is to be around people who love and support you unconditionally, and Korra has been away from that for quite some time. She did have her parents back at the South Pole, but she was also incredibly depressed at the time, and, like we established, didn't really want to get better. But now that she is in a place where she wants to improve, the company of her friends and family will now have their desired effect. The swamp is often used in the Avatar universe as a symbol for human connection, and there is no better example of it than right here. And Toph's last lesson is actually something she didn't even do. When Korra first came to Toph, she asked her to use her superior earthbending to extract the remaining poison from her. When she tries this, Korra resists and causes herself more pain, prompting Toph to give up so as to not hurt her further. When Korra asks Toph to do this again, she refuses again, telling her that she has to bend it out herself. And this is obviously a metaphor. You can't just ask other people to solve your problems for you, because that's never going to work. You have to solve them yourself if you truly want them to go away. Help from others is quite important, but that can only get you so far in a situation like this, and I think it's fitting that Toph is the one to teach her this lesson, since she has had a long history of struggling to accept help from others. Korra's training with Toph and her interactions with Katara is all fucking great, and I love everything about it. However, even after all of this, the memory of Zaheer still keeps Korra from being the Avatar. Anytime she tries to enter the Avatar state or tap into some spiritual energy after this point, she is still reminded of this incident yet again. This is surprising, because didn't she just do that during her time with Toph? Well, yes and no. While she did acknowledge Zaheer at some point, she never determined him as the source of the problem. At this point, she did not know that the pain she felt from the Zaheer incident went as deep as it did. She thought it was on the same level as all of her other baggage, right? She thought that it was just her physical abilities being impeded by this memory, but didn't realize that it was actually affecting her psyche on a more subconscious level. She thought she found the solution by removing the poison, but that was just one step in finding the true solution. And that's the thing about overcoming shit like this. There are going to be many solutions along the way, and some may feel like they work the first time, but in actuality they don't work long term. This then brings me to one of my favorite scenes in one of my favorite episodes. And while I have done a dedicated video about it, I'm going to talk about it again, Beyond the Wilds, in which Korra goes to confront Zaheer. She thinks that by facing the man responsible for her suffering that she'll be able to see that he is not a threat anymore, to put herself at ease. What's made immediately clear in this interaction is that she still very much fears this man, even though he's chained up and in a position where he can't effectively use his bending. In an effort to help Korra against their common enemy, Zaheer offers to help guide her into the spirit world. When the two begin meditating, we see just how spiritually cut off Korra has become. This shot right here is one of my absolute favorites in the entire Avatar series, because there's a lot going on. The green energy shit on Zaheer's side is radiating toward him, showing that he's more spiritually in tune, while on Korra's side this energy only reaches so far and pales in comparison. This represents Korra's detachment from her spiritual side. After a while, Korra has another flashback, but Zaheer encourages her to let it play out. Similarly to what Toph teaches her, Zaheer says that by letting it play out, you are not fearing what could have been. While this was a traumatic experience that could have killed her, the fact is that it didn't. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger, and that's the mentality that Korra comes out of this experience with. She'll never be free of her trauma, but being able to accept that it happened is going to make her a better person in the long run. And while I know this scene gets a lot of shit for being a terrible way of dealing with trauma caused by another person, you should not not face your abuser. The fact that it's so divided is kind of part of the point. Different people find comfort in different places, and it affects them in different ways. It varies from person to person, so to tell someone that their way of dealing with their problems is wrong is very counterintuitive to the healing process. I mean, I ain't exactly a psychologist, but if it helps you and it ain't hurting nobody, then who fucking cares? Also, this is a fictional character, who gives a shit? Like I've been saying, Korra is a very multifaceted character, as she deals with so many different things that force her to improve, but above all else, Korra's story is one of finding meaning in your suffering. Whether you can relate to her struggles or not, it's undeniable that Korra has suffered far more than many other people, and has gone through some shit that would cause most people to give up on life. And you know what? She almost did. Her bending was taken away and crushed her entire perception of herself. She became the last avatar in the cycle and lost all the connections to her past lives. She was poisoned, beaten down, and almost killed by someone who was essentially her own creation, and she lived for 3 years carrying that pain in utter despair. These are terrible things that should not happen to anybody, but at the same time, they made her a better person in the long run. She may have lost her bending, but now she has a new appreciation for it and understands her purpose better. The original avatar cycle might have ended with her, but through her actions, she was able to create a brand new one. The connections to the past avatars may be gone, but now that forces Korra to find wisdom in other places and to not be so focused on the past. Zaheer may have almost killed her, but if she didn't deal with the aftermath of that in a healthy way, she would not have come back even stronger. Korra didn't need to endure all of this, but she is all the better for it, as through her suffering, she is able to find new meaning in life and becomes a better person. She spares Kuvira because of this very reason, that she sees how people can act when they are scared and afraid of their past, because that used to be her. If you recall back to the start of this section, I mentioned the classic Aang and Korra comparison, right? Aang was a good person who needed to learn to be the avatar. Korra was an avatar who needed to learn to be a good person. And through her struggles, I think she was able to do that. At her lowest points, she was open to the greatest change. And if what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, then I think Korra is a contender for the strongest avatar of all time, physically and emotionally. And look, right, I know I'm trying to avoid any of this like defending Korra shit, but I'm gonna do it anyways because it's kind of unavoidable. It's no wonder that the show is so divisive, because Korra as a character appeals to a very select group of people, those being people who can understand and relate to her. But since her character is so deeply intertwined with everything else about the show, it makes sense how people who didn't like her subsequently didn't like the rest of it. It is the Legend of Korra, after all, so your enjoyment of the series hinges almost entirely on how much you like Korra as a character. But to understand and appreciate this show, you need to understand and appreciate Korra. She's so complex that to deny that or just boil her character down to just 1 or 2 character traits is a massive disservice to the character. While I can't relate to her personally, I can definitely understand the journey that she goes through, and I would not hesitate to call her one of my favorite fictional characters of all time. If you disagree, then just remember, she's the Avatar, and motherfucker, you gotta deal with it.
I know I'm not the old Avatar I used to be, but I can do this.
I'm the Avatar! You gotta deal with it!
I have to find my own path as the Avatar.
So we have this great complex character like Korra, right? If you disagree,
Suck me!
It's great, right? But then you take a look at her supporting cast, and we have this fucking guy. Okay, I know, right? I don't want to sit here and shit all over the supporting cast, because almost none of them are as complex as Korra herself, and while I actually do have a lot of positive things to say about some of them later on, we'll get Mako out of the way first, because he's certainly got the least going on. Or at least that's what I originally thought when I started writing this video, because Mako is a lot deeper than people give him credit for. Mako is first introduced as a hot-headed, edgy firebender, who we later learn left a life of crime to become a pro-bender. Honestly, dude's cool as fuck. Like shit, bro, if I was a girl, I'd be swooning over him too. Or if I was gay.
I am not gay.
Through his pro-bending matches and some of his behavior in the outside world, we get a pretty good idea of his personality. He's a bit rough on the outside, but on the inside really only cares about keeping his brother on a good path. This ends up being a core part of his character, since this desire to protect evolves over the course of the series to be a lot more general. He starts off wanting only to protect Bolin and keep him safe, but in more ways than just physically. While he does work side jobs to help pay rent and what have you, he also tries to protect Bolin emotionally. As seen in the infamous love triangle episode, Mako advises against Bolin dating a teammate in Korra, since it will only lead to trouble. By this point, Mako also has an inkling that Korra has feelings for him and knows what's going on, so he tries to keep his brother out of the crossfire. Of course, he also tries to keep Bolin out of crime, since he knows that their old triad pals won't hesitate to take advantage of him. He just wants Bolin to have a good life, as he is the only family he has left. So far. Going into Book 2, Mako's protective nature evolves into a desire to protect Republic City, resulting in him becoming a cop with the goal of making detective. It's during the events of Books 2 and 3 that we get to see a side of Mako that was only briefly hinted at in Book 1. He's actually really fucking smart. This dude almost single-handedly cracks the lid wide open on Varrick's whole conspiracy to profit off the Water Tribe Civil War, and his detective skills were essential in weeding out Ai Wei as the traitor in Zaofu. He does some shady shit to prove it, but his observational skills and devotion to the cause is a classic case of the ends justifying the means, and that can at times make him a rather interesting character. There's this interesting mix between his street smarts and his more lawful side that make him somewhat morally nuanced in the storylines he's involved in. Shifting gears a bit though, books 1 and 2 have Mako at the center of a constant on and off love triangle with Korra and Asami, and it's kind of impossible not to talk about because it ends up being some of the only overt character development that he gets. In book 1, he's dating Asami even though he has conflicting feelings for Korra. While I think this wasn't handled the best, again, I'll get into it later, I do think it's interesting to see Mako's feelings develop over time. When he first meets Korra, he wants nothing to do with her and doesn't even seem to care that she's the Avatar. As the two begin hanging out more, they start to warm up to each other, and while Korra's feelings are made quite clear early on, Mako still seems very unsure about it. Though he eventually starts dating Asami, his feelings for Korra start to become more clear and he slowly realizes that he does like her, but that would also not be fair to Asami. People like to portray this whole thing as everybody being a dick, but I like how Mako apologizes to Asami for everything that's happened because yeah, it's kind of fucked up how he started obviously falling for Korra while they were still together. He was unfair to her and doesn't know how to make it up to her, so the best he can do is apologize. This takes a great level of maturity, and while it is a bit melodramatic and a little bit cliche, it does show great growth on Mako's part. Then we get to book 2, which begins with Korra and Mako having been together for a while. It's made clear right off the bat that these two simply are just not compatible, and this is by design. If I may quote the most overplayed Eminem song, it's what happens when a tornado meets a volcano. I'm a lyrical miracle, spiritual lyrical individual. I'm Eminem slamming them, and I'm Eminem, and I'm eating M&Ms, and I'm stabbing them with a pen, and I'm fucking gay with them. These two are just too hot-headed on their own, so together they clash way too much, exasperated by the fact that Korra wants Mako to be a yes man when she knows that Mako is the kind of guy to tell it like it is. When Mako does try to tell it like it is and give his honest opinion or advice that he thinks is helpful, she blows up at him, which then causes him to blow up at her. They just didn't work, and by the end of the season they both acknowledge this. That is, of course, only after Mako gets back with Asami on the down low after he and Korra break up the first time. You can really tell that Mako knows this whole thing is wrong, but let's be real. Who could say no to this woman? Bro, like if a hot rich girl asked me to bark, I would put on a leash and go fucking crazy. Some fucking Makima Denji type shit. But hey Victoria Justice. If you're looking for a dog, I might be your guy. Jokes aside though, the only reason this situation became a problem was because of Korra's amnesia. Despite this story beat being included for literally no actual reason, Korra forgets that she and Mako broke up, which leaves him in a very uncomfortable position when she kisses him in front of Asami, thinking they're still together. He then proceeds to lie about them breaking up, again, in front of Asami. Could you possibly take a bigger L, dude? Dude fumbled the bag harder than anyone I have ever seen, bro. This without a doubt ruins any chances he had with either of them, because Asami now knows that he will always pick Korra over her, and Korra knows that their personalities just don't mesh well in this context. The reason that I mentioned all of this relationship drama is because, while melodramatic, it's very important for Mako's arc going into book 3. After all of this bullshit, he has no clue how to act around these two now because it's just awkward to be around your exes like that, you know what I mean? This is made even worse by the fact that now your two exes are hanging out more, meaning you now have to deal with both of them at once. He almost kicks himself out of Team Avatar for this very reason, but what he learns throughout the season, albeit in some very subtle and indirect ways, is that he needs to be able to change his view of Korra and Asami and put the bullshit aside in order to become platonic friends again. While uncomfortable, it is possible, because yeah, they used to date, but it's been established that there's no bad blood between any of them, and that the three of them all work better as friends. Well, maybe not these two, but you know what I mean. Korra be like, I am not gay. I have relationships with women. Sex with men. And I got news for you. That means you're bisexual. Taking things outside of romance though, book 3 also has a very few important moments for Mako. After getting lost in the slums of Ba Sing Se, Mako and Bolin coincidentally end up running into their extended family who they didn't even know existed. This actually leads me into something I haven't talked about yet, but probably should have earlier, Mako's scarf and its backstory. Mako and Bolin's parents were killed by a firebender when they were very young, leaving the two of them to fend for themselves on the streets of Republic City. The only thing Mako has to remember his father by is his red scarf, which he wears throughout the majority of books 1 and 2. In meeting his grandmother Yin, who, no, as much as I'd love to see it, is not the woman from the Serpent's Pass, Mako shows a great level of maturity. His whole life, he's grown up needing that scarf to feel protected and safe because that's how his father made him feel. By giving this to his grandmother, she now feels protected and safe. Mako became a man by passing on this protective desire to the rest of his family, just like his dad would have. Probably. We've never actually met the guy. Going into book 4, Mako is mostly pushed to the side, with his primary purpose being to serve as Prince Wu's bodyguard. He does not fucking like this dude, and it's played for laughs a lot, lot, but we also see that Mako is capable of opening up to Wu and starts to care for him a bit. So this is what we call the classic virgin Chad dynamic, right? Because Wu is the most insecure little virgin bitch of all time, while Mako is the cool, calm Chad. Mako sees how pathetic the prince is and seems to genuinely want to help him become a better person and a better leader. Nobody wants a whiny little bitch as their ruler, and Mako serves as a microcosm of this because he's had to deal with Wu's shit for far longer than anyone else. He's been around the block a few times and he knows what a good leader needs to be, and Wu does not fit that criteria, and in a way, he kind of feels bad for him. With protection being such a big motif for Mako, I think it's interesting that he is literally forced into protecting this guy by being his bodyguard, as it is the first time he has ever done something like this against his will. He protects the people closest to him because he cares about them, but he does not give a flying fuck about Wu at first. I interpret Mako warming up to Wu as him looking for a reason to care about him to motivate his job a bit further, and while yeah, the show does poke fun at the idea that he's only doing it so he can get it over with, I think there's something deeper there. In his own very indirect way, Mako tries to help Wu improve because he can see that he's a good guy at heart, but his values are all sorts of fucked. A cliche way of putting it would be that he sees the good in him, which motivates him to protect and generally help this kid. And I think this introduces us to another great motif for Mako's character, and I would argue is secretly the point of his arc, which is that he has to learn to value the people in his life in a different way than he originally did. When he first met Korra, he wanted nothing to do with her. Then he ended up dating and breaking up with her, but through that experience found that they work best as friends and is now one of her most trusted allies. Asami began as purely a love interest, but through their attempts at romance, he saw that maybe they work better as friends as well, and also continue on as good friends. He always saw Bolin as a dumb kid who needed to be protected at all times, but accepts that he has also grown up just like everyone else. Prince Wu is a spoiled, eccentric, royal asshat, but Mako eventually saw the value that he brought to the table in terms of ideas, and helped push him to become a better leader. His father meant the world to him, but in meeting his extended family and learning more about his father, he was able to pass that admiration on to someone else. My point is, all of Mako's major relationships begin with him having a particularly shallow view of the other person, but as everyone around him changes, their relationships with him change as well, and he has to view them in a different light. He learns that people are often much deeper than they might originally appear, and in a meta way, I think this applies to us as the audience. Much of the fanbase views him as a generic, boring, one-note character, but like I've just described, there's a lot more to him if you care to dig deep enough, which is the exact same lesson that he learns throughout the show. But I think above all though, the most appealing part of Mako's character is that he will do whatever it takes to get the job done, no matter the circumstances. He'll go outside the law and risk losing his job to follow a lead. He'll go toe-to-toe with a bloodbending psycho just to protect his friend. He'll blow himself up in a blaze of glory to destroy a super weapon. Like he says to Korra in their final exchange, he'll do anything for his friends because as much as he doesn't want to admit it, he has mellowed out a lot since his days as a pro bender. Being a brooding, edgy, strong, silent type does make you a badass, but being there for your homies whenever they need you is even more badass.
I want you to know, I'll follow you into battle no matter how crazy things get. I've got your back, and I always will.
Rounding out our pro-bending team is Bolin, Mako's younger earthbending brother with a rather naive but endearing point of view. It's made clear within his first appearance that he's meant to be the comic relief of the series, and while this remains the case throughout the series, the true depth of his character kinda comes and goes, and oftentimes I feel that depth goes underappreciated. Due to being the de facto comic relief, a lot of people like to compare Bolin to Sokka, but aside from their roles within the group, the two aren't really that similar, even comedically. While Sokka's humor often came from his bad luck or his intentional wisecracks, Bolin's humor often comes from his ignorance and his awkwardness. While I don't want this to turn into a full-on comparison, it's definitely a different brand of humor. Bolin is unintentionally funny since he will often say the wrong thing because he's uncomfortable or is just too socially unaware in that particular moment to realize that he said anything wrong. He then quickly realizes that he said something dumb and tries to backtrack, which just ends up making him seem dumber. He often misunderstands phrases and misinterprets social cues, and I personally think that's pretty funny. I love cringe comedy, and Bolin is bordering on that in a way that's not too overt. Cringe! My personal headcanon is that Bolin is very autistic, and I will die on this hill. He's not like Chris Chan autistic, though. He's like just 0.5 autism. This segues into another important detail. Bolin is the definition of a himbo. He is a big, burly, tough guy with minimal brain cells who is also really goofy and overly nice. He has almost a child's view of the world, where he always wants to believe that everyone has good intentions and is always the first to see the good in people. While that is a very naive way to look at this very nuanced and complicated world, there's still something endearing about that. And I think this largely illustrates Bolin's purpose in the story. Though he doesn't know it or even seem it, he's essentially the group's moral compass. At his core, he's a good person. He knows the difference between right and wrong in its simplest sense, so he always points the group in the right direction, even when he himself doesn't even know what the right direction is. Because he's so blind to the greater evils of the world, he is able to give an untainted perspective that, while it doesn't always lead to the most realistic solutions, does keep him and his friends on the straight and narrow. He is very much an idealist, and though it definitely stems more from his ignorance than anything else, it's this very idealism that gives him a sense of right and wrong and keeps the rest of the group from making the morally wrong decision. Even if he doesn't realize it, he inspires the people around him to be better people, and I'd say that's his most underappreciated strength. But of course, Bolin's nature also allows for his character to change and develop as the series goes on, and while it's not too in your face, the dude definitely goes through some struggles. Starting in book 1, the dude just wants some friends. When we first meet him, Bolin helps Korra out of a jam at the pro bending arena and tries to make some moves on her by flexing his status. This shows that Bolin is desperate for people to admire him in some way. He has this really cool job, but doesn't seem to have anybody but his moody brother to share it with, and his pro bending fanbase is basically non-existent by this point, so he takes the first opportunity he can to get somebody to like him. This is all exasperated by the fact that nobody in his life really takes him seriously. His old friends at the Triple Threat Triads all look down on him and take advantage of his naivete, and even his own brother gets fed up with his shit every now and again. Most people in his life see him as a goofball who they can manipulate, and on some level he seems to know this. He can tell that people don't take him seriously, so he tries to prove it, which often leads him into some shit. What I find really interesting in regards to this is that the reason his friendship with Korra worked so well was because she was one of the first people to take him seriously and not look down on him. She is just as naive as he is when they first meet, and I don't think either of their two combined brain cells picked up on that. I know I talked about the love triangle bullshit earlier, and you're probably sick of hearing about it. I know I'm sick of hearing about it, and you're definitely gonna be sick about hearing it in fucking the end of the video. Bolin and Korra's date is super fucking wholesome, and it shows that the two actually get along really well and have a lot in common. While this was ultimately ruined by Korra's selfishness at the time, their split, if you could even consider them together, was made all the worse knowing how others see Bolin. By betraying him like that, Korra became yet another person who takes advantage of him, and he's more so hurt by that than he is the loss of potential love. The first real friend he ever had ended up treating him the same way everyone else does, and it's the first time we ever see him be truly sad. But Bolin, being the himbo that he is also very forgiving of the people who have wronged him, and while this can come back to bite him every so often, it shows that he never lets his gullibility get him down, if that makes any sense. There are times when he tries to be skeptical about others' intentions, where he actively tries to not be tricked so easily, and while that works a total of 0 times, he always defaults back to his hopeful naivete. He understands that this is a problem that he has, but he never goes overboard with skepticism to where it overpowers his ability to trust people. I kinda wish the show got into this side of him a bit more because it's very underlying, but I like that he doesn't change so drastically in this regard. The thing that makes him endearing is the fact that he's gullible and simple-minded, so to take that away from him would just make him Mako again, and we've got enough edgelords in this show already. Getting into book 2, Bolin has 2 main storylines that tell us more about his character. First is his relationship with Eska, which as many fans are quick to point out, is kinda fucking bad. He takes a liking to her by the pure vibe alone, but quickly learns that Eska is domineering and somewhat cruel, but Bolin is too nice of a guy to push back in any way.
Whoa, who are the lovely ladies?
That's Eska and Desna, the chief's children. Desna is a guy.
Oh no, sure, I knew that. Oh, and which one is Desna?
Hey, yo!
And yeah, like a lot of fans point out, she is pretty abusive towards him. Like, she literally forces him into marriage, and it's like, bro, you're 17, calm the fuck down. Anyways, the reason I point this out is because it's the first time we see Bolin being nice to a fault, since he is so nice and naive that he can't see the problem when it's right in front of him, but this time in a much more personal way. He likes Eska and wants to be with her, but once he figures out they aren't really compatible, and that's putting it lightly, he doesn't want to break it off because he's more concerned with how she will feel. Also, he fears her immensely. iDubbbz moment. He doesn't want to hurt her feelings and is more concerned with that than his own feelings. Even through all of the bullshit he went through to escape her, at the end of the season it's revealed that he still does genuinely like Eska and she reciprocates. But it begs the question of if either of them really know what love feels like. If they do, then neither of them seem to have a healthy way of expressing it either, with Eska being overtly cruel and Bolin being overly nice, which makes sense given their upbringings and personalities. So I find it interesting that after the events of the season, the two approach romance a lot differently. Eska tries a warm embrace with Bolin during their final scene together, in stark contrast to her fucking insanity, while Bolin takes a completely different approach when Opal comes around. They both learn from this relationship even though it didn't work out, which is why it pisses me off to no end when all fans talk about with them is the fact that it's abusive. Like, yeah dude, the shit's not healthy, but if you think the show is promoting this kind of thing by including it at all, you've missed the point completely. Eska was abusive towards Bolin, but she did actually like him and just didn't know any better. And while it was played for laughs, the abuse itself is not the joke, but rather the humor comes from the over-the-top nature of it and the over-the-top reactions to it. But most importantly, the relationship is portrayed as abusive for the purpose of forcing both characters to grow. Bolin learns to be able to put his foot down, and Eska learns that her emotionless approach to the relationship was not normal, and both learn that you might love someone you aren't compatible with, so it's best to go your separate ways. Relationships are a give and take, and this one was a little bit too one-sided. The other thing that we learn about Bolin in Book 2 is that he has some deep-seated desire to please the masses. We saw a bit of this in Book 1 with pro bending, but it is put on full display in Book 2 with him taking on the role of Nuktuk, Hero of the South, in Varrick's Movers. He basically becomes a celebrity, and he revels in the idea of this by becoming an absolute diva. I mean, y'all can talk about Unalaq and Vaatu all you want, but Bolin is the real fucking villain of this season because he gives Mako so much unnecessary shit, it's not even funny. Well, actually, it's hilarious, but you get the point. Anyways, as Bolin's stardom increases, he becomes less and less happy, specifically because this profession is driving all of his friends away. He has all the fame and adoration that he thinks he wants, but it still feels hollow. When he saves the president from kidnappers during the Mover premiere, he finds the way to fill this void, and it demonstrates something important about Bolin. He doesn't derive happiness from being loved by all. He derives it from making people feel good, and it's easy to conflate the two. He likes being famous not because he gets all this shallow love and attention, but because he can brighten people's day, and that is right at home with his wholesome ass. He feels good by making other people feel good, and this really opens the floodgates for his desire to help people blossom into his arc for the next 2 seasons. Fast forwarding to Book 3, upon arriving at Zaofu, Bolin begins to experience some confidence issues, which is actually a really important turn for his character because we've rarely seen him doubt himself thus far. Before this, he would often just jump into new things completely blind and completely ignorant, and he's always had a level of charisma that would get him in and out of those things. This changes in Book 3, and the sources of these confidence issues are his inability to metal bend and his budding relationship with Opal. Let's start with the latter because bro, I fucking love this pairing. They're just so fucking wholesome together, it's adorable. Bolin isn't very confident about pursuing Opal since he doesn't really know how to do this kind of thing. I mean, look at how his last relationship turned out, right? When he tries to be confident and put the moves on her, she rejects him, to which he immediately goes back to being himself. You know, he's always had the confidence to be himself. You know, it's one of his defining character traits. In this particular scenario, he second-guessed if he really had that confidence at all. You know, he kind of overcorrected a bit from what he learned with Eska, where now he's trying to be more masculine and dominant. This is clearly not him, and Opal picks up on that pretty quick, which prompts him to be open with his feelings once more. Greatest power couple of all time. As for the former, Bolin has always wanted to be a metalbender just like Toph. She is his hero to this day, and he wants to be just like her, but the dude just can't figure it out. When Sue offers to teach him, he's afraid to start because he doesn't want to embarrass himself when he can't actually get it, and it's revealed that he's tried before but could just never figure it out. Throughout the season, we see him try to learn through various means, but to no avail, which really gets him down. This is present for most of the season and comes to a head at the very end. During the Red Lotus attack on the Northern Air Temple, there is a semi-literal fire under his ass to escape, and in the moment he surprises himself by lava bending. All this time spent trying to learn metal bending, and it turns out he was putting his efforts into the wrong places. What Bolin learns through this simple arc is that just because you can't do one thing doesn't mean you can't do something else, and sometimes that something else is what makes you unique. That was fucking gay. Book 4 is the culmination of Bolin's arc, since it takes all of these things that his character has touched on thus far and combines them into one. During the time skip, Bolin has joined Kuvira's forces to help reunify the Earth Kingdom, and he loves it because he thinks he's helping people, which obviously he loves doing. Opal sees Kuvira for who she truly is though, and takes this out on Bolin, which gets him to question their goals. In case you still haven't picked up by now, Bolin is very easily manipulated. As he and Varrick slowly learn what Kuvira's true plans are, they attempt to defect from her army and try to warn everyone about what's coming. Bolin takes this a lot more seriously than Varrick does, and I love this because it's really the first time Bolin tries to actively atone for any mistake he's made. His dumbass has gotten the crew into a lot of situations over the years, but he's never done something as bad as actively helping a massive threat to the world rise to power. It's not necessarily his fault because he was tricked, but he knows this and tries to make it right. This hits his character on 2 fronts, as it's both him taking accountability for his gullibility and actively making the choice to do the right thing after learning he's been doing the wrong thing. It reaffirms that he has a good moral compass, but isn't always the best judge of character and can still be blind to the long-term consequences. After he makes it back to the city, the majority of Bolin's remaining screen time is spent on repairing his relationship with Opal. He's trying to atone for his mistakes with Kuvira, and though everybody else has already forgiven him, Opal is the last holdout. The reason for this is that even though she knows Bolin is very gullible, the fact that he didn't listen to her about Kuvira and prioritize his job over their relationship was pretty hurtful. Bit of a woman moment, but it'd be like that sometimes, I guess. Bolin knows that he's wrong and wants to prove to Opal that he's remorseful for it, but she is just not having it. Her anger here is a bit irrational since it's more so rooted in her family being captured than it is in Bolin. She originally thought that he was complicit in what happened at Zaofu, and though she now knows that he wasn't, she still can't separate the two ideas. Even though none of this was really his fault, Bolin still offers to join her on the mission to rescue her family, since that is the only way to prove to Opal that he is still the man that she loves. By rescuing the Biefongs, he has not only redeemed himself in Opal's eyes, but in his own eyes as well, since now he can rest easy knowing that he solved the problem and he feels he helped create, even though he didn't. And since these two are together, technically Bolin is marrying into the Biefong family at some point, so now they are his family too. A recurring motif with Bolin is the fact that he's never tied down to any one profession. He starts off as a pro bender, becomes a mover star, travels around with Korra for a while, joins Kuvira's crusade, and he ends up not really having a job or goal of any kind. There are numerous times throughout the show where he's just kind of directionless and doesn't really belong anywhere, just kind of floating around, helping out his friends when they need it. I think this determines what Bolin's character arc truly boils down to. He needs to learn to find his place in the world, but that doesn't necessarily have to be one thing. He thought pro bending and acting were his calling, but they didn't end up working out. He had good intentions helping Kuvira, but was forced out of that rather quickly. He doesn't have one set goal or purpose in life because his actual purpose is being there for his friends and family when they need him. He's always there to help Korra out of a jam, he tries his best to make it up to Opal when she was mad at him, and he's just generally always there for his friends. He jumps around constantly between a lot of different gigs, but it always ends up being where he's needed the most, even if it's not necessarily where his strengths are. Like we've established, Bolin derives pleasure from making others feel good. It is the source of his happiness in many ways, and sometimes that's all you need.
I'm here to help. Let's face the end of the world together! Not a team like that, fools!
She's so pretty and cool. Every time I see her, I get mad a little bit.
The final member of the core 4 of the new Team Avatar is Asami Sato, a non-bending rich girl who uses her inventions to put herself on equal ground with benders. Call this girl Jimmy Neutron because she got a knack for invention. You know what I'm saying? The concept behind her character is actually really interesting, since according to Varrick, Asami was originally intended to be a villain, but they liked her so much that they decided to keep her around and join the team as an ally instead. I personally think that this was a great idea, since now Team Avatar isn't all benders, and in Book 1 specifically, this is an important thing to establish thematically. She's also voiced by Sachel Gabriel, who played Princess Yue in the live-action Last Airbender movie, and if that ain't a redemption arc, then I don't know what is. I'll be honest on this one though, Asami is definitely the crew member with the least amount of depth or development. At first, I thought it was Mako, but the more I thought about it, it kind of is Asami. She's a fantastic supporting character, but this only really becomes the case in Book 3, and the bulk of her relationship with her dad is in Book 4. Her important character moments are spread pretty thin throughout the show, and while that is certainly disappointing, I still love her. I mean, look at her. How could you not?
She was only 17.
Hey, yo! One thing that I personally think goes underappreciated about Asami is her role as Korra's confidant. So fucking gay. That's such a gay-ass fucking word. Starting in Book 3, the two start spending a lot more time together and really form a bond. And while that's probably for one reason in particular, gay, it also serves a very important role in the story. Asami is now someone for Korra to bounce ideas off of and vent her feelings to. And while that role has formerly been filled by Tenzin, Asami is different because she is a peer to Korra, while Tenzin is more of a superior. So the things that she confesses can often be a lot more raw and personal. It's very important in storytelling for characters to express their feelings with people in a more casual setting, and Asami allows Korra to do that by being her friend.
You guys are my friends, right?
This is something she didn't really have for a while, at least not in this way, and it enhances both of their characters. As for her character itself though, like I said, it's spread pretty fucking thin. Which is to say, it starts in Book 1 and it ends in Book 4, but it isn't really brought up in any meaningful way in between then. Asami is first introduced when she accidentally hits Mako with her scooter, which is no doubt a reference to Fully Cooley. I see you, Bryke. I see what you're doing. I got you. To make it up to him, she takes him out on a date where it's revealed that she's actually the daughter of Hiroshi Sato, the inventor of Satomobiles, which is the Avatar versus version of cars, making her from a very wealthy family. Hiroshi offers to sponsor the Fire Ferrets and seems like an overall nice guy. Later, in a surprise twist, it's revealed that Hiroshi was actually a high-ranking member of the Equalists and has been providing funding and weapons for them to use against benders as revenge for his wife being killed by a firebender. Upon discovering this, Asami is left with an ultimatum. Does she join her father to avenge her mother, or does she join Team Avatar to fight against the Equalists? It's essentially a decision between blood family and found family, and in this moment, Asami chooses who her true family is. She opts to not become fueled by vengeance and instead focuses her pain into making the world better, thereby choosing the crew. I really wish this was focused on more, since I don't think we ever see any flashbacks or anything of this family interacting, or at least just build up the dilemma at any point. It would have been nice to see how much Asami's mother meant to her so that the audience has some groundwork for why this decision is important for both her and Hiroshi. This isn't the first time the Avatar universe has had an off-screen dead family member that we never meet, but if they wanted to make Asami a more relatable, sympathetic, and overall deeper character, having more context would have been great. This is some prime character development, and it's just kind of like skipped over and left to the imagination. In fact, there were a lot of missed opportunities with Asami, if you ask me. For example, Asami's mother was killed by a firebender, just like Mako and Bolin's parents were, and I think it's really fucking weird that they never addressed this. This could have been used to strengthen her bond with the brothers, specifically Mako, as it would have made their relationship a lot more tangible. I personally like the headcanon that it was the same killer, which would have been fucking crazy, but it's just, they don't ever mention it.
It's really weird.
Additionally, I think it would have been interesting to see Asami maybe have some kind of deep-seated apprehension against benders, where without meaning anything by it, she's a little afraid of Mako and maybe agrees with her father to some degree. Like, if her mother was killed by a firebender, I think it'd be a little weird for her to not have some kind of reaction to Mako also being a firebender, especially in a show that deals with trauma like this and a season that tries to show nuance in the whole benders versus non-benders thing. What I'm basically saying is that Asami is racist. Make Asami racist again! Bring me racism! Should not have yelled that loud. Okay, maybe slightly racist, because I do think the point of her arc should be to rise above those prejudices, which is the decision she ends up making, but there's no build up to her making it. She just kind of has that mindset already. Keep in mind that these are just some of my own ideas. The lack of these things doesn't necessarily make the show or her character any worse, but it would have definitely made things a lot more interesting in my opinion. This is all basically left on the back burner until book 4, where it's revealed that for years, Hiroshi has been sending Asami letters from prison in an attempt to make amends. He has seen the error of his ways and accepts his punishment, but wants to do right by the one person he's wronged the most. Asami is not having any of this shit at first because, let's be honest, she doesn't need him. She almost single-handedly revived her father's dying company and turned it into one of the most important parts of the city, all while helping the Avatar save the world. She cleaned up his mess and left it cleaner than when she found it, so she should have no reason to want anything to do with this guy. That being said, I do like the irony of it all, where Asami turns on her evil dad only to apply the values that he taught her in order to improve the city. In a way, Hiroshi made the city better by raising Asami the way that he did, and there's definitely something interesting there. Eventually though, she does accept him back into her life, not because of any moral obligation, but because she feels truly bad for how things turned out. She wishes that her father was still in her life, but still has trouble accepting that he's been a piece of shit who betrayed her, even tried to kill her, so if the two were going to reconnect, Hiroshi is really gonna have to prove himself. And the fact that Asami even considers this is because the love is still there, it's just been corrupted by Hiroshi's actions. The problem is that there's no real way for Hiroshi to prove how remorseful he is from prison, so trying to connect with Asami and tell her that he's sorry is the best that he can do, and the best that Asami can do is at least give him that chance. This comes to a head during the final battle with Kuvira, where Hiroshi is brought out of prison to help the other smart people figure out a way to beat the giant mech, and they get the idea to create these hummingbird-looking things and cut a hole in it. This would not have worked without his input, and the fact that he was willing to help shows that he still has the city's and his family's best interests at heart. He wouldn't have helped if he didn't care, you know what I mean? But then we get to the big thing, Hiroshi's sacrifice. During the counterattack, Hiroshi ejects Asami out of the hummingbird at the last second to save her life, managing to cut open a hole before being crushed to death. This sacrifice is very important because Asami's reaction to it goes to show how much she actually learned to forgive him. From the time he was arrested all the way to the start of book 4, she wants nothing to do with the guy. She does not want to be associated with a vengeful asshole who ruined her family and tried to kill her. But in seeing that he is truly remorseful, that he has changed, and in helping him through it, she grows fond of him once again. His sacrifice reveals that his priority was always his daughter's safety. This was the case from the moment we met him. He just showed it in some very corrupted ways. It only took until now for Asami to see that. The last we saw of Hiroshi before this was Bolin telling him he's a terrible father, to which Asami agreed, and he seems to have internalized that.
And I took that personally.
And he should, because he tried to fucking kill her, going against his entire fucking good father persona. When he sacrifices himself for not just his daughter, but the whole city, he's officially come full circle. He died fighting for the two things he cares about the most, but in the complete opposite context from when he was with Amon. He's done the wrong thing a lot, and that was his last chance to do the right thing. But this is turning into a Hiroshi analysis, so let's bring this back to Asami. In this moment, Asami had to feel the pain of losing a parent for a third time. The first was her off-screen mother, then it was when Hiroshi betrayed her in book 1, and now she loses him again when he dies for her. She just got him back to some semblance of normalcy, and now he's gone yet again. Now she has no family and is left with really conflicting feelings for her dad. He helped save her and the city at the cost of his life, but does that really counteract the bad that he's done before? Did he deserve this even when he tried to atone for his mistakes? This is the question that the show raises, and it's left kind of ambiguous how Asami truly feels about it. When Korra offers her condolences, she gets a little bit sad and mentions that she was able to forgive him, but clearly isn't that distraught about it, since she's still out enjoying the party, right? It's somewhat inconclusive, and I think that's a blessing and a curse, because there's nuance, but the show doesn't fully explore that nuance. I'll get into the larger writing criticism later though, so let's bring this back to Asami. Like I mentioned earlier, Asami works best as a supporting character, but I can't deny that I was a little disappointed with how little character growth she received, despite being a core member of the cast. Mako and Bolin, for example, get multiple arcs. Asami only gets the one, and And I wouldn't even say it's a quality over quantity thing either, since her acceptance of Hiroshi's redemption is very muddy and isn't explored to the extent it could have been. There were a lot of missed opportunities with this character, and while I do criticize, I still appreciate her. Asami is an example of how forgiving humanity can truly be. She was able to personally forgive Varrick and her father for what they did, but more than that, she stepped up to fight against the very injustices that they stood for and improved everybody's lives. Asami Sato is the weakest written character in this show, but she's also the best of us. Also, she's fucking hot and I want to have sex with her. Hell yeah, brother.
Can you please calm down? Fuck.
Among fans and detractors of the show alike, one thing remains constant. Everybody loves Tenzin. Everybody loves Tenzin. Everybody sucks dick. As the son of Aang and father to the next generation of airbenders, Tenzin has become a fan-favorite character, no doubt influenced by his fantastic portrayal by J.K. Simmons. It's such a unique role for him too, since this dude is most well known for some of the angriest, off-the-wall, insane characters like Omni-Man, Cave Johnson, the teacher from Whiplash, but Tenzin is like this soft-spoken monk. It's a complete departure from his other work, and I love it.
I will fuck you like a pig.
Anyways, I would argue that Tenzin is the character with the most depth aside from Korra. Granted, I think much of that is a continuation of Aang's arc from the original show, but regardless, he's a great way to have some connecting threads to the original series and is a great character in his own right. It's made immediately clear in Book 1 that Tenzin is meant to be the wise mentor character of the series, giving him more of an Iroh-esque role in Korra's life. His duty as the only airbending master in the world and as the son of Aang is to help guide Korra. But I love that it's not just with her airbending. He does teach her airbending, of course, but even once she's learned it, he is still a major presence in her life, guiding her in other ways. Even before she's learned airbending, he's still giving her life advice that she likely wouldn't have gotten from anywhere else. Tenzin's relationship with Korra is one of the best in the whole show in my opinion, because he's one of the only people to believe in her unconditionally. The thing that makes him such a great mentor isn't his status as Aang's son or in being a spiritual leader. It's by being there for Korra when she needs him and guiding her in such a way where she makes decisions on her own. It is very much a Zuko and Iroh type relationship, and I love it. He's a wise old guy through and through, but what I love about him and what differentiates him from, again, say Iroh, is that Tenzin has some growth to do himself. He's a mentor, but he isn't a perfect person, and there are cases where in order to be wise, he needs to go through some character growth himself. Much of this is present in books 1 and 2 with Korra's airbending and spiritual training respectively. While training Korra in airbending, Tenzin's methods don't get through to her the same way they likely did with his children, but at first, he just can't accept that. He tries to teach Korra the right way, but she can't grasp that as she does not learn that way, but he responds to this with anger, which was very much a miscalculation on his part, though given the context, I'd say it was pretty justified. By the end of this episode, Tenzin realizes that he was not considerate enough of Korra's feelings and opts to find a different way to teach her. He has to learn that not everyone learns the same way, and there's just no way to force that. This concept is played with again in Season 2, where Korra basically fires Tenzin as her mentor in favor of Unalaq. He seems to take this pretty hard, and this scene is actually mad underrated. Like, it fucks me up a little bit, I'm not gonna lie.
I'm sorry, Tenzin. This is as far as we go.
It has been a pleasure serving you, Avatar Korra.
Like, bro, why he gotta do that? Why she do that though? When Korra eventually comes back to learn from Tenzin once more, we find that he is unable to enter the spirit world despite being a pretty spiritual guy, and therefore is unable to help Korra. Jinora, on the other hand, has no such problem, and has a much better connection to the spirits than her father. He actually seems a bit resentful of this at first, seemingly refusing to accept that his own daughter is naturally better at him than something he studied his whole life for. While this is partially his overprotective parental side shining through, it's also a bit of jealousy. He feels inadequate, but quickly has to accept that he can't do everything, but more specifically, he can't teach everything. Part of being a teacher is knowing when you aren't the best teacher. Sometimes the best thing you can do as a teacher is to pass things off to someone who can do it better than you can. Being a good mentor is knowing when you're needed and when you aren't. This can also be seen during the final stretch of Book 2, in which Tenzin, Kaya, and Bumi are lost in the spirit world and eventually find themselves in the fog of lost souls. Kaya and Bumi lose their minds, and Tenzin starts to as well, giving into self-doubt, but the thing that keeps him from breaking is a vision of his father. His whole life, Tenzin thought that he had to follow in his father's footsteps and be just like him to preserve the Air Nation, and his biggest fear in life was failing at that. But he realized that in order to truly progress, he has to be himself. The Air Nation does not need Aang, it needs Tenzin. I don't think it's a coincidence that we also get a cameo from Zhao in the scene, who mistakes Tenzin for Aang, thereby creating a link between the two. Tenzin needed to learn that he is not always needed, but when he is needed, he needs to be himself and not a copy of someone else. But of course, the bulk of Tenzin's character development lies with the Airbenders. Much like his father, he struggles to hold the entire future of the Airbenders on his shoulders, and for a long time, that just meant keeping his own kids safe. During Amon's takeover of the city, Tenzin is put in charge of the city by default, but he says, fuck the city, get my family out of here so they don't lose their airbending to this fucking psycho. His priority always goes back to protecting the future of his culture, which until book 3, he's aware is very tenuous. Also, his relationship with his kids is fucking great. I absolutely love it. After harmonic convergence, new airbenders begin to emerge throughout the world, leading him on a journey to recruit them to rebuild the air nomads. One of my favorite scenes in the whole show is in the book 3 premiere, in which Tenzin is speaking to his father's statue about the return of the airbenders. His kids later join him and ask how this whole new airbender thing is going to work out, and while he oversimplifies things for them, he ends on this note.
But maybe there will be enough to fill the temples again.
What's wrong, Daddy?
I just wish your grandfather were here to see this.
I mean, bro, I don't give a fuck if you love or hate Korra, but if you're a fan of Avatar and didn't get a little teary-eyed, honestly, you're a fucking fake fan. Like, I don't care. One of Aang's dreams in life was to preserve his culture, and while he seemed to know it was impossible on some level, he still always had some sense of hope. He had an airbending son and a bunch of acolytes, but things will never be the same. Tenzin inherits this same dream, and the rise of new airbenders means that this dream, Aang's dream, is fulfilled. Kinda. Because one of the most overlooked things about Tenzin's guidance of the new airbenders is that he tries to teach them all the old traditional ways that he learned from Aang. As we see in episodes like Rebirth and Original Airbenders, this proves to be quite challenging, because not only do these old traditional airbender values not appeal to regular people, but Tenzin himself doesn't truly know the intricacies of it all since he never really saw the culture at its height. Most he ever got was secondhand exposure through his father. This raises an interesting problem of how do we train a new generation of airbenders that were not born into that culture.
That's the neat thing. You don't.
What Tenzin ends up learning throughout Book 3 is that he can never truly restore the airbenders to who they once were. While their philosophy and culture will live on through writing and his own lineage, they cannot restore the generation of airbenders who all lived through that culture. These new airbenders inherently cannot be like the old ones because they are not of that culture. So what is Tenzin to do? Change the culture. He may not be able to bring the air nomads back to their former glory, but he can create a new version of them with more modern ideals. He's essentially starting from scratch by taking the new airbenders he's trained and sending them around the world to help people in need. He brought the new airbenders back to their roots as nomads, but with a new twist that still keeps in line with the values of the culture. The final scene of Book 3, in which Jinora is initiated as an official airbending master, represents Tenzin realizing that he has to let the next generation take the reins at some point, much like his father did to him. To rebuild the Air Nation, he needed to realize that he cannot do it alone, and that change is inevitable and necessary. Shifting gears though, this man is a fucking badass. He is jacked as fuck, and if the show would let him say fuck, he would be the dude to tell his enemy to go fuck themselves while he gets your shit rocked. Now, I'm no power scaler or anything like that. I think that shit is stupid, but y'all are severely underrating this dude. One of my all-time favorite Tenzin scenes is his fight against Zaheer, because he is just fucking this guy up, showing the full strength of real airbending. Zaheer, nah, he got that fake shit. He got that ghetto-ass street airbending. Tenzin got that motherfucking bison in him, yo. He's just rocking Zaheer's shit, and the only reason he loses is because the other Red Lotus members came in and ganged up on him. But even then, he still drops us with this heat.
As long as I'm breathing, it's not over.
I'm sorry, an airbender and a firebender? Bro must be a waterbender too, because I'm getting fucking chills over here, bro. In all seriousness though, this scene is so goated, especially with that iconic line having a bit of a double entendre. As long as I'm breathing invokes the premise of airbending, you know, air, breathing, that kind of shit, but it also brings to mind what happened to the Earth Queen a few episodes ago. Like honestly, if my guy died right here, I would be unfathomably angry because he's one of my favorite characters, but I'd get it. This goes to show that just because he's a pacifist doesn't mean he won't be willing to fight or even die to protect his family and his dream. Getting into the final season though, Tenzin is actually not in it very much. He has some important scenes here and there, and he's still a pretty big presence, but aside from his final exchange with Korra, we don't get a whole lot of deep emotional moments with him. While disappointing, I think this is by design. Much of Korra's recovery is handled on her own or with the help of other mentors, both lessons that Tenzin taught her. The reason he's not in this season much is because he's not needed anymore. Now that sounds kind of mean when I put it like that, but what I mean by this is that by this point, he's already taught Korra everything she needs to know. You know, he doesn't ever really drop a profound knowledge bomb or give an Avatar pep talk, but he doesn't need to because Korra's now at a point where she's just as wise as he is. The student has become the master, as it were, and at the end of the day, that is the beauty of Tenzin's character and his relationship with Korra, and even all of his other interactions to a lesser extent. He's always the guy that people look to for answers, the guy who has to teach other people lessons, but where does he look for answers? Who teaches him lessons? The purpose of Tenzin's character is that the relationship between a student and a master goes both ways. The master teaches, but in doing so can also learn a lot from the student, whether that be because of their mistakes or his own. Tenzin is a fan favorite character for a reason, and it's because he is familiar to us as the audience. Fans of Avatar understand the position he's in with the Air Nation. His status as a mentor invokes the spirit of beloved characters like Iroh, and I think we can all relate to him in some way. Whether it's losing his temper, learning where his strengths lie, or fighting for what he believes in, Tenzin has something that anyone can relate to, which cannot always be said about Korra herself. Hence why I think a lot of Korra's detractors like him over her. Now, I've always maintained the position that if Avatar was allowed any use of the word fuck, I'd give it to Toph. But for Korra, I gotta give it to Tenzin, man. As long as I'm breathing, it's not fucking over.
Thank you for not giving up on me.
I'm proud of you.
So, those have been the primary members of the new Team Avatar, the crew, as I like to call them, and while some leave a bit to be desired, I still pretty much fuck with all of them. Bolin is just an absolute treat whenever he's on screen, Tenzin is absolutely goated, Korra is obviously the main fucking character and has an amazing journey, and though Mako and Asami are a bit dry, I still found a lot to appreciate about them. That being said, Korra does take the bulk of the stronger character writing, so the others suffer as a result of that. However, I think the reason for this lack of focus on the main cast was for two reasons. One is that Korra's character arc takes up a good chunk of screen time in a show that already has way too few episodes and is much more plot-driven than its predecessor. It's hard to dedicate time to your supporting cast when your titular main character needs that screen time to develop and to progress the main plot every episode. Avatar had the luxury of not doing that, so they were able to give most characters somewhat equal screen time. Korra didn't, so things unfortunately kinda needed to be this way. However, the second reason for this is much more important, and it's that this show has way too many fucking characters. I don't necessarily mean this in a bad way, but the fact that there are side characters that get more character development and have way more nuance than members of the main team is kind of fucking wild. So let's get into some of them, shall we? My pussy is gay. I have the gayest pussy of all time.
That's the sound of the police. That's the sound of the beast.
Of Team Avatar's secondary allies, there is none more iconic than Lin Biefong, daughter of Toph and the chief of police of Republic City. Now this is a badass bitch, I tell you what.
I'm a bad bitch, you can't kill me.
I think the simplest way to describe Lin's character is that she's hard on the outside, but soft on the inside. The way she acts in front of her colleagues and even her own family show that she wants to be seen as a hard ass who won't take anyone's shit. While she totally is, in the best way possible, she also deeply cares about the people in her life, but is just too insecure with her own emotions to admit it. This can first be seen throughout Book 1, where right off the bat, it's clear that she does not like Korra, and her relationship with Tenzin is strenuous. The latter makes sense because the two used to date, but the former is likely because Lin sees a lot of her sister in Korra, and at that point in the story, she doesn't like her sister. However, over time, her true feelings start to emerge, and she starts to realize that Korra isn't as bad as she once thought. When Amon and the Equalists attack the Pro-Bending Finals, Lin and Korra are united against a common enemy, and the two end up fighting alongside each other despite not liking each other. This was not done out of necessity, but out of moral obligation to do what's right. Korra as the Avatar, and Lin as police chief, both feel that it is their duty to stop any wrongdoing in the city, which puts the two on common ground and makes them realize that they are more similar than they once thought. While the two aren't super close by the end of the season, Korra does give Lin her bending back, and I think this certainly cements the two as friends. In fact, I think it's this very similarity that makes Lin's resignation from her job in Book 1 so impactful, since now she is going rogue and taking matters into her own hands, just like Korra would. It says a lot about her sense of justice that she'd be willing to quit the very job she devoted her life to in order to save her city. She goes out of her way to save her officers from the Equalists, even though she isn't the chief anymore. She is originally presented as someone who does things by the books with an immense respect for the law, but she quickly accepts that the law isn't always the end-all be-all, and to do what's right, you need to go outside of it sometimes. Her relationship with Tenzin is also played with a lot in Book 1. Like we established, the two used to date when they were younger, and there's clearly still some feelings there, even if they are no longer romantic. I actually think it's really interesting how we never see Lin have any romantic interest in the show despite almost every other character ending up with somebody, and I think that's by design. Tenzin has clearly moved on, as he now has a wife and children, but at first, Lin doesn't seem to have moved on. She still harbors some resentment toward Tenzin, but it could also be argued that she still has feelings for him in some way. I mean, why else would she offer to protect this man's kids in a time of crisis, right? While obviously their relationship is now platonic, I think it's telling that Lin accepts the task of protecting the Airbender kids. She clearly has some apprehension toward it, but also sees the importance of it. She sacrifices herself to let the Airbenders escape, which is something we wouldn't have expected of her at this point in the series. She's been shown to be selfless to some degree, but her duty was always to the city, not usually other people, and especially not people she doesn't like very much. By the end of this mission, she accepts that she still does care for Tenzin, even if things didn't work out between them. Speaking of which, a lot of fans headcanon Lin as a lesbian, or at the very least bisexual, and I could totally be on board with that. This fucking old dyke, I love it. I want Lin to be the oldest dyke of all time. She's a hard dyke. Can I say dyke? Am I allowed to say that? Going into book 2, Lin doesn't get much character-wise. She is mostly used as a plot device to further the whole conspiracy plotline with Mako, and mostly fades into the background. However, her relationship with Mako begins here, and I actually really like it. As the new cop on the beat, Mako is subject to a lot of the grunt work of being a cop, but Lin sees the hard work and seems to take a liking to him. She blows up at him a lot for messing up and jumping the gun, but I think she only does so because she knows how good he is at his job and secretly believes in him. They end up having a really tough love kind of relationship. I think it's just very underrated.
Good. You guys aren't dead.
Don't get all mushy on me, Chief.
Book 3, though, is where the bulk of Lin's character development comes in, with the introduction of her sister Suyin and the city of Zaofu. We find out that Lin and Su have not spoken to each other in years due to the Biefong family having a generally rocky relationship, pun very much intended.
Fuck you.
While Lin ends up a lot more like adult Toph with her being a cop, Su takes after young Toph in that she is a free-spirited rebel, and they're voiced by the same person in the flashback, and Lin cannot stand this. In a flashback, it's revealed that Su's rebellious actions were what gave Lin her scar, and is part of why they haven't spoken in so long. Lin is so focused on rules and order that she can't stand the way that Su lives her life on a whim with little regard for others. Su lives for herself and her own happiness, and Lin, due to her own nature, lives entirely opposite to that and cannot stand that fact. But what Lin later finds out is that Su has grown up and matured a lot. She is not the same rebellious kid that she was when they parted ways, and Lin can't seem to accept that at first. She cannot accept that people change because she herself has not changed in that time. She is still a bitter stickler for the rules, and though she has grown fond of some of the crew, she especially holds out when it comes to her family. She's the last to hold out on making amends with them, and it's clearly very hard for her to do so. She's just the kind of person who isn't comfortable being open with her emotions, and it's something she never really grows out of. She expresses herself through her actions, as is with her fight with Su that helped them work out their beef, and eventually led to them being on good terms. Her interactions with Opal, on the other hand, kind of require her to be a bit more open, and Lin seems to take this to heart. During the fight against Pli, Lin tells Su that she loves her, which she probably couldn't have imagined saying for her entire life. By understanding herself better, realizing that she hasn't changed, it makes her more willing to become like her sister, and the two become an unstoppable duo. Hell yeah, old bitch gang, let's fucking go. Shouts out my old bitches. However, this all leaves a few stones left unturned. Yes, that was another rock pun. Fuck you. Lin and Su have finally made up, but Lin's relationship with her mother is still not great. Going into book 4 with the reintroduction of Toph was a perfect opportunity to address this, and they went pretty hard with it. The bulk of this is in the episode Operation Biefong, in which Lin accompanies Opal and Bolin on a mission to rescue the rest of the Biefongs from Kuvira's prison. Toph eventually joins them, and Lin is not happy about this. There's a lot of baggage between the two that they are yet to work out, and it just doesn't go well. Toph is willing to talk it out and even tries to mend their relationship by addressing Lin's criticisms, but she just isn't having any of it because her resentment is too strong. She essentially goes through the same thing she did with Su, but this time it is Toph who hasn't changed. These two are like unstoppable force meets immovable object because Lin has certainly inherited her mother's stubbornness. In this episode, it seems that it's actually Toph who's afraid to work things out, since once Lin reveals that she worked things out with Su, Toph just assumes, okay, we're cool now, because she is just as afraid of being open as Lin. When Lin blows up at Toph for not knowing her dad, Toph seems to realize that she never really did consider how Lin felt and that she wasn't really the best parent to either of her kids. At the end of the episode, they admit their faults to each other and start to have an amicable relationship again. I like how they aren't so in your face about psychoanalyzing either of them, since we've gotten enough of that last season, and honestly, the Biefongs are a tough love kind of family. They don't always need to be open with each other because stuff like this is somewhat unspoken to them, and while being open can work, this unspoken understanding can sometimes work just as well. Overall, Lin is a bit of a tough nut to crack, since she's a character who often isn't very open in a show where almost everybody is emotionally open to some degree. She has development, but it's not as cut and dry as other characters because of how she is as a person. And honestly, I think that's what makes her so interesting. We get to see what makes most of these characters tick, but for Lin, we only get bits, pieces, and implications, and I mean this in the best way possible. Not everybody is easy to read, and Lin is certainly one of them, both as a person and as a character. Next on the agenda is the face of late-stage capitalism himself, Sir Icknick Blackstone Varrick. He's first introduced in Book 2 as an eccentric and greedy rich dude, mostly serving as a form of comic relief, but as the show progresses, he actually goes through a really interesting transformation that I feel many don't really acknowledge. And he's honestly one of my favorite characters in this show. Let's get into it. Pussy. Slap my pussy till I'm gay.
I can make a ton of money off this!
But recently, I've been having these strange feelings.
Julie, do the thing!
It's made clear right off the bat that Varrick is a funny guy. In fact, he's our second funny guy right next to Bolin. But that's redundant though, isn't it? That seems redundant? Well, I would argue no, since their personalities are so different that their comedy comes from completely different places, and they actually mesh really well together. Like we talked about before, Bolin's comedy comes from his misunderstandings of social cues. He is autistic. But Varrick's comedy comes from his eccentricity and over-the-top personality. Everything he does it big. And when I say everything, I mean everything. Guy built a whole ass aircraft carrier to escape a crazy ex who probably didn't even exist. Motherfucker surrounds himself with yes men who tell him he's levitating to stroke his own ego. He's wild. Plus, this guy has some of the best dialogue in the entire Avatar series if you ask me. The way he bounces from overly descriptive to simple explanations and back again, all while having this chaotic energy to every line delivery is just comedy gold. The best part about all of this though is that he tells us a lot about his personality without making the audience realize he's a bad guy. He offhandedly mentions doing all kinds of underhanded and shady shit, but because he says it in such a funny way, the audience perceives it as more of his eccentricity than an actual thing he's done. He's obviously a pathological liar in a lot of ways, and while funny, it makes it hard to tell when he's being truthful, but because he's so funny, you don't really care if he's being truthful. That makes sense? I don't fucking know. Getting further into his actual character though, in Book 2, Varrick is almost like a twist villain in a lot of ways. Like I just mentioned, he's really flagrant and crazy in a fun way, leading to some pretty humorous interactions. But as the season goes on, we start to see a more nefarious side of the character that you really wouldn't have necessarily guessed upon first meeting him. I mean, unless you're really into online politics, but I digress. The first hint of this seems to be shortly after the start of the Water Tribe Civil War, where during Tonraq's meeting to discuss the next course of action, Varrick is outspokenly against the Northern occupation and advocates for the war. His charisma allows him to do so, but it also keeps the audience just amused enough by him that you don't really quite pick up yet on what he's doing. Fast forward to a bit later where Varrick starts helping Team Avatar by helping them escape to Republic City and to get an audience with the president. The latter, as we later find out, was yet another attempt to rope more people into the war. This only becomes clear after Mako's investigation, in which he discovers Varrick's true intentions after he bought out Asami's company. At this point, it ain't so subtle anymore. The dude is just straight up a fucking villain by now. Before he's found out, he literally says,
"If you can't make money during a war, you just flat out cannot make money."
Which kind of gives the twist away, but nobody would even think to take that line seriously. And honestly, that's his biggest weapon. Varrick is a genius not because he makes crazy contraptions and knows how to make bank, but rather because he knows how to hide in plain sight. Actually, it's more than plain sight. He hides by standing out as much as possible, showing that he is much smarter than he appears, and that is scarier than any giant eldritch spirit could ever be. Actually, in being a minor villain, he actually draws some similarities to some of the other villains in Korra. Like I'll get to shortly, each villain shares some commonalities with a particular political ideology, and this is actually true for Varrick as well. He is a clear representation of the worst capitalism has to offer. He's greedy, slimy, and isn't above creating problems and causing suffering in order to make a profit off of the solution. He is a war profiteer and a propagandist, all with the intention of making more money when he's already well off enough. What's interesting about this is that at first he feels no remorse for it, even while imprisoned, but over time starts to realize that what he did was wrong, which leads into Book 3. Varrick doesn't have much of a presence here, but he is briefly reintroduced as a friend to Suyin living in Zaofu. I personally like to attribute his change of heart, or at least the beginning of it, to his time in Zaofu. Su, as we'll get to shortly, is the type of person who wishes to bring out the best in everyone, and given their apparent history as longtime friends, it's very likely that Varrick came to Zaofu in an effort to become better. As callous of a guy as he could be back in Season 2, there does seem to be a part of him that wants to become a better person, and I think this sets up his arc in Book 4 quite nicely.
Feet!
Getting into that, Varrick's arc in this season is pretty cut and dry. He realizes that he's been a huge piece of shit for a long time, whether that be by using people to obtain wealth and power, using his inventions for selfish reasons, or treating his assistant badly, and he tries to fix all of this through joining Kuvira's crusade. He eventually becomes her technological advisor, helping her build things to help in restoring the Earth Kingdom. It's the first time we've ever really seen him use his smarts for good, which is why he's so opposed to his creations being used for evil. He creates the spirit cannon by accident when trying to use spirit vines as a power source, so when he finds out what his spirit vine contraptions are actually capable of, he tries to put an end to it. The old Varrick would never have done this, so this is certainly a big change of heart. The old Varrick would have doubled down and made like 8 more of them and sold them to other nations, causing a fucking Cold War in the Avatar universe.
I have nostalgia for the Cold War.
I loved killing those fucking Reds.
When Baatar reverse engineers his weapon and builds it anyways, he takes it upon himself to stop it because it's his own creation being used for evil, and he doesn't want that on his conscience. He has finally realized the ways he can negatively affect people's lives, which the old venture capitalist side of him would never have acknowledged. He has become Death, Destroyer of Worlds. Kage ain't no grammar. Fuck you, fucking Oppenheimer. You fucking Oppenheimer, more like sucking on her. Fucking dumb bitch. My biggest issue with this was how we never really explored how this change of heart started, since it kind of just starts happening after the time skip. I mean, I'd like to think it was his time in Zaofu, but that's ultimately just headcanon. Of course, the other major source of Varrick's change of heart is his growing feelings for his assistant, Zhu Li, who up until now has been a literal background character. And I think it's great that they give her more to work with while also using that to further Varrick's development. Unlike Varrick's conscience, I like that their feelings don't just come out of nowhere. You get the impression that they've had these feelings repressed for a long time, but neither of them have ever really found a way to articulate them, so they instead opt to show it in the only way they know how. For Zhu Li, it is servitude, and for Varrick, it's bossing her around, neither of which are healthy, mind you, but it's just a part of how they were raised. The beauty of their blossoming relationship is that it's them breaking that cycle. Zhu Li becomes her own independent person in order to help Varrick, and Varrick stops being so selfish because of how she originally betrayed him and how he knows he's been treating her poorly. In realizing their faults, they became better people for each other, and I just think that's neat. While the whole do the thing line is often a joke, I think it's actually a great representation of how well they really know each other. They don't even need to be specific with each other because they just already know what the other is thinking. They just vibe together somehow, you know? Because of that, I've always loved how their wedding ends with do the thing. And speaking of doing things, let's move on. Haha, nah, but seriously though, Varrick is a great character. He is definitely one of my personal favorites, but I cannot stand how the fandom seems to view him. At least from what I've seen, a lot of fans are either all in with him being the funny haha guy, or an irredeemable capitalist pig, when it's actually the combination of those two things that makes him so complex. Well, he's not that complex, but he's more complex than people give him credit for, and y'all better put some respect on his name.
No, the universe decided to set me free. So, I looked up my old friend Suyin here, pitched her a few ideas, and BAM!
Ignorance says your new best friend. Ignorance says your new best friend.
And lastly, for the major secondary characters is Lin's sister and Toph's other daughter, Suyin Biefong. Now, I'm not always into older women, but Mommy, sorry, mommy, sorry, mommy, sorry, mommy. Jokes aside though, Sue is a really interesting character from a few different angles, but I think a common motif with her character is hypocrisy. While she appears enlightened and is a total badass, Sue is a massive hypocrite on a lot of different fronts, but it's mentioned so little in the show that I think it's kind of disappointing. I like Sue, but there's a lot of missed potential with her since there is so much depth to her that goes untapped. Firstly, let's talk about Sue's philosophy and political standings. Yeah, we're getting political a little bit early in this one. I'd say bear with me, but fuck you. Upon Sue's introduction, it's clear that she is a rather zen and free-spirited woman. She values people being able to become the best version of whoever it is that they choose to be, and she bases the city of Zaofu on this very concept. Though she is the de facto leader of this community, she claims to not be their queen, but sometimes she can certainly act like it. In fact, she claims to not believe in monarchy or nepotism, bashing the Earth Queen for the concept being outdated. Her exact words are,
"Oh, she's horrible. She thinks she can just do whatever she wants."
And the wording is very important here because doing whatever you want has kind of been her whole philosophy. Once the Earth Queen is killed and the Earth Kingdom is thrown into chaos, the other world leaders ask Sue to step up and unify the nation, as she is rather qualified. She refuses this offer, stating that she does not wish to impose her will upon others. While this is kind of dumb given the grander context, at least she's staying true to her beliefs of letting people be free, right? Right? Fast forward a bit, and Kuvira, Sue's adopted daughter and top protege, offers to unify the Earth Kingdom in her stead. Sue commands that Kuvira does not go through with this, which inherently contradicts her earlier statement of not imposing her will on anyone. By commanding Kuvira to stand down, she is trying to impose her will onto her, which breaks her own rule. Plus, she's also a coward. She'll go on and on about how the Earth Queen and the monarchy sucks, but as soon as she's given the opportunity to fix what she sees as a problem, she avoids it at all costs because she doesn't want to be seen as a dictator. She later does this yet again after Wu's coronation, where not only does she demand that Kuvira stand down yet again, but now she is doing so at the behest of the other world leaders. She claims to have built Zaofu as a way to escape all of this political nonsense, but now she has found herself representing the very people she tried to escape from. It is clear at this point that she is pro-diplomacy, but later when Kuvira pulls up to Zaofu, Suyin immediately chooses violence. She wants Kuvira taken out and even tries to get Korra to do it for her. Again, she is imposing her ideas on others and is quite entitled in this regard. So far, Suyin has shown no interest in politics or government affairs at all, yet also has harsh opinions on political leaders. She initially has no interest in becoming a political leader, but later speaks on their behalf. She does not want to impose her will on others, yet is shown doing so numerous times, whether that be goading Korra into fighting for her, trying to force Kuvira to step down twice, and even preventing her own daughter from leaving home to learn airbending. While she does learn her lesson with the latter, the former two are never really addressed by any of the other characters, and while they are ultimately pretty minor, the rest of her political contradictions are most certainly not. What I think is important to note about all of this political hypocrisy is that almost all of it stems from her familial hypocrisy. Su values family over anything else, and as a result, she has a huge double standard for them. Like we established, she originally wanted Opal to stay at home to learn airbending instead of letting her go off with the other airbenders. She wants Lin to forgive her, but has made no real attempt to understand why she feels that way despite preaching about being emotionally open. Above all else though, the biggest double standard she has is in her relation to Kuvira. Even though she claims Kuvira is essentially family, she does not treat her the same way she does her blood family. Su is very encouraging of her biological kids, allowing them to follow any path they see fit, which again fits right into her philosophy behind Zaofu. When it comes to Kuvira though, she almost always denies her attempt at autonomy. During the battle against the Red Lotus, Kuvira offers to help, but Su denies that and sends her elsewhere. This shows at least some level of protectiveness for her, but given some later context, it may also be interpreted as apprehension. While this could also be interpreted as more of a tactical decision given the context, Book 4 brings a lot more to unpack. Remember all of those scenes with Su and Kuvira that I mentioned earlier? Well, if it wasn't obvious enough what the source of Su's anger was there, then you haven't been paying attention. Though she once saw Kuvira as family, the second she went against her wishes, she became an adversary. This is all made worse by the fact that Suyin's son, Baatar Jr., is now engaged to Kuvira, making them destined to become family despite their grievances. It's clear that the only reason Suyin takes any political action at all is when her family is at risk. She is apolitical until she is personally affected by it. The clearest indicator of this is the fact that Su was willing to welcome Baatar Jr. back into the family, but refused to show Kuvira that same courtesy despite the two doing equally bad things. Forgiveness for my people, but not for yours. The relationship between Suyin and Kuvira is a prime example of why politics and personal relationships should never mix. So far, I've been painting Suyin as a selfish, entitled hypocrite. And she is. And that's why I like her. Despite being kind of a shitty person, all things considered, she is one of the best written characters in the whole show. Her entitlement and hypocrisy is intentional to give her a sense of nuance. You can understand why she'd make the decisions that she makes given the context, but you don't necessarily agree with them because they come from a biased point of view from a very flawed person, though they never seem to be out of malice. I can understand why fans wouldn't like Suyin very much, since she never really goes unchallenged by the other characters for some of the shit that she pulls, but I think that's additionally interesting. The fact that she is ideologically no different from most of the villains, yet is still an ally to the crew, is a matter of perspective. Also, mommy sorry, mommy sorry, mommy sorry, mommy sorry. Getting back to the topic at hand though, those have been the group's main allies, and while I'm leaving out a few somewhat important ones like Jinora, Bumi, Prince Wu, and a few others, I'd be remiss to not talk about some of the old ones. One thing that this show always seems to get shit for is the way that it treats its legacy characters, which is to say characters from the original show, but I think they were all handled quite well. We see adult or elderly versions of all of the original gang, and while I'll admit that the portrayal of Sokka and the absence of Suki was very disappointing, I think the rest are pretty great.
Don't call it a comeback. I've been here for years. I'm rocking my pants. I'm the original Biefong.
Whether you get better or not is up to you.
The first older character that we see is an elderly Katara, and it's clear that she hasn't changed a whole lot. You know, she's just chilling in the South Pole, doing her healing thing, training her reincarnated husband, you know, normal stuff. But she still carries the spirit of the original character. Katara has always been hopeful and merciful, which we see displayed through her various appearances. It's revealed in Book 1 that she was responsible for the outlawing of bloodbending, which for someone who has used the technique personally and understands just how demonic of a practice it is, makes total sense. She is considered the best healer in the world due to her skill in waterbending, and despite how her teenage self acted in defiance of women just being the healers, it makes sense that she'd be doing something a little bit less physically intense in her old age. Also, reminder, she did train Korra, so all that waterbending badassery, that's all Katara. But most of all, as someone who knew and understood Aang on such a deep emotional level, she is able to relay some of his wisdom down to Korra. She allows Korra to leave the South Pole because she understands how much Aang's journey mattered to him, and believes that she should do the same. During Korra's recovery period, Katara helps by not only healing her physical wounds, but also her mind, by reinstilling her confidence and letting her know that she's not the only one who suffers. I have always described Katara as a character who turns her pain into strength, and because of that, I can think of no one better to guide Korra's recovery, since she must learn this same lesson. Of course, we also get brief flashbacks to Aang himself, and when he actually does stuff, it's fucking great. He at the trial, glow, avatar state, boom, no bending, bad man, epic. That stuff is all cool, but Aang's character in his later life is explored secondhand through his children. In Book 2 of Korra, it's revealed through Kaya and Bumi that they felt neglected by Aang, pointing out that he spent a lot more time with Tenzin than with them. them. Many people simply use this to call Aang a terrible father and leave it at that. And you really shouldn't, because through their arguing and bickering, we get a lot of secondhand character development for Aang in his later life. He clearly loved his children. That's just who he is. He values family like that, but he also values the preservation of his culture just as much. With only one of his 3 kids being an airbender, there becomes a clear conflict of interest, since now Aang is torn between spending time with his whole family or focusing on getting his one airbender up to speed on the whole airbending thing. He simply can't do both, and I don't think that was a decision he even made consciously. It's implied that Aang was so excited about the idea of there being a new airbender to continue his heritage that he unintentionally split his time between his kids unequally. Aang was in a really tough position and did not mean to cause any of the harm that he did to Kaya and Bumi, and while I wouldn't call him a bad parent, he could have done a much better job. But I think that's important to show. It's important to see that Aang, despite all we've seen him accomplish, is still not perfect and that his decisions had negative consequences that he could not have foreseen, which I think was narratively done for the purpose of foreshadowing Korra's decision at the end of the season. Also, a side note about Aang here, because I don't know what fucking video to put this in and I just want to talk about it. I've always loved the fan theory that the age and appearance of avatars in the afterlife is determined by their most important act in their life. For Kyoshi, it was the creation of Kyoshi Island, hence why she still looks the same. For Roku, it was Sozin's betrayal, hence why he looks old. But Aang appears to be in his 30s or 40s when you might think that he'd look 12, since that's how old he was when he defeated the Fire Lord. This theory suggests that the reason for this is because Aang's most important act in life was not defeating Ozai, but rather the birth of Tenzin, because that is the exact moment that he was no longer the last airbender. The reason I bring this up is to point out how Aang's legacy has continued on through those he has left behind. He left behind a waterbending badass, a goofy war general turned airbender, a natural-born airbender with just as much pride in the culture as he has, who has also birthed even more airbenders into the world, and a new avatar that fights to protect that which he has helped build. I could think of no better way for Aang's legacy to be remembered. Moving on, we also get to see Iroh again come book 2. It's implied in the show, and later confirmed in some outside material, that upon his death, Iroh would meditate into the spirit world to live there as his afterlife, and he's just been chilling there ever since. I love the idea of this, since he was always shown to be much more spiritual than most, so having him live among the spirits is a fitting place for him to end up. He helps Korra navigate the spirit world by better controlling her emotions, and this is an integral lesson for her to learn. Iroh's presence is meaningful to the story beyond just being a fun cameo. You know, he even gives a classic Iroh quote on par with some of his older ones, and it fucking goes hard.
If you look for the light, you can often find it. But if you look for the dark, that is all you will ever see.
He shows up one more time in book 2, this time to give some advice to Tenzin, which is a surprise to be sure, but a welcome one. There's also a brief interaction between him and Korra in book 3, and though he doesn't really add much this time around, he tells Korra to try asking Zuko, which leads me to the reappearance of Zuko, who has since abdicated leadership of the Fire Nation to his daughter, and now just kinda chills out, old guy style. I love seeing old man Zuko whenever he shows up, because not only did this guy still got that dog in him, but he's also become just as wise as his uncle Iroh. He becomes a source of wisdom for a new generation in many ways, but most importantly is his advice he gives to Korra. While this advice isn't necessarily the most profound, he speaks from experience just as he learned to during his own journey. The fact that Zuko and Korra both have a lot in common in regards to their respective journeys is great, and I wish it was played with a little bit more. While these two weren't the closest, the bond between the Avatar and the Fire Lord remains unbroken. And last but certainly not least, we can't not talk about the return of Toph Beifong, who even in her old age is still the greatest earthbender in the world, and don't you motherfuckers ever forget it. Well, we technically talked about Toph a little bit earlier, but we're going to talk about her again. A lot of fans really take issue with the fact that Toph became a cop, since in the original show, she had an immense distaste for rules and laws. And while, yeah, that's a bit of a departure from what we'd expect, I think Toph's appearances in her old age bring her back to her roots, pun partially intended, and recontextualize things a little bit. As a kid, Toph was a wild and free spirit, but as we've seen in episodes like The Runaway, she quickly learns that rules are usually there for a reason. And in being a rigid and strict earthbender, I could totally buy that she'd want to add some stability to Aang and Zuko's fancy new city. It's kind of unclear why she became a cop in the first place, but I'd imagine it's likely due to her attitudes towards this kind of shit changing, and perhaps some obligation to her friends, and obviously it no doubt gave her free rein to beat people up. Upon meeting old Toph, she's basically back to how she was as a kid, you know, living freely and all that, but now she's a lot wiser and there's a bit more nuance to it. She doesn't seem to view her job as police chief very fondly because she realized that crime will never stop and that trying to stop it is ultimately futile. She would know. She used to be a criminal. She was so focused on being a cop that she forgot how free she used to be, which is why she exiles herself to the swamp. Toph ending up in the swamp is actually a great way to bring her full circle, since the first time we the audience lay eyes on her is in the swamp. Her destiny is tied to that of the swamp, and they help each other become more connected to the world. And with our legacy characters out of the way, that rounds out every major member of Team Avatar, both new and old. I think this goes to show that this show definitely had the same character building chops that its predecessor had, contrary to what many will tell you. It's just that they showed off these chops in some unexpected places. One of these unexpected places was the show's villains. This show takes a much more seasonal approach to its villains, and while this was technically also the case for Avatar as well, it's much more prominent in Korra that it's kind of hard to ignore. The other thing that's hard to ignore about Korra's villains, they are all inherently political, and there's really no way to talk about them and not bring that shit up. Admittedly, I'm not really qualified to talk about this kind of shit because I'm pretty politically ignorant when it comes to the deeper theory about all this shit, so take everything I say here with a grain of salt and let it be known that these guys in no way represent my actual political beliefs. In fact, my political beliefs are the opposite of whatever yours happen to be because it'll piss you off more, and we love to do a little bit of trolling.
I told you I would destroy you. The time has come for the Equalists to claim Republic City. My followers and I will not rest until the entire city achieves equality. The revolution has begun!
The first villain to arise in this age of a new Avatar is, of course, Amon, a masked man of mystery with the ability to permanently strip people of their bending. As the leader of the Equalists, he aims to rid the world of bending entirely, spreading his message through political propaganda and acts of terror. He is an intimidating, badass motherfucker, and I absolutely love him as a concept. While the larger writing surrounding the character is a bit messy, which I will get to in a later section, the character himself and his beliefs are actually super interesting, even if it is technically because of how messily he's written, but sure. Messily? Is that a word? I don't fucking care. I think one of the most alluring things about him that many actually criticize him for is the fact that his motivations are very unclear. While this could be chalked up to the writers not actually having a good motivation for him, which might very well be the case, I think it adds a level of complexity to him, regardless of if it was intentional or not. In the beginning of the season, we learn that Amon wants to get rid of bending because in his eyes, it always leads to conflict, and his backstory that's revealed later seems to reaffirm this. His shitty childhood and abusive training with his father, Yakone, who always abused and belittled him and his brother, taught Amon that bending is only a tool for harm, since that is all he has ever seen it used for. This becomes super ironic to the Equalist movement when it's revealed that Amon was a waterbender the whole time. Then it gets extra ironic since the only way he can take bending away from people is by using bending himself, as he has a unique type of blood bending that allows him to do so without the use of a full moon and without even moving his body. This is by far the most threatening thing about him, since once you know he's a bloodbender, every scene with him carries a completely different weight, and the fact that he can do one of the most powerful techniques so casually at any time is genuinely pretty scary and adds tension to every scene that he's in. It's actually implied that the reason he is so elusive and nobody ever touches him throughout the first season is because he's secretly bloodbending his opponents just enough so that their attacks always miss, but never enough to where it's noticeable. Anyways though, my point is that Amon seems to genuinely view bending as evil, so in his eyes, his use of it to remove people's bending is a benevolent act, a necessary evil, as it were. He doesn't want to use it because he does not view it as a good thing, but he does so because it's the only way to achieve his goal. Unless he has some way of removing his own bending, it's also incredibly ironic that if he somehow did achieve his goal and all benders had their bending taken away, he'd be left as the only bender in the world. He would forever be cursed with this ability that he believes nobody should ever have. And I think this is where a bit of the nuance comes in, because Amon is clearly an egomaniac to some degree. I mean, the dude starts what is basically a cult where he holds echo chamber rallies, and his main power is literally controlling people against their will. It doesn't get more fucking obvious than that. But this also begs the question, at what point did Amon's actions stop being noble? The guy genuinely wants equality, but how he goes about achieving that is pretty egocentric. He views bending as evil, but still allows himself to use it to do the very thing he claims to stand against. If he had his way and removed all benders and was the only one left, he'd literally be the most powerful being on the planet, and it's left unclear as to if that's actually something he wants. And this also begs the question, what actually is equality? The ideology of Amon, and thereby the rest of the Equalists, is often compared to communism. At least, it is by people who have a simple-minded view of politics, because its views align more so with a form of social egalitarianism, in which all citizens are treated as equals with equal value and opportunity. Of course, in the Avatar world, and even in real life, not all people are created equal in that some are born with better aptitude for different things. For example, some people are simply born to become tall, which can give them an advantage in some ways over people who are born short, but this also works the other way around, because sometimes people who are born short can do things that people that are born tall can't do. These are things that cannot be controlled, which raises an issue with this concept. Not everyone is born equal through no fault of their own. In the Avatar world, one of these somethings is bending, which of course some people are born with and some are not. Benders and non-benders are inherently inherently different due to the way they were born, and this affects the way they are viewed and treated in society. There are jobs that only specific benders are able to do, and benders have what seems like a monopoly on gang violence in Republic City and are often seen abusing their powers. Non-benders most certainly do not have it easy in this regard, and Amon uses this mostly underlying issue to his advantage and brings it to light. Whether or not these problems were actually present within the city, which they were because the show literally shows it, but I'll get to that later, Amon was able to weaponize this sentiment and create what is essentially a cult. I hate using the word cult in response to anything political because it's fucking overdone and stupid, but that's what it is, right? This was where his radicalization began, because now that he has people on his side that agree with him, constantly feeding his ego, the original purpose of his movement has been completely lost and no longer represents what it's supposed to. The equalists want equality, but what they're really doing by taking out benders is not equality, at least on a broader scale. The crux of egalitarianism is everyone being treated equally, but this has been flipped on its head to now demonize benders just for being benders, which is inherently opposed to the entire concept. Non-benders claimed to be oppressed, but are now becoming the oppressors by waging war on all benders. Were there benders who abused their power against non-benders? Of course, we literally see it throughout the entire Avatar universe, but equality is not gained by tearing down the people with an advantage, but rather by building up those with a disadvantage. Amon and the Equalists clearly have a very warped view of what equality actually is, because they are trying to achieve it in the most harmful and backwards way possible. At the same time though, it's hard to blame them, since in the Avatar world, bending is so central to who a person is that non-benders can never truly understand it. There is a lack of understanding on both sides, and this is exactly what Amon uses as a weapon, whether his intentions were pure or not. And honestly, that's the most dubious thing about Amon, his ability to mobilize people. Whether or not non-bender oppression was actually a widespread problem within the city is irrelevant. Irrelevant. Right, Scum? Irrelevant. Because Amon was able to use just the idea of it to manipulate people. If it did actually exist to a noticeable degree, then he used people's anger to rally them together for a cause. But if this wasn't actually a major problem that most people didn't notice or care about, then he was able to manipulate them into believing that it was, which is honestly way scarier than it being there in the first place. Overall though, Amon is a truly depressing character. His entire life sucked ass because people with no morals used bending to hurt him and the people he cared about, but eventually became that very oppressor. His views became so twisted that he became the very thing he swore to destroy. At the same time though, he kinda had a point if you see things from his point of view, and I think that's ultimately the beauty of his character. He is morally complex in that, depending on which angle you look at him from, he could make total sense or seem completely off his rocker, and both interpretations are entirely valid. Of course, I am gonna mention the cliche thing that everybody always mentions with these villains, right? They had good intentions, but bad execution. And while I will try to avoid that going forward because it's just kind of obvious, I think Amon is the clearest example of the four main antagonists. Also, he's voiced by Steve Bloom, so just automatic W in my book.
I love the kind of woman that can kick my ass. Hey guys, I'm totally in for taking out Bolin. He's way too powerful and awesome. But can we please not include...
Not include who, Amon? There are no evils. There is light and dark in them all. A dark avatar. Find the light in the dark.
Within the fandom, Unalaq is definitely the least talked about of Korra's villains, and in many ways, it's clear to see why. He's kind of boring and generic in a lot of ways, and much like Book 2 as a whole, it's just kind of become a meme to say that it's bad without much contention from the larger fandom. However, this guy is a lot deeper than people give him credit for, because he is genuinely one of the most intelligent characters in all of Avatar, even though he isn't always written so intelligently. Like, no shade to the writers or anything, but Jesus fucking Christ. Unalaq, more like Unacock. Fucking got him. On that note, this dude is a master manipulator. Well, maybe not Azula tier, but he's definitely way up there. His plan is so complex that it takes like 3 fucking plot twists to fully unravel it. It's a little fucking insane. He starts by starting a war between the northern and southern water tribes under the pretense of uniting the two tribes. As we'll later learn, this war is both a distraction and a power play, as Unalaq wants control over both poles so he can have easier access to both spirit portals, but its initial purpose is also to distract Korra so that she doesn't catch on to his real plan. The war became the way he gained control of the southern portal, but the way he gained control of the northern portal was through more manipulation. In order to take the throne from his brother and become the new chief of the northern water tribe, he framed Tonraq for angering the spirits and causing an attack on the tribe, getting his brother banished and taking the throne for himself. Fucking water Ozai, headass. Now he has a reason for his brother to lose his birthright and a reason to help the spirits, making him look more benevolent to them than he really is. At his core though, Unalaq does seem to genuinely want to reunite humans and spirits. He has a real passion for spirituality, even developing an entire waterbending technique in order to calm rogue spirits. He disagreed with Avatar 1 closing the portals, so he seeks to undo that, which he just so happens to have the perfect opportunity for when he finds out that harmonic convergence is within his lifetime and that his niece happens to be the Avatar. This man was simply blessed with opportunities to make his dream a reality, and I think it's fitting that a villain so focused on theology seems to be so divinely chosen. I don't think this was done by accident either, as he is intentionally written to be a spiritual person, so it makes sense these spirits seem to favor him and his plans go almost flawlessly throughout most of the season as if it were destined to happen. We know that destiny is a thing that exists in the Avatar universe, so it stands to reason that Unalaq was destined to become one with the spirits, even if they took that meaning a little bit too literally. Things working out for him the way that they did shows that he's both maniacally evil and extremely lucky, and those two things coexist perfectly to make this man a fucking psycho. That being said, a lot of fans don't like Unalaq for his motivations being too vague, and even when they are clear, they're inconsistent. He wants to reunite humans and spirits, but this later revolves into an obsession with Vaatu and becoming the Dark Avatar, which seems way too insane for him given he was first introduced as a pretty intelligent and reserved guy. This is retroactively fixed in Book 3 with a brief line from Zaheer, who mentions that Unalaq was once a member of the Red Lotus, but left when his plan didn't line up with theirs. I think this demonstrates something important about Unalaq's character. He was always an agent of chaos. The Red Lotus are an anarchist group, so the fact that he was a part of it meant that he at least somewhat agreed with them. This seems to perfectly explain why he becomes obsessed with merging with Vaatu and becoming the Dark Avatar, because he took the Red Lotus's philosophy of bringing forth chaos in order to establish peace to an extreme degree. He wanted to establish 10,000 years of chaos so there can be 10,000 years of peace after that, which is a rather perverted view of what balance truly is, though that's a topic for later. In terms of his politics, Unalaq's views seem to be most akin to a theocracy, which later evolves into a form of religious extremism. He wishes to reunite people and spirits, but he also wants all of society to appreciate spiritualism as much as he does, and in some ways, he's not entirely wrong. In the season premiere, he mentions how the Glacier Spirits Festival used to be a religious experience where people would fast and meditate, but is now a commercialized event used for fun and leisure, with its original intention being lost on everyone. The people of the Southern Water Tribe have lost their religion, so to speak, and Unalaq wants to bring them back to their roots, and as the chief of the North, he technically has the power to do that. Motherfucker wants to put the god back in schools and shit, bro. If there was an Avatar Bible, that motherfucker would be the Bible beater, bro. Fuck the Bible. I'm gonna beat my dick on it. I gotta find a video of a guy coming on the Bible. That's gotta be a thing. Of course, as his real plan with Vaatu unfolds, his views become a bit warped, reflecting how religious dogma can completely absorb people's ability to think rationally. That's not to say being religious is bad, but putting too much stock into it can be dangerous, especially when the message of that religion is vastly misinterpreted. In learning the story of Rava and Vaatu, Unalaq came to the conclusion that Vaatu should be freed in order to restore true balance, which is obviously a very corrupted view of that, since that means he also believes in the destruction of all life in order for it to be reborn. It makes sense that he'd think that, but he was so into the idea that he stopped thinking of all the harm that would truly cause. The moral of Wan's story is that keeping the peace is the way to maintain balance in the world, but Unalaq misinterpreted that as balance requiring a reboot of sorts. In going off the deep end the way that he does, he shows that he's just as susceptible to power as anyone else. He may believe himself to be divine in some way, but he is still human and can succumb to human faults. Overall, Unalaq is honestly a really underrated character. The writing around him is very messy, since there's never really an explanation for why his goals changed so drastically, and not enough context is given for why he is this way, but all the pieces are there, and if you find the time to put them together, you get a character who isn't just a one-note rehash of the guy from the last show. I mean, I know I joked about him being Water Ozai earlier, but Unalaq was at least somewhat rational and could be understood, and that's gotta count for something. Really digging at straws with this guy, but he's actually goated, so like suck a dick and fucking perish.
That when you base your expectations only on what you see, you blind yourself to the possibilities of a new reality.
New growth cannot exist without first the destruction of the old.
The revolution has already begun!
I found true freedom. I am no longer bound to this earth by worldly desires. I have entered the void.
But when it comes to who Korra's best villain is, it's often a toss-up for me between Kuvira and Zaheer. And while as a character I personally think Kuvira is way better, Zaheer has a much more interesting philosophy that is way more fun to dissect. Right off the bat, just the concept of this guy is fucking awesome. You take an airbender, the most peaceful of all benders, and make him evil with a twisted version of their philosophy. It's just such a great idea, like a what if Aang was evil type beat. I mean, Shaolin Showdown beat them to the punch like 9 years earlier, but that's not the point. This alone is a great basis for his character, but he also works in another way. He's also a negative consequence of Korra leaving the portals open. While this is more so in service of her character than Zaheer's, him getting airbending as a result of Korra's actions goes to show that there were negative consequences to leaving the portals open, since she basically unintentionally created him. She could not have possibly foreseen this, but now she has to deal with it, so Zaheer serves as a reminder of that. Anyways, like I said, Zaheer is basically an evil airbender. He takes the philosophy of an airbender by adapting virtues like the value of freedom and peace, but without any of the air nomad's moral moral dogma. He wishes to live freely, but is not above restricting other people's freedoms in order to get it. I believe the term morally gray is what the pretentious video essayists use. Hey, I'm one of those. If you really think about it, in some ways, he's ironically more airbender than some masters, in that he seems to truly understand the core of the culture's beliefs. For example, he's not above killing people if he has to, but he'd rather not do it. In principle, he is a pacifist, though in practice he has killed people, but then again, so did Monkey Yatso. He was even able to learn to fly, an ability once thought lost to time that only a great master was able to do through reaching enlightenment. Though his airbending skills weren't so great in terms of combat, he is philosophically a great airbender. But getting into the politics, at his core, Zaheer is an anarchist. He does not respect governments placing restrictions on how people can live their lives, as he wants all people to be free to do whatever they want. Pretty self-explanatory. Anarchism is actually a pretty interesting ideology when you really look into it. And to reiterate, I'm not a political scientist by any means, but it's low-key kind of fucking based. The idea behind anarchism is that there are no governments and that people are able to live freely, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there is no rule of law. The people are left to govern themselves, thereby retaining their individual autonomy. Anarchism often gets confused for anarchy, and while the two share the same root word, they are two different things. Zaheer is an anarchist in its original sense. He wants people to live freely without authority looming over them. But what he inevitably creates is anarchy, where there are no rulers, but nobody is on the same page as him, so it just devolves into chaos. Anarchism is really interesting because it can only work if everyone understands what the end goal is, which on a grander scale is kind of impossible. But Zaheer is a man who believes in the impossible, so he thinks it can be done with his guidance. After all, he was blessed with the gift of airbending, so much like Unalaq, he views himself as divinely chosen. During his introductory scene, Zaheer also reveals his other goal, to end the Avatar. Why the fuck would he do this?
Why would you do any of that?
Well, originally he wanted to abduct Korra as a baby and raise her to fall in line with the Red Lotus's beliefs and essentially use her as a weapon, but that plan failed, so he had to shift accordingly in the decades since. By this point, there was no convincing Korra of his ideas, so she now serves as a threat. The Avatar is the person who brings balance to the world, the ultimate authority figure, if you will. Zaheer hates authority figures, so for him to truly bring chaos and achieve his plans, the Avatar cannot exist. Their relationship is actually quite interesting, because he actually comes pretty close to convincing her. In their conversation at Zhai Bao's grove, he mentions that the Earth Queen is a tyrant and President Raiko is an incompetent fool, and the world would likely be better off if they were not the ones in charge, and Korra actually agrees. What she doesn't agree with is taking them out just because they've been wrong in the past, or at the very least not without replacing them with a better authority figure. This is why a lot of people say that Zaheer has a point, because he honestly does, since almost all world leaders are corrupt in some way. In this sense, anarchism seems kind of fucking dope, since there is no corruption or tyranny, just the free will of the people. But because of this, a lot of detractors of Zaheer claim that he is dumb for not realizing that anarchism wouldn't work and would just result in anarchy and create a power vacuum. But that's the thing. Zaheer isn't stupid. He's been shown all throughout the series to be intelligent, understanding, and pretty down to earth, ironically. The thing about Zaheer is that a lot of people completely misunderstand what his plan actually was. He didn't want to create chaos just for the sake of chaos. He wanted to create chaos so that once the dust settled, people would come together to form a new, more free society without governments. You know, he's not like the fucking Joker who wants to just watch the world burn to get his rocks off. Zaheer wants to watch the world burn and then rebuild a better one from the ashes. It's literally this meme, but unironically and with actual intent behind it. In fact, Zaheer literally knew that there was a possibility of that power vacuum being filled, which is why he aims to kill Korra so the Avatar, aka the person whose job it would be to fix this problem, wouldn't be around to restore balance. In fact, he wanted to do this before killing the Earth Queen, but accelerated his plans when he realized he could use it to get to Korra. He also never intended on being thrown in prison, with his actual plan being to help guide people out of this chaos and indoctrinate them into his ideology. How he planned to do that for an entire nation is beyond me, but if people were able to organize into groups on their own after Kuvira's crusade, I think he had a pretty good chance. My point is, Zaheer isn't dumb. He had a whole-ass plan, but the plan eventually went off the rails, so he adjusted it. I know I stumbled into defending Korra territory again, but I can't stand this criticism because it misses the fucking point. Oh, Zaheer has a 13-year-old understanding of what anarchism is. No, he fucking doesn't. You're actually just... You stupid! There's actually an interesting parallel that I noticed between Zaheer and Suyin. Both of them have a disdain for governments flaunting their power, specifically citing the Earth Queen, and both believe in free societies in which people are free to bring out the best of themselves. The difference between them is that Su achieved this by creating Zaofu, a city where the citizens are free and is mostly out of the control of the Earth Queen, while Zaheer wanted this on a much larger scale. I don't think it's a coincidence that these two are both introduced in the same season with their opinions on government being put front and center. What Zaheer wants is essentially Zaofu without the guards, and Suyin was really close to achieving that, but was a bit tyrannical in her own way. Without a doubt, Zaheer's most impressive moment is learning to fly. The whole season he's been preaching the gospel of Guru Lahima, an airbender who became so detached from the world that he was able to levitate. Zaheer loves this fucking guy and follows his beliefs to a T, but is still unable to do so, meaning that there is still something tethering him to this world. world. He's like airbending Andrew Tate. Shouts out John, we need more John 10. This something is his girlfriend Plea, who based on their height is probably the actual reason he wants to fly. Bro can't even reach the titties. He can't even reach the titties to motorboat him. Fucking bullshit. When Plea is killed in battle, Zaheer does not give in to despair, but rather embraces her death and becomes detached. The one person grounding him is no longer there to do so, so he is able to enter the void. I love how this actually parallels Aang when trying to unlock the Avatar state. Aang refused to let go of his earthly attachments, which in his case was Katara, and therefore could not reach enlightenment. Zaheer did let go his earthly tether and was able to empty and become wind. Be the leaf, as it were.
They fly now! They fly now! They fly now!
All that aside though, I love Zaheer's brief appearance in Book 4 because it shows a lot of growth for the character. When he was first defeated by Team Avatar, he was clearly off the deep end, but since being imprisoned, he has mellowed out a lot. He's a lot more zen and is ironically more free than he's ever been with his ability to enter the spirit world. Though his chains keep him from using his power of flight, he still finds a way to live his life the way he wants. The only way he can continue to live freely is by going into the spirit world, but he also lacks his bending this way, so there's a level of irony to it. In this scene, Zaheer helps Korra get over his fear of him, as it was his actions that crippled her physically and emotionally. At this point, he realizes that his actions were a bit over the top. And while I don't think he's been rehabilitated and would definitely try again if given the chance, his willingness to help is indicative of the fact that he's certainly not crazy anymore.
I am not crazy!
I know he switched those numbers. It was 12-18, one after Magna Carta.
Chicanery?
The one thing that I personally feel that Zaheer lacks is that it's hard to get emotionally invested in him. You know, he doesn't have any kind of tragic backstory like the other villains to get you to sympathize with him, but I think this actually works in his favor, since it displays that he is a man so dedicated to his cause that he forgot to develop a personality. Political beliefs aside, he's kind of just a regular dude, and I think that makes him more grounded than any backstory ever could. At the end of the day though, Zaheer is a great character, and if you disagree, then I am sorry, but you just straight up did not pay attention to him. He is the perfect example of the show being politically nuanced, which is something that people often praise it for, and he's the first one I think of when I think of not just Korra villains, but Avatar villains, period. Now let's talk about Hitler.
Hitler? I am Adolf Hitler! Command of the Third Reich! Little known fact, also dope on the mic!
And lastly, for the major villains, let's talk about Kuvira, whose efforts to reunify the Earth Kingdom after Zaheer's actions resulted in her becoming the most influential dictator in 173 years. Hitler's back, bitches! As the right-hand woman and adoptive daughter to Suyin, Kuvira actually gets her start in Book 3, where she makes some brief appearances that make a lot more sense with hindsight, but come Book 4 and she is now the primary threat. At first, her actions seem quite noble by helping her country in a time of turmoil, but her thirst for power eventually leads her on a vengeful path to war to achieve more power. It's no secret that Kuvira and her army are meant to be akin to fascism or a military dictatorship. It's debatable whether this is just a dictatorship or straight-up fascism, since it can fit either definition depending on how you look at it. Fascism is driven by nationalism, while a dictatorship is driven by the will of one leader, but both do involve the use of military force. Examples of both of these can be seen throughout Book 4. When Kuvira tries to get the state of Yai to join her ranks, she does so by indirectly threatening the destruction of the town, with the implication being that her military presence is what will protect them from bandits and marauders. Her rise to power is implied to be largely made up of these thinly veiled threats, which leads into another aspect of her nationalism, which is that she makes an enemy out of those who do not agree with her or immediately join her. She states this pretty blatantly when she declares her reign at the coronation, but also shows it in other, often more theatrical ways. Like bro, in this scene, she is given the Kyoshi Medal of Freedom, which she then crushes. She literally crushes freedom. How's that for symbolic? The most obvious that comes to mind, though, is the arrest of the Biefongs for their refusal to pledge their allegiance to her, though in fairness, that's probably for more personal reasons. Regardless, she is more than ready and willing to make good on any and all threats that she makes, since she has full control of a massive military that she is not afraid to use. The way she got this army to follow her is likely through her nationalistic beliefs. Nationalism is a big factor of Kuvira's reign, as she believes the Earth Kingdom should only be home to Earth Kingdom natives. This is expressed through her re-education camps, which consist of water and firebenders that she believes do not belong, and therefore deems as political dissenters just for living there. This is also applied a bit more broadly by making her followers believe in an external enemy, whether that be bandits or some other threat to their national identity, resulting in a very black and white us versus them mentality. Her final goal is to retake Republic City, which was built on what used to be Earth Kingdom land, which she believes she is entitled to for nationalistic reasons. I think you get the picture by now. Kuvira holds all the power and is driven by nationalistic beliefs, so the point is, shit is fucked. However, the reason for why shit is fucked is rather interesting, since similarly to the other villains, Kuvira began with good intentions. The thing that makes makes her so different from the others, though, is that she actually had good intentions that devolved into her reign of terror, while the others put up somewhat of a guise of nobility and just had twisted views from the jump. You know, Amon always had a fucked up view of equality. Unalaq always had a fucked up view of spirituality and balance. Zaheer always had a fucked up view of freedom, but Kuvira did, at one point, have a reasonable view of unity. When Kuvira takes on the task of reunifying the Earth Kingdom, she does so out of a genuine desire to help her nation and promised to step down once peace had been established. We even see that her methods were actually bringing some semblance of stability to the Earth Kingdom, but that view was lost when she refused to give up said power for various psychological reasons that we'll get into shortly. The term absolute power corrupts absolutely gets tossed around a lot with Korra's villains and is a bit overused in general, but I feel like that's such a vague statement that you kind of need to stretch it a little to make it work in most cases. Kuvira is a rare instance where that saying actually applies, since her power is the very thing that corrupts her. It's pretty on the fucking nose. She was not a maniacal warmonger before she had power, and she is the only of Korra's villains where we actually see this change. I think that one of the most tragic things about Kuvira is that she was essentially created by Suyin, which is why their relationship is so tumultuous. Growing up, Suyin instilled into Kuvira the importance of strength, power, and discipline, but also the more general beliefs behind Zaofu, like the importance of personal development and modernization. Kuvira begins her crusade with Su's more progressive teachings in mind. She wants to become the best version of herself by modernizing the Earth Kingdom and helping it to be the best version of itself. Su always taught her about progress, and now this is her chance to actually do that. And that being said, Su was actually very overprotective of Kuvira as she is with her other kids, so of course Kuvira would feel like her talents weren't being utilized to their fullest. We can see this take form even before the time skip. In the battle against the Red Lotus, Kuvira offers to jump into action, but Su denies her, likely out of fear that she would also get hurt or killed. Like I mentioned earlier, it could have been seen as a strategy play, but it was likely much more personal than the nature of the exchange would lead you to believe. However, this also applies the other way around. While many of Kuvira's actions can be interpreted as plays for more power, they can also be interpreted as acts of spite against Su and the Beifongs. She started her mission only after Su's refusal. She gets with Baatar Jr. because it'll piss off Su. She tried to take Zaofu when she didn't need it just to flex her achievements in front of Su. She humiliates the Beifongs in front of the whole city and takes down the walls of that very city to build her mech.
Just so you know, that was a power move.
What?
Nothing.
This all raises the question of would Kuvira have gone this far if not for the way Suyin treated her? Well, yes and no. While her love for Baatar Jr. seemed real and her logic behind taking Republic City wasn't related to Su at all, the majority of her decisions seem like plays to prove herself in some way to Suyin, and that would make sense when you consider her past. Kuvira was an orphan taken in by Suyin at a young age. Without getting into the comics, it's implied in the show that she was somewhat of a problem child, but ended up becoming Su's most trusted advisor. She took on the challenge of fixing the Earth Kingdom partially because she was angry that Su wouldn't, which goes against everything she's taught her thus far. She felt betrayed by her only role model, and I'd be willing to bet that brought back all of the pain of her biological parents abandoning her. She's known what it's like to be weak, powerless, and lacking direction, and wanted to impart that on her whole nation. She wants the rest of her nation to have the stability that she never did. Dictators don't arise from well-adjusted human beings, so it's clear that Kuvira's actions that led her down this path were indicative of some more deep-seated emotional problems that she more or less spells out in her final exchange with Korra.
Oh, fuck. Oh my fucking god, I'm so horny. Oh, fuck me.
I think it's safe to say that Kuvira is the most human of Korra's villains because of this very reason. She is driven to take action by her own trauma, and that naturally evolves into an extreme version of herself that's clearly an overcorrection. Now, I'm not saying we should be out here, humanizing dictators. I don't give a fuck if Hitler's dog loved them, but we should acknowledge that these people are not born, they are created. Kuvira would not have risen to power if she had a better relationship with Su, or if she had a generally more stable upbringing, and it's important to see why she went off the deep end. She's the most realistic villain in the series if you ask me, but I would also like to ask you a bit of a hypothetical. If you had a tiny clone of Kuvira, would you torture it?
I wouldn't fuck with him because he didn't do anything.
No, you're saying he's tiny too. Why is he tiny?
Hey, cunt. Hey, autofocus. I'm over here, fuckhead. No. Fuck you. Hey, it's me. It's me, Mario. This bitch better not be out of focus. Why the fuck is autofocus doing that? There we go. That was fucking weird. Why did it do that? I'm gay. As you can tell, the villains here are pretty complex, and I would even argue that they're some of the most complex characters in all of Avatar. They often get a lot of shit from detractors because on a surface level, they only seem to represent a shallow and exaggerated view of their respective ideologies, but I disagree with this on multiple fronts. Firstly, they are actually rather deep and represent their ideologies pretty succinctly, as we just went into. They show the concepts, how those concepts evolve, and how they corrupt people to become the worst version of that ideology, all while showing the pros and cons. And secondly, yeah, these are somewhat simplified versions of these ideologies, but that's kind of a necessary evil. There's only so much they can get into with the runtime that they have and the restrictions of Nickelodeon, so it makes perfect sense that they would streamline things to be friendlier to a TV format. So when people make the argument, yeah, it's a surface level view of it without looking into it, it's like, yeah, if you don't look into it, that's the fucking point of why it's surface level, you dumb bitch. I mean, Avatar had the same deal with the chakras, you know, they kind of breezed through that and gave a surface level explanation, so sacrificing depth is kind of a necessity sometimes, which is why I can forgive Korra for how these things are presented, even though they're presented very well, you know what I mean? However, as I've been alluding to thus far, many of these characters, not just the villains, but all of them thus far, have a few writing flaws attached to them, and I think this is indicative of some of the larger problems with the series as a whole. I'll certainly be touching on those problems and some positives as we go on, but overall this show is a lot like its predecessor in that its characters are its biggest strength. And while that might sound like I'm knocking it considering how messy some of these characters are, I'm not. For this next segment, I would like to go through each book of Korra individually and talk about the good and the bad. Basically, this is going to be the general review part of the video where I detail my thoughts on the general writing of the show, with some extra stuff mixed in there. We'll obviously be starting with book 1 because, you know, we're not fucking stupid, but I'll bring up the more general stuff when it comes up naturally. Firstly, as a more general thing, the music for this entire show is fucking phenomenal. I know people who don't like the show at all, but even its biggest detractors still bust it down to this OST. It's so similar to Avatar's sound, but so different at the same time. You know, some tracks will have that ancient Eastern influence, while others have that more jazzy vibe, you know what I mean? It's very diverse in its musical choices. It really gives Korra its own feel, and it has some of the best tracks in the entire franchise. But to get specifically into book 1, a lot of what I love about it is that it's great at setting shit up, though one of my biggest criticisms is that it doesn't always pay that off in the best way. I'll get into the latter as we go, but as for the former, the first few episodes do a really good job at setting up the world and characters and how they relate to each other and the story itself. The bulk of this is in relation to Korra, since her entire character in book 1 is meticulously set up to perfectly contrast the world that she's in. I won't repeat what I said earlier, but the gist of it is that almost every facet of her character is challenged in some way by the other characters and by the world. As for the other characters, I feel like a lot of them are the result of the world itself and how it's changed since Avatar. As we all know, the big focus throughout the first season is Republic City. The show dedicates a lot of time to exploring the city and learning about its culture, and it's definitely necessary to a degree. For a lot of stuff in the story to make sense, we need to understand Republic City at its core, since everything about the city plays a role. Tenzin and Tarlok are members of the city council, so their actions have a direct effect on how the story unfolds. Mako and Bolin's relation to the triple threat shows us a darker side of the city by detailing its criminal underbelly. Even Asami and her father show us the philosophy behind the city's industrialization. Some of the less desirable qualities fly in the face of what we originally told the city was like when Aang and Zuko created it, so it displays the city as having fallen from grace a bit, so it adds a level of world building that ties directly into the main conflict. However, in being so focused on the city, this season is also really fucking boring visually. It's a city. Have you ever been to literally any city? Then congratulations, you know what Republic City looks like. A lot of the action happens at night too, so all of the backgrounds are all dark and gross, but even when they are in the city during the day, all the colors just feel so bland. There's a lot of grays and browns. It's kind of just boring to look at, honestly. I loved any scene where we were on Air Temple Island because it was like, there was actually some color to it for fucking once. And even then, not always. I don't think it's the city itself that's the issue though, since the city is shown a few times later in the series and it looks and feels fine, but season 1, for whatever reason, just doesn't have a whole lot that stands out visually. The industrialized East Asian aesthetic to the architecture is a nice visual flair though, so I don't completely hate it. But the art direction drastically affects the tone of the season as well, since everything feels dark and dreary a lot of the time. While this isn't entirely caused by the aesthetic, it does play a major role. I find it a bit ironic that Avatar took place during a literal war and is more tonally vibrant than Korra, which is during a time of relative peace. The Legend of Korra does have its lighthearted moments, but they always feel short-lived, and a lot of the more serious moments feel a lot more melodramatic than they were probably intended to, because the contrast between them is a lot less gradual than its predecessor. Avatar was able to switch from funny to serious on a dime, and they had a way of flowing back and forth naturally. But book 1 of Korra has scenes that are purely for comedy, and that are purely for advancing the plot or for having serious moments, and the transition between them is often pretty abrupt. When they try to combine the two and include a joke in a more serious scene, it often doesn't work the same way as it did in Avatar. Milo farting moment. I actually like Milo. Book 1's dialogue is a bit rough in this regard as well, since line deliveries could sometimes feel flat, and there are moments where the characters just don't sound right. I'm not going to be too harsh on this front though, since it's the first season and the cast was still kind of trying to find their footing. It's just kind of how that thing goes, right? That being said though, this show has some of the most unique voices I've heard in animation, and it's one of the things that separates this show from others for me. I've already mentioned J.K. Simmons as Tenzin, and he fucking crushes it, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. Korra is played by Janet Varney, Barney, who aside from just having a rather unique voice, is mostly a comedic actress, which would seem like it wouldn't fit for a somewhat more serious show like this, but she actually makes it work really well. PJ Barn, the voice of Bolin, is quite similar in this regard, since he's mostly an on-screen actor, but has such a unique voice that you can immediately identify him in anything, and he fits Bolin's personality perfectly. This show is just fucking stacked when it comes to the voice cast. Think of any prominent voice actor, and they're probably in it in some way. It's fucking crazy. Speaking of crazy, let's get into the story. As we all know, the main story revolves around Korra coming to Republic City and finding that there is a growing resentment toward Benders led by Amon, so she must stop him from taking over the city. Alongside that though, this season also has a lot of subplots going on at once, and I don't personally mind that. One such example of these plots is the pro-bending stuff in the first half of the season. They put a lot of focus on this early on, and in a lot of ways, I really like it. Bending being used for sport is nothing new, and I like how this is a more modern application of that. The professional stadium setting enhances the world building by showing how people's views on bending have changed over time, and the idea of a tournament arc in Avatar is one of the coolest things ever. It is a dope concept and a welcome addition to the Avatar lore. Narratively, it's a plot device, and while there's nothing wrong with that inherently, I take issue with the fact that it eats up so much screen time in the early episodes. Like, okay, right, I get how pro-bending is important to the bonding of our main cast, and how its prevalence in the culture of the city makes it a prime target for Amon later in the season. It has its purpose, but at the same time, we spend way too much time watching these fucking matches that it takes away from stuff that could have been more important to see. Not that pro-bending isn't important, but there were pieces of the story that could have been expanded on further that weren't in favor of showing pro-bending matches in their entirety. Like, you know, we could have gotten a much deeper look at the issues plaguing the city that sparked the equalist movement, but instead we have a sports drama going on. The matches are cool, but most of the time they add nothing, and at worst they feel like padding sometimes. The lack of music in these scenes most of the time really takes me out of it personally, since it makes it feel like a real sporting event, which stylistically is really cool, but I hate sports, so it bores me. But I think this illustrates a major issue for Book 1. It has a lot of trouble deciding on what it wants to focus on, so it essentially throws a bunch of shit at the wall and sees what sticks. That's not to say any of these ideas are bad, but rather that the writers clearly wanted to fit as much cool stuff as they could into what at the time they believed to be their only season, so they tried to stuff it all in at once, which makes it feel a bit bloated with ideas that are somewhat half-baked. I think these focus issues are most prevalent with the other subplot of the first half, the infamous Mako, Asami, Korra love triangle. Wait, Bolin is involved too, so is it a diamond now? A rhombus, perhaps? Whatever it is, I don't fucking like it. Okay, well that's not entirely true, because I do like bits and pieces of it, but the whole thing just kind of rubs me the wrong way. Now, not to compare Korra to its predecessor or anything, but in Avatar, romance was always an underlying presence that only became the focus of an episode once or twice, and because of the more episodic nature of it, they could get away with detours like that every so often. Korra tries to do the same thing, but the romance and drama surrounding it is way more upfront than most of the season. You know, Korra likes Mako, Mako likes Asami, Korra confesses her feelings, Mako reconsiders. It's a whole fucking thing. The idea isn't bad per se, but such a big deal is made about it early in the season, with an entire episode completely dedicated to romance shit, but it just kind of fades out into the background as the main plot really kicks up. You'd think that this would be a more important thing if they're building it up this way, but it ends up just not really being that important at the end of the day, with a soft resolution that kind of leaves a sour taste in your mouth. If you're gonna focus on this, focus on it. If you want it to be an underlying thing, make it an underlying thing. I think episode 6, The Aftermath, is this concept done at its best, since it plays with Korra's crush on Mako in more indirect ways. She has trouble befriending Asami due to their circumstances, and Korra's suspicion of Hiroshi being an equalist creates tension within the group. It makes it seem like she only suspects him because she's jealous of Asami and wants to take her down to have Mako for herself, and I think that's kind of interesting. It gives Korra and Asami a reason to interact and have a form of romantic tension with Mako while also forwarding the story. At times, the love triangle can be really useful, but at other times, not so much. Case in point, episode 5, The Spirit of Competition. The episode where Korra tries to make Mako jealous by dating Bolin. This is a notoriously hated episode, even among fans of the show, and I'm inclined to agree. A lot of people don't like it because the characters treat each other badly, or because Korra's unprompted kiss is technically sexual assault. I think both of those reasons are fucking dumb, because the characters are mean to each other for the purpose of them learning a lesson and thereby growing closer, and the latter is technically true, but it's obviously a trope and I doubt they meant anything by it. Like, come on, the unprompted kiss is one of the most common tropes in cinema, and in a real scenario, this would obviously not go over well, but it's a fucking TV show. Let's calm the fuck down. The reason I don't like it is because it's just too fucking melodramatic. All this dumb relationship drama is brought to the forefront as the primary conflict of the episode, made out to be this huge deal with all kinds of emotional weight, and when you really look at it, it is the pettiest bullshit ever. I don't like the love triangle, it bonks the season down, and while I see its importance, there are definitely more clever ways to implement it than teenage melodrama. I think another huge problem with Book 1 is that the crux of the equalist movement is kind of based on a lie. Well, I'm exaggerating a bit, but what I mean is that despite being told that non-bender oppression is a huge issue within the city, it's never shown very directly. The only time any type of discrimination against non-benders is ever directly shown is when Tarlok tries to arrest all of these innocent civilians just for being non-benders, which only happened after Amon had committed a major act of terrorism. There is nothing that is directly shown to the audience before that point that indicated that this was a deep societal issue. Keyword there is directly, because there are some indirect ways in which this is shown, but they're way too subtle to really be considered set up in any way. There are a few examples that I often point to personally. One is that Mako and other firebenders are shown redirecting lightning at a power plant for work, which is something that only firebenders can do, which leaves non-benders, and technically benders of other elements, with less job opportunities than benders, which is a form of economic inequality. There's also pro-bending, which is very similar but on a much larger scale. It's a sport that only benders can participate in, so non-benders will never be able to be part of it by virtue of how they were born. There are also the triple threat triads and other bending-centric gangs that are shown to use their bending to intimidate and harass people. However, no instance of this is shown to happen to explicitly non-benders. Nowhere is it stated or implied that these shopkeepers aren't benders or that these gangs only seek out non-benders to harass, though it could definitely be inferred. The point is that there are plenty of examples of non-benders having it worse in the city and being opposed by benders, but it's never shown in any direct way to justify it being treated as a larger issue. It's there, but narratively it needed to be way more prominent. Like I've mentioned a few times, and will definitely mention again, this seems like it's more of a I almost said skill issue. This seems like it's more of a time issue, since there is only so much time to tell these stories and get all these characters introduced and up to speed that it's hard to fit everything in. But when something that you couldn't fit in was something so integral to the main narrative and to the main conflict, you fucking lose me. I analyzed the fuck out of this universe for fun, so of course I get it, but your average viewer probably isn't gonna pick up on all of this. I'm not saying they needed to be all in your face about it, subtext is obviously very important, but if they were just a bit more broad with it, things could have turned out much smoother. I think what's even worse than that though is that after Amon is outed as a fraud, the equalists just kind of stop and are never heard from again. I know that's a pretty common criticism of the show, but it holds pretty true, especially considering Book 1 makes a huge effort to explore the culture of Republic City and how it can change long term. This thing that has supposedly been a long-lasting problem in the city is just swept under the rug as if it never mattered. This isn't necessarily the fault of Book 1 though, because they do end things rather ambiguously, but Book 2 and onward had the opportunity to address it in some way, but just straight up didn't. And since we're tangentially on this subject again, now's a good time as any to talk about Amon, because as cool as he is, nothing about this guy makes any fucking sense. I touched on his motivations earlier in the character section, and while I was able to piece them together and form an interpretation, I'm also not the average viewer. I've seen this show multiple times and I dig into it for fun, so I have a better understanding than your average viewer would, and the fact that this even needs to happen is kinda cringe. Amon's motivations are super fucking contrived. He wants to rid the world of benders because of his terrible childhood. Okay, great, cool, I could buy that. Except his declaration of these intentions in the flashback is directly contradicted when he uses his bending on his own father, which indicates that he was just kind of fucking crazy to begin with.
What are you gonna do about it? You're the weak one.
Either he was shaped by his environment or he was always crazy. Pick one. Plus, the super bloodbending, or whatever the fuck it's called, makes absolutely no sense. While it's definitely something that makes Amon more intimidating and therefore a more effective villain, the fact that there is no lore explanation for this at all is baffling to me. Yakone, who had the same ability, had it brushed off by Sokka just saying, he's just built different, and it's just kind of left at that. I mean, I've always personally headcanoned it as being some kind of mutation, since Yakone does pass it on to his kids, and I like that it does take training to learn how to do it, but the fact that I even have to make this headcanon at all is indicative of it not really being that good. And another thing, how does Amon having this psychic bloodbending technique allow him to remove people's bending? I've always rationalized it as being some sort of advanced chi blocking enhanced by bloodbending, which is a cool idea because it combines two of these scariest techniques in the whole series, but again, this is just headcanon and a glorified fan theory. There is no basis for this being the case in the show itself, and the characters don't ever question it. And don't get it twisted, I love the idea, I think it's deviously cool, but something this crazy just kind of requires an explanation that we just didn't get. Remember earlier how I said I was going to criticize Book 1's ending? Well, here's the part where I do that. That wasn't funny. I should make that funnier. Put a meme here. I don't know. While I do love the vibes, it's not good. When you have a character like Korra, where losing something dear to her is such a major blow to her very being and is woven directly into her character arc, it completely defeats the purpose of said character arc to have the thing that she lost restored to her with no lasting consequences. While you can rationalize it given the context of Book 2, it still just isn't handled well, and it makes sense why so many cite this scene to display how Korra had things handed to her. In this case, they are not wrong to say that, because the entire purpose of Korra's arc throughout Book 1 is for her to eventually come to the conclusion that her views on bending were misguided with what what they should be. And because that's a part of her that she holds so dear, she needs to lose it to Amon in order to take that concept to its natural conclusion. Who is Korra without her bending? This should have been a moment that allowed Korra to find out who she is beyond her powers, but is instead treated like a return to the status quo and an easy explanation for how Amon's damage could be fixed. It really does demean a decent amount of the character growth she goes through, and it just really isn't that great. That being said, I actually don't mind the idea of Aang restoring Korra's bending, and I think it could have been handled better if there was just one major tweak. We should have seen more of Korra without her bending. Some fans take this to the extreme, with many believing that Book 2 and onward should have focused entirely on Korra regaining her bending through different means that reteach her their value and give her a new appreciation of them. I don't think they needed to go that far, but I think just 1 or 2 episodes focused on Korra dealing with the aftermath would have made the Aang reveal a lot more palatable. If they had actually had the time to allow Korra to learn to not take her bending for granted and to further her connections with her past lives, which the whole season had been building towards, then Aang appearing and restoring her bending would actually have a lot more meaning, and it would serve as a reward for learning this lesson. In fairness, a lot of this ending and honestly a lot of the weird problems with this season can be easily attributed to the show's weird production cycle. It's commonly known that Korra was originally only meant to be 1 season, so of course they had to end it on a high note where the Avatar is the Avatar again. With only 12 episodes to tell this story and get to this point, it's clear that some things were prioritized over others, and you can definitely tell. You can just tell that if they had more episodes to work with, the series would have flowed a lot better, and I think this would have solved most of its issues, not only for Book 1, but honestly the whole show. The lower episode count compared to Avatar meant that Varrick needed to change up their approach to this. They couldn't do this the same way as Avatar, but its DNA is still there. And what I mean by this is that in Korra, they tried to balance the more fun, character-focused stuff with the overarching plot, but because they had so few episodes to work with, stuff had to be condensed or cut. To show pro-bending or Korra's love life, which love him or hate him are somewhat important, they needed to cut some of the stuff that could be overlooked or implied, like the Equalist having no lingering effects or the aforementioned Avatar state scene. And I'm not saying the latter things aren't important, and I'm sure Varrick would have loved to include them, but the narrative still works without focusing on them. Just by having an extra 1 or 2 episodes to fit this stuff would have done wonders. That being said, there is really no excuse for the abruptness of the ending, since if you know you're going into it with 12 episodes to work with, an experienced writer would be able to work around that fact. Unless there were more production issues that we just don't know about, there is really no reason to have skipped something this so pivotal to Korra's arc like this. And to reiterate, I still like this scene for the vibes, but it's indicative of the larger writing problems with the series, and it's hard to look past it when you know how this shit works. Overall, Book 1 is super flawed, but still pretty good. There's a lot of glaring issues here, mostly to do with the pacing and how some plotlines get prioritized over arguably more important plotlines, as well as some of the characters just being a bit rough around the edges. It's the first season, so I expect there to be some growing pains, and while I do like this season a lot, it's hard to look past some of these issues because many of them are very hard to ignore. That being said, this season has some of the biggest shoes to fill given the circumstances of its creation, and I think it served as a pretty solid groundwork for the rest of the series to bounce off of. It raises a lot of really interesting questions, introduces a lot of cool ideas, and the main story itself is pretty great. While it is a bit sloppily written, like I mentioned, the characters are definitely its strongest aspect, and this season does the most important thing a season of TV can possibly do, which is evoking emotion from the viewer. I just can't watch this show and not feel Avatar vibes, if you know what I mean, and I think that matters way more than any writing flaw ever could. Alright, Book 2, more like cuckballs. Okay, so here's the one everybody's got a problem with. Book 2, Spirits. This is largely considered to be the weakest season of Korra, and for a lot of very valid reasons that we will certainly be getting into. It's actually become somewhat of a running joke in the Korra community that fans will just say, because Book 2, or just people refusing to engage with it or mentioning it in discussion because it just has a reputation for being bad. I say, fuck that, because that shit is kind of reductive. I will die on the hill that Book 2 is not bad, but rather it is severely misunderstood.
Casey Anthony was just misunderstood.
This season is a lot smarter than people give it credit for, so the fact that the fandom actively tries to ignore it sometimes is kinda wild to me. And don't get me wrong, I will totally be criticizing it to no end in this segment. I have plenty of problems with it, and I would never give you guys this cliche like, oh guys, it's not that bad defense of it, but I think it does a lot more right than people think it does. You know what I mean? Obviously, I'll get into the specifics as we go, but the crux of it is that thematically and conceptually, the season is really fucking good. It even has some great plot lines that prompt interesting dilemmas, but the overall writing and presentation is very messy in a way where the viewer is either overstimulated or understimulated at any given time. You'll see what I mean, so let's get into this mess. Before getting into the writing though, right off the bat, Book 2 fixes one of my personal biggest gripes with Book 1, the color palette. Like I mentioned, Book 1 is very gray and desaturated, but Book 2 changes the game by making everything more vibrant. It's just more fun to look at now, what else can I say, really? That being said, the animation is a bit hit or miss, at least in the beginning of the season. There are times where it's very clear that Studio Mir did not work on an episode, with a few episodes this season actually being animated by Studio Pierrot, known for Naruto and Bleach. Their work on Korra is definitely a lot more late Shippuden rather than it is Thousand Year Blood War, which is to say that it doesn't look bad, but you can tell where they cut corners and when things don't quite look right. You can tell that a lot of the budget went into beginnings, and you can tell when they tried to save time and money by their overuse of wide shots in order to minimize movement. There are a ton of shots that are framed like a fucking sitcom, where it's like a side angle shot of two characters talking, and occasionally they'll do like a shot reverse shot. Sometimes it does work, like in this scene where Mako is talking to the detectives about evidence. The joke of him walking into Biefong's office and getting yelled at and then awkwardly walking out is way funnier when we don't actually see that interaction. However, there are other times where this doesn't work, like in this scene of Asami and Mako in his apartment. Not only is the background really bland, but the fact that the scene is just them talking could call for some more intimate shots, which this season is actually known to do from time to time, but they just picked really weird times to do it. It's just like them standing and then shot reverse shot. It's fucking boring. That being said though, when Studio Mir is in full force, they go fucking hard, dude. They absolutely nail all the wacky Spirit World shenanigans in this, with locations morphing on a dime and shit turning into other shit, and there are just some beautiful shots in this thing. For the most part, it is a vast improvement visually, and the animation gets progressively better as the series goes on. As for the story of Book 2, I love that it takes us out of Republic City and starts to show off other parts of the world and how they have changed since the original show, this time with a specific focus on the water tribes. I like the city, but there's only so much that can be done with it, so it's refreshing to see something new. Anyways, the story is split into several concurrent plot lines that all start as one. The crew heads to the South Pole for the Glacier Spirits Festival, where Korra reunites with her uncle Unalaq, who happens to be the chief of the Northern Water Tribe, which causes some tension between pretty much everybody in Korra's life. Meanwhile, Asami and Bolin meet up with Varrick to make some business deals. These two things initially seem completely unrelated, but end up becoming deeply intertwined in a way that you wouldn't quite expect. The season begins with a focus on the civil war between the two water tribes, which ends up being the powder keg for much of what's to come. Everything that happens in this season stems from the war in some way, and while things do diverge pretty drastically, the war's presence is always felt, especially during the build-up toward the final battle with Unalaq. A lot of the season is honestly just build-up, which while it does make things unbearably slow, it also serves to the benefit of the mystery itself. A more generous interpretation would be that the season is a slow burn, though I don't know how much of that was intentional. But here's the important thing about the Civil War plot that a lot of fans don't seem to understand. It is not nuanced, and that's on purpose. A lot of the praise and the criticism of this arc comes from fans who think that it's nuanced or that it's supposed to be, but it just straight up isn't. It's made super clear that the Southern Water Tribe is the victim and the Northern Water Tribe is the aggressor, and there is very little wiggle room to argue the contrary. For whatever reason, there is this very popular sentiment that when there is any kind of war plot line, not just in Avatar but in general, that the writers are somehow obligated to show how both sides have a point or some shit like that, when that doesn't always need to be the case. The war itself is very cut and dry here, but the reason for this has to do with Korra. It's with her character that the nuance comes into play, not the war itself. It puts her in a really interesting position that they never really could have put Aang in. The Avatar is meant to remain neutral in all world conflicts so as to preserve the balance, but this is easier said than done. Korra is personally involved as she is from the South and doesn't want to see her culture destroyed. Wait, that sounded really racist now that I think about it.
The South shall rise again.
Korra inherently cannot be neutral in this conflict when she is directly connected to one particular side. This becomes a question of what does she prioritize? Does she prioritize being the Avatar or a Southern Water Tribe citizen? Does the Avatar really need to remain neutral when one side of a conflict is clearly in the wrong? She's torn between her family and her job, and is a genuinely interesting conundrum. The reason that I didn't bring this up earlier is because the writers barely play with the idea, and they have Korra make a decision pretty quickly. This was some of the only nuance this plotline had, and it was basically dropped by having Korra make a decision too early. It's a bit ironic that the very slow-paced season just speeds through what could have been a really interesting story. That being said, her decision to support the South and oppose Unalaq brings her back to Republic City, leading into what I like to call the conspiracy arc. While this does shift the focus away from the war, I personally don't really mind it, since the war itself was never really meant to be the focus. Like we've established, the Civil War is more of a catalyst than an event to be focused on, since again, it's not really very interesting on its own. The transition from this into a tangentially related storyline didn't really sit right with a lot of fans, but I think it fits really well, even if the transition was a little bit rough. We've already taken this whole North versus South thing to its natural conclusion, so to linger on it for the whole season would just feel redundant. The conspiracy arc is a direct result of the war, and the events of it affect it further, so it offers a completely different perspective on it that we've never really seen before. Obviously, we've seen stuff like wartime propaganda and stuff of that nature in Avatar before, but never never to the degree in which it's displayed here. There is a literal fucking terrorist attack where one side was framed in order to justify further conflict. Zero irony, genuine question, what the actual fuck did Varrick mean by this? One of the most common criticisms of Book 2 is that the plot changes so drastically, and while I somewhat agree, in fairness, the conspiracy plotline is carried through almost until the very end of the season. Again, I think this storyline is criminally underrated because it's actually super interesting and it's super fun to see all the mysteries unfold. Who bombed the Southern Cultural Center? Who stole Asami's shit? All of these questions and more are raised and answered in a really cool detective story centering mostly on Mako, and they managed to tie that into Bolin's goofy joke plotline. This idea that the war was just forgotten about halfway through makes no sense to me because it is the driving force of the entire season and is almost completely resolved before the final few episodes. The last couple of episodes are entirely dedicated to Unalaq and Vaatu stuff, but it doesn't overshadow the war plotline because it was already concluded when Varrick was arrested and Tonraq was defeated. So now we can focus entirely on Spirit World bullshit. Plus, the war itself only ended because of Korra beating Unalaq, meaning these two plotlines were still heavily related, and it works specifically for that reason. While the Spirit World stuff does start to feel a little bit disconnected from the more grounded plot introduced in the first few episodes, this idea that it comes out of nowhere, again, makes no sense to me. Like, the Spirit stuff was introduced from the season premiere. It was always there, but it was treated more as a side issue than it should have been, considering the direction it would later take. I really don't know how people can be surprised that the plot would revolve around spirits when that was always a thing in the season. This is the first and only time in the entire franchise when there's been a scene pre-title card, and the point of it was to emphasize, hey, spirits are a big deal in this one. It's called Book 2 Spirits, not Book 2 Civil War Conspiracy. Each plotline is connected in some way, and the overall narrative of the season is way more coherent than critics make it out to be. I've been known to claim 2 to be very underrated in a lot of ways, like we've been discussing thus far, but I'm not blind to the fact that there have been a lot of missteps along the way that are very hard to ignore. Again, I don't think these things ruin the season or anything, because there's a lot to appreciate about it, but this is the weakest season of Korra for a reason. If you ask me though, a lot of these issues aren't necessarily the writing itself, but rather there's some stuff they do on a more macro scale that really makes the little things seem a lot worse than they really are, if that makes any sense. It probably didn't, but you'll see what I mean. Now, if you thought the pacing was bad in Book 1, you've got another thing coming for Book 2. And 3 and 4, but we'll get to that. But holy fuck, this season is slow and not in a good way. You know, when I said they needed more episodes per season, I didn't mean stop every plotline dead in its tracks for 2 flashback episodes in the middle of the season and then shift the focus almost completely. I'm obviously exaggerating a bit, but that's basically what happens. Granted, there are more connecting threads than people give it credit for. I usually try to watch this season in one sitting if I can, and it honestly feels way slower that way, which is weird because you'd expect the opposite to be the case, if you know what I mean. You know, you'd expect things to feel slow in a week-to-week schedule like on its original airing, but binging this season feels a lot slower than that because it's just not really paced for it. And that's kind of just it. I can't tell how the fuck they were trying to pace this thing. It's either moving at a snail's pace like the first half, or it's going balls to the wall like the second half, and neither of them feel very satisfying. It takes too long getting into it, and once you do get into it, the plot derails into something different. Another glaring issue with this season is that the stakes are simply way too fucking high. I think many fans would likely agree that in terms of the big threats of the series, it would have made a lot more sense for Vaatu to be the final villain rather than the second of 4. Well, this is a criticism that only really makes sense in hindsight. As someone who has revisited the show numerous times, it's hard to ignore how wacky this is. Harmonic convergence, Rava and Vaatu, the Dark Avatar, these are all things that affect 2 entire worlds and the nature of the Avatar as a concept. This is prime final villain material because who is a better match for the Avatar than their literal evil counterpart? If you wanted to look at it this way, right? Amon is pretty small stakes, threatening only a city. Zaheer threatens an entire nation, and Kuvira threatens the entire world. Then you've got fucking Vaatu over here threatening broad concepts and other realms.
How many realms are there in this game? Have any of you gotten an idea?
There's over 7 realms.
What?
What?
You know, there was almost a linear progression here, so Vaatu and Unalaq just kind of feel out of place. That being said though, this only makes sense when you view Book 2 as the middle of Korra's larger story. I mean, it is in a literal sense, as obviously there is more story to tell, but it could be argued that the events of Harmonic Convergence are the events that define Korra's career as the Avatar, you know, the things she's going to be remembered for. Much like how Aang was remembered for ending the 100-Year War, Korra will be remembered for how she reunified the physical and spirit worlds and all the effect that those things had. By this metric, the events of Book 3 and 4 are more of an epilogue to this, much like how the Avatar comics are an epilogue to the main show. Korra has peaked in her achievements, so now the remainder of the series can be viewed as how she deals with the consequences. Her greatest achievement was reuniting the 2 worlds and restoring Rava and Vaatu to a state of true balance. And it's safe to say that that's had much more of an effect on the world than stopping a couple of political extremists. But this brings me to another thing. Giant spirit monsters. What the fuck? Okay, admittedly, this is really cool in the dumbest way possible. Big blue lady shoot laser beam at big red guy. Neuron activation. Oh, I can look past a lot of this because of the cool factor, but believe me, the flaws are definitely still there. I personally don't subscribe to the criticism that it's fan-fiction-y because that's a pretty vapid way of putting it, but I do see why people would say this because it doesn't really feel like it belongs in the world of Avatar. There's a lot of crazy, wacky shit in the Avatar universe, right? There's nonsensical hybrid animals, spirits that can shapeshift and other crazy shit. There's fucking eldritch beings that give people power, and the literal concept of the world is people moving shit with their minds. The bar for craziness was set pretty high long ago, so why does this feel so out of place? I mean, when you think about it, Aang won his final battle in a similar display of red light beam versus blue light beam, and it's been shown that spirits can use some sort of spirit blast, so why does Korra astral projecting her spirit and growing 20 stories to fight a corrupted evil Avatar spirit feel wrong? Honestly, I don't think it's the concept, because the lore and the logic of it all is all there, for better or for worse. The problem is honestly the setup. The way that Korra is able to unleash her spirit like this is that she sat in the Tree of Time during harmonic convergence. I can accept that harmonic convergence can make all kinds of wacky spirit shit happen since it's been built up all season. No problem there, but they should have just stuck with that. The Tree of Time thing is brought up at the last possible minute during Tenzin's pep talk, and I don't think this tree even really had a name before then. It comes out of nowhere to explain something that didn't really need an explanation, even though the obvious explanation was there the whole time. It just felt like a cop-out, honestly. I think a better way to have handled it is that perhaps instead of Tenzin explaining the Tree of Time thing that he has no reason to know about, he instead talks about something he does know about, which is airbending. Astral projection is an advanced airbending technique that only a select few can truly use, so perhaps Tenzin tells this to Korra in the hopes that she can use it in some way. She does, and the fact that it's during harmonic convergence means that it's more powerful, hence why she gets big and there's spirit beams and shit. It would also fit right in with Korra's airbending training, since it's joked about in the premiere that she hasn't quite mastered it yet, so to use such an advanced technique would solidify her as a master, alongside the spiritual side of things. This would also give context as to what the fuck Jinora is doing, since it's not really explained what she does during this fight, and it's established earlier in the season that she has a connection with the spirits. Such a small tweak would have made this whole spirit kaiju thing way more palatable to the average viewer, in my opinion. Moving on, I mentioned it earlier, and here's the part where I rip into it, Korra losing her connections to her past lives. I can totally understand why this was done from a thematic standpoint. It teaches Korra a valuable lesson about learning from the past, and it plays into one of the series' core concepts, which is the cyclical nature of the universe, where the Avatar cycle is cyclic in more ways than just one, with Korra being the end of one cycle and the start of a new one. It forces Korra to solve many of her internal problems on her own so she can come out of it all stronger. I get all that shit, and I see why they wrote it this way. Still don't fucking like it though. From a pure fan service perspective, not having the past avatars is a massive blow to the series. Just imagine all of the great interactions we could have seen during a past life wisdom session. You know, Kurek helping Korra with the chill vibes, Kyoshi encouraging her to be gay and do crime, and just think of all of the thematic meta bullshit they could have done with frequent Korra and Aang conversations. This probably has to do with me being an absolute Aang stan, but do you know how cool it would have been to see Korra look to Aang for advice at various points in the series? Like, I get why that's not 100% necessary when you have characters like Tenzin and Zuko to fill that role, but like, come the fuck on, dude. It's fucking cool. One of the underlying themes of Book 1 was that Korra was living in Aang's shadow both in-universe and in a meta context with the audience. The idea was clearly that Korra does not need to live up to Aang, and having the two be able to talk that shit out a little bit would have been no doubt pivotal in paying off that idea. Book 2 seemingly dropped this completely, and now the future of the Avatar series will never be the same. And while this is a bit off topic, Break kinda shot themselves in the foot with this choice. Now, with this upcoming new series about the Avatar after Korra, they have two options, neither of which are too desirable. Option 1 is that they stick to their original choice and keep the past lives disconnected, leaving this new Avatar to only have Korra to look to. This could be interesting if they play their cards right, but as much as I love Korra as a character, having just her is way less cool. Option 2 is that they could bring back the connections to the past Avatars somehow, which would be great for fan service, but now it kinda makes the events of harmonic convergence null and void. It would come across as the writers backtracking on their original choice, which implies that they don't have enough integrity to stick to it. I don't think that they were really thinking that there would be another series after this, so I could understand why they would do it in the first place, but now that the franchise is expanding, they have a pretty big choice to make, and it's kinda damned if they do, damned if they don't. And honestly, that is the meta takeaway from Book 2 as a whole. There are a lot of writing decisions throughout it that are perceived as bad, but without them, a lot of the good stuff would not work as well as it does. So they're kinda damned if they do, damned if they don't, you know what I mean? You know, the Civil War plotline was pretty hit or miss for some people, but the story of the latter half wouldn't work as well without it. The loss of the past avatars sucks fat donkey dick, but it greatly enhances Korra's character development. While I personally don't think the narrative itself is all that bad, its biggest issues are more so with pacing, tone, and focus, the fact that there is still discussion about it is definitely indicative of something. I don't know what that something is, but it is something. I appreciate Book 2 not despite its flaws or in spite of its flaws, but because of its flaws. The fact that it is so messy is what makes it so entertaining whether you're aiming to critique it or not. Again, I think this season is a lot smarter and a lot better than most people give it credit for, but even if you hate it, understandably, it's hard to deny that when it does something right, it can be some of the best stuff in all of Avatar. You might even say it's a light in the dark.
What we do here is go back.
As I'm sure many of you already know though, smack dab in the middle of Book 2 is a two-part flashback episode titled Beginnings, which details the story of Wan and how he became the first Avatar. Much like the series itself, these episodes are incredibly divisive among fans and critics alike, and in some ways it's very understandable why. This two-parter is so dense though that I just had to give it its own section. There are a lot of little things and one big thing about these episodes that are ripe for criticism, which I'll definitely be laying out here, but at the same time, I love these fucking episodes. So let's explore why. If that was not the worst transition you've ever seen, you dumb bitch. So, to avoid recapping the entire plot, the basics of it are that 10,000 years ago, humans lived on the backs of lion turtles to keep them safe from the spirits who inhabited the rest of the world. The lion turtles can give people the power of the elements as protection, something that our boy Wan abuses in some Robin Hood-ass shenanigans, getting him banished from the city. He's allowed to keep his fire as protection, and over the years grows to respect and befriend the spirits, all while mastering his fire. Eventually, he travels the world, runs into two godlike spirits named Rava and Vatu, and accidentally unleashes Vatu.
He's the evil one in case you couldn't tell.
In order to stop him from plunging the world into eternal darkness, Rava and Wan team up, and over time they obtain the powers of all four elements. They go to the spirit world to fight Vatu and end up permanently fusing with each other during harmonic convergence and becoming the first Avatar. Have I lost you yet? So in terms of plot and characters, I actually really like this story. Wan starts off as a good-hearted troublemaker, like I said, kind of a Robin Hood type beat, but his overall character flaw is that he's incredibly reckless. I like this because it mirrors Korra in a really interesting way. They both want to do good in the world, but they do so through some otherwise not so good ways. In Wan's case, this is trickery, and in Korra's case, this is angry outbursts. The only reason that Rava and Vatu were separated to begin with was because Wan wanted to help, but didn't think through the consequences of doing so. Granted, he did lack context, which is, again, quite reminiscent of Korra. His arc is rather simple, though. He starts off as a mischievous and immature kid, and grows up to be a mature adult with a greater and wiser understanding of the world and the people in it. It's literally a rags to riches story, except the riches are godlike powers. From a fan service perspective, it's actually really great to see him come to these zen conclusions that have become staples of the Avatar's worldview. Plus, he's voiced by Steven Yeun, and I'm a big Walking Dead fan, so I love to hear a familiar voice. You know what I'm talking about?
I'm not gay. You are. You are gay.
Of course, this episode is very lore-heavy. You could almost consider it a lore dump in some ways because it drops a lot of shit on you that could honestly be hard to keep track of. Personally, I love the new lore because while it does retcon and change some stuff that we thought we knew, it does so very tastefully, and in a way where our previous knowledge is recontextualized but not contradicted. For starters, there's the true origins of bending. It's revealed in these episodes that humans received the power of the elements from the lion turtles when they parted ways, and it's implied that over time, people learn to use these powers more effectively. You may think this actually contradicts what we were told in Avatar about the original Benders, and on a surface level, it certainly does seem that way. In Avatar, we learn that the original Benders were the Sky Bison, Badger Moles, Dragons, and the Moon, with a heavy emphasis on the people of each nation learning their element from them. This seems to be contradicted by Beginnings, showing that people obtain these powers from the lion turtles and not the animals. But when you really look at it, these two explanations actually work together perfectly. Bending is not just a power, it is a martial art. We see Wan mimicking the movements of a dragon to perfect his fire, thereby creating the martial art of what we now know as firebending. The simplest interpretation of this is that people got the power from the lion turtles, but to turn it into a martial art and become true benders, they learned to move from the animals. This also works perfectly with things like the tale of Oma and Shu, the first earthbenders. You know, the powers were already there, and they learned from the Badger Moles to use their abilities properly. It recontextualizes what we already knew, but it doesn't take away from it, which I really appreciate. However, I like what this does even more in a somewhat meta context. And what I mean by this is that it adds a level of mystery to the Avatar world despite also giving us real answers. For example, in Avatar we learn how the first earthbenders came to be and created the city of Omashu. With the new lore that Korra adds, this story still works, but it also begs the question of if it even happened at all. The fact that the answer is still up in the air is great from a world-building perspective because now we have a mystery. Is this real, or is it just a myth? Every culture has some kind of creation myth and legends that explain why things are the way that they are. It's possible that Oma and Shu never actually existed. They were just characters used in a story to explain where earthbending came from and to explain these weird shifting caves, likely from people long after Wan's time who hadn't witnessed this firsthand. Or Alternatively, it could be real and these actually were the first people to learn from the badger moles after leaving the lion turtles. Either interpretation works within the constraints of the lore, making it a rather interesting change. Like I said, the fact that they were able to recontextualize what we already knew about this shit without contradicting it is pretty great, and I appreciated the concept. That being said though, there are also some retcons and lore additions that aren't so welcome, and one shows itself in this episode, the dynamic carpet duo themselves, Rava and Vaatu. While you can certainly see what the writers were going for here, a lot of fans find the addition of these two to be a complete departure from everything the original series stood for, and unlike a lot of other criticisms of the show, this one actually has a reason to claim that. The philosophy of the Avatar universe is based around duality and the balance between two or more opposing forces. Yin and yang, push and pull, moon and ocean, even the four elements, you know the vibes. Many fans felt that the addition of Rava and Vaatu ruins this motif. On a surface level, these two seem to fit right at home with this motif. They are two equal and opposite forces that need each other to exist, with visual cues indicating that they are meant to be a direct reflection of each other, much like the yin and the yang. Rava is the spirit of light and order, while Vaatu is the spirit of darkness and chaos, and the two keep each other in check for thousands of years. If one were ever to destroy the other, the loser would simply regrow inside of the winner, meaning that they quite literally cannot destroy each other and exist inside one another and are in balance. When you start to look deeper into this though, the cracks begin to show a bit. For example, when Wan first separates the two, Vaatu gets stronger and Rava gets weaker, which seems to make no sense considering they are meant to be equal in both power and influence. While you could rationalize this with some explanation of like, there was more darkness in the world at the time, so it caused him to grow proportionally stronger, you know, shit like I used to do, it could make sense, but since there is no canon explanation, it basically just amounts to a fan theory. If these two together are supposed to represent the idea of balance, the act of Vaatu being sealed away while Rava gets to spread her message as the Avatar seems to go directly against that, since for 10,000 years they were not equal, with one clearly having more influence over the other. When the two are separated, they must fight during harmonic convergence every 10,000 years, with the winner getting to reign until the next harmonic convergence. And considering Rava has been out and about for the current cycle, it would only make sense that in the name of balance that Vaatu also gets his 10,000 year reign. Like some my turn on the Xbox type shit. It is my turn to spread eternal darkness. While there are a lot of inconsistencies involving these two, I think there's also a lot of misreading of it. For example, yes, the Avatar has a duty to maintain balance in the world, but nowhere in that motto does it say, hey, let's let this evil guy get a 10,000 year reign of terror just to balance it out. And to pin things that way is massively disingenuous if you ask me. Balance does not mean allowing injustice to happen just because you need it to balance out the good stuff. It means that when bad things inevitably do happen, we correct them. While yes, the cycle of life, death, and rebirth is important in many philosophies and in Avatar, that doesn't have anything to do with balance in this context. When people talk about this kind of thing, they're talking about how when one person dies, another is born, out with the old, in with the new type shit. It's not completely destroy the planet and start over arbitrarily. It's portrayed as a bad thing that the entire destruction of the planet might happen, and that's because it is a bad thing. The destruction of all that we know is just as bad as keeping the status quo, and since there needs to be balance, neither extreme can happen. And this leads me into the crux of much of the criticism revolving around these two, that one being portrayed as objectively good and the other objectively evil removes the gray area that the original show was known for, and in some interpretations draws more parallels to Western Christianity than it does the Eastern philosophies the show is based on. And you know, I can totally get why people say this, because Vaatu is portrayed as a force of evil which nothing good can come from, while Rava is the spirit of the almighty Avatar, and while it's definitely a writing flaw that they didn't quite get across that sense of nuance to everybody, the core concept isn't entirely lost because of that. Now, I don't want this to turn into a defending Korra thing again, but this is a way oversimplified view of things that also kind of misses the point. Yes, spirits were never and still are not inherently good or evil, but Rava and Vaatu do not represent good and evil. They represent order and chaos. This whole they're basically like God and Satan thing that goes around with these two is the most uninformed interpretation one could possibly have, because it misunderstands fundamental things about not only the show, but also the thing you're comparing it to, since that's not even how God and Satan work.
God. Homeschool.
I'll get off my soapbox on that front, but regardless, I think that these two are still more coherently designed than they are made out to be. Vaatu embodies chaos, which is a state of constant change, while Rava embodies order, which is the absence of change. Like I hinted at earlier, neither of those things on their own is a good thing, so the two of them need to be together to be in balance. There needs to be just the right amount of change so that the world does not stagnate, but there also needs to be enough order so that the world doesn't go crazy. When Rava and Vaatu were still tethered in their eternal battle, the world was in balance since neither could overpower the other, but now that they are all apart, that balance still needs to be maintained. Vaatu knows this, but didn't care and wanted to spread chaos. He's not evil because he wishes to cause chaos, but because his creation of chaos would lead to callous death and destruction to an unnecessary degree. Rava obviously respected this balance more so than she did spreading her own message, which is what leads her to team up with Wan. Instead of doing as Vaatu did and going off to keep the world in a state of stagnation, she instead decided to maintain the balance and do both of their jobs on her own, thereby creating the Avatar. By constantly fighting off Vaatu, even when when they are separated, she is literally fighting for the very balance that would have been if they were together, if that makes sense. She is a force of good not because that's what she represents, but because her actions go against that arbitrary representation and are noble of her own choice. We do have to remember that spirits are just as sentient as humans and can therefore make mistakes and have lapses in judgment or just straight up make bad choices regardless of if that's the thing that they arbitrarily represent. Rava and Vaatu are good and evil not in what they symbolize, but in the choices that they make to become better or worse individuals. Symbolically, they are in balance, but I think the misreading of objectively good and evil comes from the characters themselves having different views of what balance even means. People are conflating the choices they make with what they represent, and those two things aren't necessarily the same. Vaatu doesn't care about balance and only cares about chaos, hence why he is viewed as evil, but Rava values balance more than she does order, hence why she is viewed as good. Even if they aren't in balance though, it doesn't really matter at the end of the day. Korra's actions restored this balance, as now with Vaatu destroyed, he is now regrowing inside of Rava, which will eventually revert the two back to the state that Wan found them in when they were in perfect balance. If this whole thing was unbalanced, Korra restored the balance. Plus, I think by the end of Season 2, Korra seems to understand on some level why Vaatu was necessary. I mean, yeah, he was vengeful and wanted to plunge the world into chaos, but he also represented change, and that was something that the world needed, which is part of what prompts her to leave the portals open. She realized that Wan was wrong to close the portals. He was wrong to separate the two worlds just to keep Vaatu at bay instead of just addressing the problem. She kept the portals open because the world needed a little change, and with Vaatu now inside her too, I'd say that she's now playing both sides, and that is true balance. If any of you comment the words blue and orange morality, I will punch you in the throat. Looking past all that complicated bullshit though, I love this episode because of the fucking vibes, dude. Oh, the fucking vibes. Oh, inject the vibes right into my pussy. Bro, the art style? Fucking amazing, dude. It looks like a painting with its shading, and I love the way the elements are stylized. I mean, I just bitched about Rava and Vaatu a bunch, but they're cool as fuck as a concept, regardless of if they make sense or not. Seeing the origins of all these things we've known about for so long, like the dancing dragon and the lion turtles, is so fan-servicey in the best way possible. And dude, when the shit hits, it fucking hits. Wan activates the iconic Avatar State Ball that Aang did that one time, and bro just stops all conflict for like 30 seconds. When he fuses with Rava and drops that line,
I'm not a regular human anymore.
I lose my absolute shit, dude. As a pure fan of Avatar, these episodes are just a fucking treat, and they are some of the best that Season 2 has to offer. Yes, I mean that. I'm not exaggerating. Fuck you, suck a dick, and die. But moving on, I don't think I'm breaking any new ground by saying that Book 3, Change, is probably the best written season of The Legend of Korra. Most fans tend to agree with this, and I am certainly one of them. This is the case for a few reasons, but what all of these reasons seem to have in common is that they take what worked in the past and remix it in such a way that it is new and fresh, while also improving on where they've slipped. I'm not going to improve on where I've slipped because I'm going to burp in the middle of a take and I'm going to use it.
I don't care.
One of the most notable improvements that this season makes is that it makes Korra's character growth a lot more tangible. While her development is clearly there in books 1 and 2, book 3 is where we really start to see how much she has actually changed. Unlike the transition from the first season to the second, where Korra is somewhat reset, the transition from 2 to 3 makes perfect sense and feels natural. It makes sense that Korra is a lot more understanding and willing to deal with problems in a more peaceful way, and her personality shifts accordingly. This actually applies in a broader sense as well, since the transition from book 1 to 2 was basically non-existent and didn't address much of what occurred in the first season. Book 3 fixed that by its events being a direct effect of the events of season 2. The story flows a lot more cohesively in this regard, and it also cements one of the biggest motifs of the season and the remainder of the series, which is consequences, though I will certainly go more in depth with that later. On the flip side though, the season also takes the stuff that didn't work before and either got rid of it or took it in a completely different direction. While I highly doubt this was due to any kind of fan outcry since the latter 3 seasons were all in production around the same time, it's worthy of noting how much the writers seemed to tidy up their act, so to speak. For example, people hated the love triangle melodrama in the first half, so for book 3 they decided to completely ignore any teenage relationship drama altogether. There are still some remnants left over, namely Korra and Asami's little exchange at the start of the season and Bolin's relationship with Opal, but it's never overdone to the point where it overtook the plot like it did before. The Korra and Asami conversation could be passed off as the writers poking a bit of fun at themselves, but it's also important for both of these characters, and it serves to transition us out of this whole love triangle thing. They make it a point early on that this just isn't going to be a thing anymore, and the storytelling is all the better for it. As for Bolin and Opal, there's literally a 2-second moment where they have any kind of turbulence, and it's resolved so quickly that you don't even notice it. Like I said earlier, these two are the most wholesome couple of all time. Couple goals. This could be us, but you playing. But enough romance bullshit, let's talk about the villains. Both Amon and Unalaq faced very harsh criticism for having very unclear motivations, and as a result, the crux of their respective movements felt very rushed. Book 3 fixes this immediately by having Zaheer literally spell out his plan multiple times, so there is no possible confusion about what his vibe is. While this seems very antithetical to the whole show don't tell philosophy, it also clears up any confusion about what this guy's goals are and how he plans to achieve them, which not only sets up stakes, but also displays a key aspect of Zaheer's character, that being his willingness to treat his enemies with respect and be upfront about himself, which also gives the audience a reason to be intrigued by the guy. Of course, we already talked about Zaheer and why he's such a great character, so I won't repeat myself here, but the rest of the Red Lotus are pretty badass as well. I love that each of them represent one of the 4 elements, so the 4 of them together are kind of like their own evil avatar in a way. I also love that they are all special benders in some way, with Ghazan being a lava bender, Pli being a combustion bender, Zaheer eventually gaining the ability to fly, and Minghua having no arms, which as we all know, not having limbs is the most special kind of bending. In having these unique abilities, some of which the audience has kind of been conditioned to see as evil bending, it sets these guys apart from the more basic threats that we've seen before. You know, we've seen an evil earthbender before, but have we ever seen one in action that can bend lava? The Dai Li ain't got shit on this guy. I also love the specialized prisons they have too. It's just a neat idea, nice world building detail. I love that shit. None of these characters get any major backstory, but enough can be inferred about them that makes them just interesting enough. Pli and Zaheer are together, and it begs the question of how that happened, and it's implied that Ghazan had a shitty childhood and might have a thing for Minghua. I love Ghazan's suicide at the end too, where he just refuses to go back to prison. It's just so fucking raw, dude. He's literally me, for real, for real. While they aren't nearly as fleshed out as Zaheer, there's just too much cool factor to them that personally, it's just kind of hard to dislike them. And speaking of characters, this is the only season where the crew really feels like a team. These 4 going off on their own journey makes them really feel like friends, which I think was the intention in the first 2 seasons, but they never really had enough time to breathe. Their dynamic was super rocky and inconsistent in Book 1, and the whole group is hardly together in Book 2, so I like that Book 3 finally has everybody on normal terms for once. There isn't really time to breathe here either because of how fast the story is paced, but they're able to work a lot of great character moments into some of the other important scenes. For example, I love the scene of Bolin and Asami playing Pai Sho during the stakeout because it displays their personalities perfectly and they bounce off of each other really well. Avatar was filled with moments like this, and this was honestly what Korra needed more of in general. And Season 3 absolutely nails this when they include it. Emphasis on the second half of that sentence because this season is a lot more plot driven than some of the others, and that's probably why we get some time to breathe with these characters. They aren't going through crazy emotional shit all the fucking time because of the story being so heavy, so they can really focus on these lighter kind of character moments. The story of Book 3 is great because it takes what worked about the first 2 seasons and combines that with something that made Book 2 of Avatar so compelling, which is a conspiracy. Much of Book 3's story focuses on some kind of mystery, with the search for answers always driving the story forward. The search for new airbenders leads the group to Ba Sing Se, where they find that the Earth Queen is doing some fuck shit, which then leads them to Zaofu. At Zaofu, the Red Lotus attack raises more questions, which then unravels into the crew hunting down Zaheer. Then you've got Zaheer's plan being enacted in such a way where the audience is never really sure what's gonna happen next. There's like 4 big plot twists in this one, and they never feel too out of left field. You know, there's always a level of groundedness to them, and the audience is given enough information to figure it out beforehand if they so choose, but it's never made too obvious. For example, the reveal of Ai Wei being the traitor makes perfect sense when you think about it, since as the truth seer, he's the only person who can tell a lie and get away with it, but because he is Sue's advisor, you wouldn't quite expect him right away. We meet the Earth Queen in the first half of the season, and she's made to be very unlikable, but because we know that Zaheer wants to take out world leaders, it puts the audience in an interesting position when he suck dusts her lungs. I want a bitch to suck dust me. I want to get fucking suck dusted. Suck the dust out of my dick. You know, I should feel great that the queen is dying, but I also feel bad that the bad guy is winning, you know what I mean? This was clearly done to show why some world leaders needed to go, but actually seeing it happen raises the stakes and kind of changes the game. The stakes are rather low in comparison to past seasons, but they feel much more grandiose because of how the writers set up and then pay off the big moments. The Earth Queen's murder doesn't work at all if we didn't get a taste of her grouchy personality earlier in the season. Jinora talks all season about getting her tattoos, and in the end, she gets them in one of the most beautiful scenes in the entire show. But the biggest setup and payoff throughout the entire season actually comes in with Zaheer. In his introductory scene, he talks about his admiration of an ancient airbending philosopher named Guru Lahima. He dick rides this guy the entire season, just straight up riding the schmeat, always managing to sneak him into a conversation somehow, and it begs the question of what's really so important about this guy. Then we get into the final battle, where this dude uses the Guru's teachings to immediately get over his girlfriend's brutal death in order to obtain the lost airbending power of flight. It turns out that Guru Lahima wasn't a legend after all, and that more of what Zaheer says about him is true than we once thought. There is setup for Korra thing, a mystery surrounding it, and the final reveal. This season is just great at setup and payoff, and while it seems kind of basic to explain it this way, it's a large part of what makes the season so compelling and rewarding to the viewer. Another thing that I don't see many people talk about that I think is a saving grace of the entire show, we actually fucking travel around the world again. Book 1 was focused entirely on Republic City, and while I see why they did that, it got a little bit boring after a while. Book 2 attempted to show off a little bit more of the world with the water tribes and some brief scenes at the air temples, and while that was pretty cool, we didn't really spend much time there. There's also the spirit world, I guess, but we never really spent much time there in the original show anyways. When we get to Book 3, the first episode makes it a point to explain that Korra is banned from the city for a while, which actually works in her favor since she's now out looking for airbenders. As a result, we get to see a lot of the Earth Kingdom with some old familiar locations as well as a few new ones. The new locations like Zaofu are just plain cool as a concept, but many of the older locations seen in the original show feel completely new as well. We return to the Misty Palms Oasis and the desert, the former of which has seen a cultural revival of sorts, and the latter now having big-ass sand monsters roaming around, which makes this hot hellhole a lot more dangerous than the first time we were here. Ba Sing Se is a classic case of the more things change, the more they stay the same. Even after Aang and Zuko brought peace to the world, they apparently never got around to fixing Ba Sing Se, with the Dai Li still being used as an earthbending Gestapo under the leadership of the Queen, who is the complete opposite of her predecessor. This place is just as corrupt as it used to be, which is actually interesting because you'd think they'd have put a stop to all this after the 100-Year War. The Northern Air Temple just can't seem to catch a break. Since the first time we saw it, it was being desecrated by machines and steam engines, and now it's a big red gooey mess. Even if these locations aren't always used in the best way they could have been, it's just a nice change of pace to be in a different setting every so often as opposed to this boring gray city all the time. The time that we spend away from the city in this season actually makes our return to it in Book 4 all the more fulfilling, since the time skip changes a lot about it and gives it a lot more of a unique feel with the city's infrastructure integrating with the spirit vines, which is heavily set up at the start of Book 3. That's more so praise for Book 4 though, but I'll give it to Book 3 as well just because it takes us out of here. Shifting gears a bit, something that I find underrated about Book 3 is that it's fucking dark, but not too dark, if that makes sense. It hits similar vibes as the original show, but it doesn't pull any punches like the original sometimes did. You know, there are on-screen deaths and torture scenes, but it's all done rather tastefully and without any kind of melodrama. I liked Book 1's vibe, but I won't deny that Tarlok killing Amon and himself was a bit oversold, and Book 2 was a lot lighter in tone despite the stakes being at their absolute highest. Book 3 is dark, but it never revels in that. It's never like, ooh, look how dark and edgy we can be, and every time something dark or edgy does happen, it's done for a specific purpose and doesn't feel out of place or overdone. It's not always the easiest thing to pull off, and I think it's part of why the vibe of the season just feels right. Above all else though, the thing that I love the most about Book 3 is that almost everything in it builds off of Avatar and the rest of the series' history up until that point in some way. Like I mentioned, there's a lot of locations that we return to, and seeing how they've changed expands the world a ton, but the season builds off of the past in other ways as well. The return of the Airbenders builds off of Aang's desire to preserve his culture, as now there is a perfect opportunity for that, which lives on through Tenzin and his family. The city of Zaofu and the introduction of Suyin gives us a bit more insight into what Toph's life was like post-show, and the flashback with Lin only serves to recontextualize how we've always known the character. The Red Lotus exists as a direct response to the White Lotus, who we once knew as a badass secret society that have now become glorified bodyguards. The Red Lotus also recontextualizes Unalaq's actions and makes the previous season make a bit more sense. The introduction of a new combustion bender is a reveal that only makes sense if you know Combustion Man, and lava bending is in a similar boat. The significance of the final scene of Jinora getting her tattoos is emotional on its own for a variety of reasons, but it's 10 times better when you really understand the extent of the Air Nomad genocide and Aang's perspective on it. She literally looks like fucking Aang, bro. Like there's... fuck.
It's so fucking good! Shit!
The point is, a lot of these plot points and lore additions are only effective if you know the context from which they exist. There's a fair bit here that you really only understand if you're already a fan of Avatar and are familiar with the world, which makes this season a massive love letter to Avatar fans in many ways. Overall, Book 3 has very few things that I dislike about it. It is the Legend of Korra at its most focused in pretty much every regard, and I would argue is honestly on par with Book 2 of the original show. It is, as the kids say, kinda peak. I'm autistic and balding. Fuck. So, now on to the final season, Book 4, Balance. It's here that I want to be a little bit more general for a minute and talk about something rather overlooked: the subtitles of each season. Obviously, in Avatar, the seasons were water, earth, and fire, named after the elements Aang was learning and the location of their journey, as well as the time of year. Naturally, air would come next, so Korra's first season opts for the obvious. Air is the element that Korra is learning, it takes place during the fall, and the underlying themes of the season are more about personal freedom and identity, which is perfect for airbending. But now we're out of elements, so where does Book 2 go? Well, being the Avatar has to do with being spiritual, so let's title it Spirits. Again, this tracks pretty one-to-one, as spirits are literally everywhere in the season, season, but it also focuses on many of the Avatar's spiritual duties and what they truly mean. But okay, now we're really out of shit. So Book 3 opts for a more broad concept. Change. This makes perfect sense with the season being all about dealing with the consequences of change. New airbenders appearing, the city being overgrown with spirit vines, changes in leadership with the Earth Queen in comparison to the Earth King, and then the change of a sudden lack of leadership, and Zaheer's general goal being to create a state of constant change. Of course, this is the season that also changes Korra forever, as her fight with Zaheer brings her to her lowest point, which of course leads her to her greatest change. And this brings me to Book 4. Titled Balance. The reason I've been making a point of all of this so far is because this is what the entire series has been building to conceptually. More so than any other season of not just Korra, but Avatar as well, balance is an ever-present motif throughout. Kuvira's rise to power balances out Zaheer creating chaos, but that in turn creates another imbalance when she goes off the rails. It's also about Korra finding balance within herself, detailed in her emotional recovery. While I do want to get much deeper into this as a theme in its own dedicated section, as a writing tool, it really helps things feel conclusive. In a meta sense, this season finds a balance between concluding the remaining character arcs, concluding the story of the season, and concluding the overarching story set in motion when Korra left the portals open. You might even say that everything is connected. The story of Book 4 is rather simple. Kuvira is reunifying the Earth Kingdom and gets out of hand, so Korra has to stop her. But before she can do that, she has to finalize her recovery from her fight with Zaheer. As a result, the season is much more character focused than the last, and it works really well. Book 3 was a lot more plot driven, which was great, but it felt like they went a little overboard with it sometimes. Like, we didn't get enough character moments, so the ones that we do get are really great. I like that Book 4 takes its time to really explore most of its major characters in ways that tie up their arcs, all while the focus isn't unequally split between that and the plot. Of course, we all know how Korra's arc goes, but Bolin's arc comes full circle, Varrick gets some much needed growth, Asami gets literally anything at all, and even Mako gets a little something, even though it wasn't at all where I wanted his character to go. This season strikes a balance, pun intended, between story and characters by giving each character some sort of emotionally driven motivation that thereby moves the plot forward. This doesn't sound like a huge deal, but when you consider that the first 3 seasons struggle with this at times, it definitely makes you appreciate it a lot more. But this season also implements something that I think was very much needed at some point, a time skip. 3 years have passed since the events of Book 3, so the Season 4 premiere feels like a refreshing reintroduction to everybody, most of which get redesigns. Asami wears her hair differently, which helps in making her appear more business savvy. Bolin's all in those Earth Empire duds, and I think it fits him pretty well. It looks pretty badass. Korra's redesign is fucking awesome. The short hair in the Earth Kingdom garb just works really well on her. Mako looks like a fucking bitch. I hate that they took away his spiky hair and his scarf, 2 of his most identifiable visual traits, but you know, I get it, he's in uniform. Still sucks though. The new airbender drip with them fucking wingsuits, bro, that shit's fire, dog. The main crew are all in their early 20s now, and I love that they've essentially grown up with the audience. If you were around Aang's age when Avatar was coming out, you would also likely be around Korra's age when her show was coming out, and seeing these characters age from moody teenagers to young adults really helps you relate to them. Republic City has changed a lot too, and is no longer a boring ass city, since now there's new shit that wasn't there before, like trains, and the city has integrated itself with the spirit vines to become this weird nature punk type vibe. Is that a thing? Is nature punk a thing? I don't know, whatever, it's cool though. I think it might just be me, but I just love post-time skip reintroductions, and I realize how specific of a trope that is, but hey, I'm autistic, what the fuck do you want? But this does bring me to one of my personal biggest gripes with the final season, which is the lack of the crew being all together. While each core member helps out with the battle against Kuvira and had their own character development throughout the season, there are very few times where the main 4 are all together, and it just really rubs me the wrong way, especially because we established in Book 3 that they all work really well as a unit and have a great dynamic, and they could have played with that a bit with the time skip now in place, but they just kinda don't. The closest that we get is Korra, Mako, and Asami having a fun reunion, but the downside is that Bolin's not there, so the dynamic is completely off. I mean, they have Wu, but nobody fucking likes him. Honestly, I think it's just because there's too many characters by this point. We've got secondary characters like Lin and Su, tertiary characters like the Airbender kids, Wing and Wei, Prince Wu, even Hiroshi, and a bunch of background characters all taking part in the final battle, but because there is so many of them and their talents all differ, the main 4 never really have a proper final moment. It didn't even necessarily need to be in battle, but just any moment of them fighting alongside each other would have been great. We actually almost got this moment. Almost. There's a brief scene where Korra takes Mako, Bolin, and Asami on Ugi to go scope out Kuvira's forces before finding out that she's coming early. The scene lasts like 2 minutes tops, and all they really do is be like, look, there it is! Then they just turn around and it's back to battle mode, and the main group is never seen together again, at least on their own. It's actually kind of similar to Avatar's final stretch, where we kind of needed a bit more time with Zuko as the member of the gang, except here it's that we needed a lot more time with the team in general. I just wanted a final moment of Julie's wedding or something, where these 4 just share a moment together as a team, maybe take a picture or something, just anything anything to make me feel like these four were really best friends. I love the vibe, now make me feel the vibe, please. Moving on, one somewhat minor criticism I have is that despite the whole point of Kuvira's rise to power being to paint her and her ideology in a negative light, the way they initially handle this is kinda stupid. It's actually kind of akin to Book 1 with the Equalists, but much less egregious. When Kuvira is first introduced, we see that she is protecting the Earth Kingdom from bandits, and though her methods are unorthodox, she does seem to be bringing stability to these towns rather effectively. It's mentioned by other characters that when Kuvira leaves these towns, bad things happen, hence why a lot of people see her in a negative light, but the problem with that is that for the audience, this makes no fucking sense. We never actually see what happens to these towns after Kuvira leaves. In fact, I'd be willing to bet that they're probably fine considering the Earth Kingdom hasn't imploded into itself again. There's an implication that she's getting these cities to join her, helping them initially, and then something bad happens, but we don't know what bad even is here. Is she just pulling her troops and then leaving them to die again? Is she subjugating the people into slave labor or something? We later see that she sends non-Earth Kingdom natives into labor camps, and while that is extremely fucked, that was never initially implied. Until this point, it seems like Opal and this governor are kinda just mad for no fucking reason. I find it hard to believe that she was leaving things worse than she found them, since that would be completely antithetical to her entire goal. I mean, regardless of all of that, her later actions are what makes her evil, but if they really wanted to sell that, they should have given us more context as to how Kuvira really does change lives for the worse. And speaking of dumb bullshit, let's talk about the spirit cannon and the giant mech. This shit is so fucking dumb. And I love it for that. Like, okay, right, I could totally understand the Season 1 mechs because in this new, and excuse the bad word here, steampunk setting, they made sense. I could also buy a spirit cannon that absorbs spiritual energy from a spiritual source and essentially recreates Vatu's fucking Gallic gun, because the inspiration for it in-universe makes sense and it's just fantasy enough that I could live with it. I draw the fucking line at Kuvira's giant mech. I like the explanation that it's made of the platinum walls of Zaofu, but how in the fuck do they control this thing? I mean, I know it's technically metal bending and that concept has been pushed to its absolute limits throughout this season in the coolest way possible, but I just can't imagine that with their, and excuse my use of this term again, steampunk technology, that this would be realistic. It's just a bit too big of a jump from what we're used to in the Avatar world. That being said, I think that this thing is fucking awesome. I love that Kuvira using the walls of Zaofu to build this is the ultimate fuck you to Suyin, and the irony of technological innovation being the thing that tries to destroy a city known for its technological innovation. And like I said, metal bending is pushed to its absolute limits with what can be done with it, and while the mech is a bit of an extreme example of that, they really get creative with it, which I really love. But since we're on the subject of wacky shit, the new spirit portal. What the fuck?
What the fuck?
Brian Griffin, Family Guy. I mean, it's cool as fuck, don't get me wrong, but like a lot of stuff in this season, it just makes no goddamn sense. The new portal is created when Korra stops the spirit cannon blast and presumably bends the energy in such a way that it breaks through the fucking dimensions somehow. I mean, it's cool. But why? I mean, I'm not gonna bitch about it because not everything needs to be a detailed explanation. I've bitched about other things enough, but this shit's a little bit too crazy in kind of the best way possible, if you know what I mean. But okay, let's finally talk about Korrasami. Gee, if that isn't the fucking 12th time we've done that on this fucking channel. Fucking dumb bitch. Except unlike the last 12 times we've talked about this, we're actually gonna talk about all of it this time. Unlike the last few times, there will be no half measures, and that's on finger. It's no secret that I am totally down for Korrasami. Granted, I don't particularly care about ships, but it's so tertiary to anything else going on in the show that I see it as a neat bonus, you know? Like, I don't really mind it, I'm down with the gays, it's fine, right? That being said though, I do wish it was written a little bit better, namely in the setup. While there are clear hints throughout the latter two seasons, none of them are overtly obvious, likely due to network restrictions. As we all know by now, Mike and Brian wanted to make this much more cut and dry, but Nickelodeon said no until basically the last minute, but even then it was left pretty ambiguous so they could still air it in foreign markets. I don't think we should use this as an excuse, but it's certainly important to consider that the writers actually wanted to push things further, but just weren't allowed to, so I don't necessarily fault them for this. The final season was also coming out in 2014, which was right before social justice movements and LGBT acceptance started being more publicly known, so it's understandable how some would have completely missed this. That being said, the fact is that any moments hinting toward these two having romantic feelings for each other are super subtle that they are really easy to miss if you aren't paying attention or are watching through a strictly heteronormative lens. I legitimately can't believe I just said heteronormative unironically. I want to fucking bash my head in with a lead plate. Some of these moments include, but are not limited to, Korra and Asami bonding over their shared experiences with Mako, the two sharing a large amount of screen time together in Book 3 where they are very open with each other, Korra writing back letters to Asami but none of her other friends during her recovery, Korra blushing and playing with her hair when Asami compliments it, Asami offers Korra tea under the pretense that she must be cold when this woman is literally a firebender and is from the literal South Pole, and of course the final moments of the series consist of the two finding comfort in each other. When I say it out loud, there's actually a decent chunk there, but when you actually watch the show, these things aren't so obvious, and that's definitely why a lot of fans thought that it came out of left field. That, and the final shot of the two entering the spirit portal is so fucking ambiguous that the creators literally needed to come out and confirm it after the fact. And again, I know, network restrictions and all that, but like, come the fuck on. If this show were being made even just a year later, I think it would have been way more overt. But this leads into another source of discussion though. Korra Asami is often praised and criticized for the way it represents a gay relationship, and I can definitely see both sides. On one hand, it's great that they were able to show as much as they did at a time where gay cartoon characters weren't very common, and when they did exist, they were often the butt of the joke, which, while it can be pretty funny, isn't a great depiction. By Korra and Asami getting together, they became one of the earliest gay couples in Western animation to be taken seriously, and were definitely the first in children's animation. The fact that it isn't really made out to be a huge deal that they're bisexual is also great in terms of representation, because now we're treating this same-sex couple the same as any hetero couple, essentially putting all orientations on the same level. On the other hand, though, the fact that these two were only revealed to be bisexual in the literal last 30 seconds of the show, and very ambiguously at that, caused some fans to feel that they were being queer-baited. Many fans were watching to see if Korra and Asami would get together, and when all they get is some hand-holding, I think they have a right to be a little bit upset. While I don't think Mike and Brian had any ill intent with this might have been the reason Nickelodeon held out for so long, since they could trick fans into thinking there's more gay shit than there actually was. Plus, if they really did want to represent a gay relationship the same way they would a straight one, why is it that the gays get the happily ever after ending, while almost all the other straight relationships are shown to have some kind of problem? To many fans, this pairing was seemingly made at the last minute in order to pander to a demographic of fans that already wanted this relationship to become canon, making it feel forced and awkward. Now, if you want my take, I don't care. Well, I care enough to dedicate a 5-minute segment to it, but you know what I fucking mean. I think it's pretty obvious here that nobody involved in the canonization of Korra Asami had any ill intentions, with the only exception being maybe Nickelodeon, but with how they treat the ship now in their marketing, I think it's safe to say that they're now okay with that decision. Is it the best form of representation out there? No. There's too little of it in the show itself to really say much at all, and it's pretty sloppily written overall. But there's not really enough there to get particularly excited or mad about, so I think both camps are taking this way more seriously than it needs to be. At the end of the day, Korra and Asami are canon, and they will forever get bragging rights for being the first gay couple in a kid's show. But who gives a fuck about the show when their relationship is way better in the comics anyways?
By the way, Mom, I'm gay! What's up? Woo!
Overall, though, Book 4 is definitely the second best of the 4, only being beaten out by Book 3, and I think most fans would likely agree with that. You know, not that I rank this shit because who the fuck cares, but, you know, perspective, I guess, right? Anyways, the reason for this is that while Season 4 has a lot of great shit in it, its writing is much less consistent than Season 3. They took some characters in weird directions, the story would sometimes derail and feel disconnected from the main conflict, the pacing was really slow in the middle section, no doubt made worse by the recap episode, and a few other odds and ends that keep it from ascending to the top. That being said though, I always go back and forth between if I like Book 3 or 4 better, and that's always a toss-up because they complement and build off of each other so nicely that it's really hard to say. Book 4 though has the added benefit of being an ending, and I am a sucker for endings, man. Especially endings that tie the entire series together thematically and basically solidifies the entire point of the whole show. Good transition. Korra has a lot of good and a lot of bad in terms of its larger writing, but I am personally able to look past all of that, since The Legend of Korra is a very thematically rich show. In my personal opinion, the theme, the point, the message, whatever the fuck you want to call it, of a piece of art is the most important thing about it. And this is something that Korra nails just as well as its predecessor does. It is very multifaceted in what it's trying to say, and the viewer can interpret a great deal from it. That being said, I may repeat myself a little bit in this section because much of the series themes do stem from Korra's arc and the lessons that she personally learns, so I'll try to avoid the repetition as much as I can. But then again, it's been like 3.5 hours, so, you know, it might have been a while. I might need to refresh you or something. Fucking hell, this video's long. Themes. Emotional. Gotta get emotional. Gotta get a little bit emotional. I'm getting a little emotional today. I'm getting a little bit fucking gay. Firstly, each season seems to have been made with a specific theme in mind, and the stories seem to develop around this, but Book 1 in particular is a lot more disconnected than the other three, so let's start with that and go off the rails from there. Book 1 is very much about identity in a much larger way than the rest of the show. Of course, this is present all throughout Korra's character arc throughout the series, but can be seen more broadly with the rest of the story in Season 1. Each character has some sort of identity crisis at one point or another. Tenzin is so obsessed with being the only legacy of Aang, but has to accept that Korra is his legacy too. Asami is forced to confront the idea that she is not like her father and makes the choice to become her own person. Lin questions who she is, if not the police chief. Mako questions his true feelings for Korra and Asami, and Bolin is constantly in conflict with how he is perceived by others. Amon and Tarlok both conceal their true identities for different reasons, and the whole premise of Amon's crusade is stripping people's identities from them. The world and the actions of other people shape how we view ourselves and determine who we truly are. In a different vein, Book 1 is also about society, Joker style, more specifically how society is affected by the will of the people. Tarlok is a prime example of a corrupt government official, and as we see, he is not above weaponizing and mobilizing people for personal gain the same way that Amon does. Amon mobilizes people to push back against society, while Tarlok uses them to maintain society, both in their own twisted ways where they also wish to achieve more power. This negatively affects everyone, since now these two opposing forces create a divide between the people, which just leads to conflict and no real solutions. It's clear that nobody within the city's government really cared about solving the bender versus non-bender issue, and instead of finding a compromise to establish peace, the divide was let to fester, which only led to further injustices. We cannot trust government officials to hear out our grievances because they are almost always corrupt and power-hungry like Tarlok, too preoccupied like Tenzin, or just straight-up pushovers like the rest of these unnamed fucks. The series shows how this divide happens, but not how it ends, and I think it can be inferred that the way to actually get anything done is to rise above the divides they want and mobilize together for an even better cause, even if that means going outside of the law. This got a bit political though, so let's tone it down a bit. Not really though, 7 Nation Army moment, baby, woo! It's no secret that this is a very politically charged show. It's not crazy in your face about it, but it's much more present here than it was in Avatar. As I and everyone else is quick to point out, the villains all have political motivations and are seemingly designed to represent a particular political ideology. Amon is an egalitarian in the most literal sense. Unalaq seems to want a theocracy of some kind, Zaheer is an anarchist, and Kuvira is a dictator, potentially even a fascist. We already discussed at length the specifics of how these four truly represent their respective ideologies, but they aren't the only ones. I touched briefly on how Varrick manifests the absolute worst in capitalism, and before his change of heart, this was seemingly done with the intention of showing how easily manipulated a capitalist system can be. It's played for laughs, sure, but there's always a level of understanding that his actions aren't exactly the most morally sound. In a similar vein, pretty much every world leader in this show is depicted in a negative light in some way. Like we discussed, Suyin is extremely hypocritical in this regard, displaying how some people are just not meant to lead. Republic City's council is a dysfunctional mess, and they are later replaced with a democratically elected president. But this is not necessarily an appraisal of democracy, because it's made very clear that President Raiko is a cowardly, uncaring, and incompetent leader. He refuses to help in the Water Tribe Civil War, he kicks Korra out of the city for literally trying to help people, surrenders to Kuvira at the first sign of conflict, and is just generally an asshole. While he claims it's for the safety of his citizens, he clearly only cares about re-election since he does everything in his power to make himself look good, regardless of if that was the best decision or not. The Earth Queen is equally as inept, but she's also batshit insane. She is the epitome of spoiled, eccentric royalty with no regard for her citizens, the worst case scenario for any monarchy. She just plain sucks, and I'm glad Zaheer guzzled the air from her fucking throat.
I love it when kids sit on my fucking throat.
When Prince Wu is brought into the fold as heir to the throne, he instead opts to abolish the monarchy in favor of a democracy, but I don't think the writers meant this in the same way they did with Raiko. A democracy can lead to bad leaders, but it can also lead to good ones. It's just up to the people, and I think that's what Wu really had in mind. I think a lot of the fan outcry about how effectively these ideologies are displayed is often very misunderstood, because the show isn't saying, hey, there's pros and cons to all of these, but rather, hey, all this political shit is stupid, let's just fucking treat each other as people. It's not about any particular ideology being right or wrong, it's about showing that when people have the foresight to come together in favor of bettering their lives, that there is no form of government that can ever stop them.
7 Nation Army, baby! Boom, 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 boom.
I'm gay. Like we discussed, Book 2 has the subtitle of Spirits, and while in a literal sense, yes, that is what the season is about, thematically, I think it's more about progress, and this carries through the rest of the series as well. While nature and tradition versus innovation is something the entire Avatar series deals with to varying degrees, I think Book 2 is the clearest example of this, since the whole Spirit World plotline deals with how the past, which is also to say tradition, is sometimes wrong. The Glacier Spirits Festival used to be a more religious event, but over time that meaning became lost, much to the chagrin of the spirits, and Unalaq wishes to re-establish this tradition. Korra wants to close the portals because that's just what Wan did, but then considers that doing so for that reason alone is kind of stupid and that it should be left to the current generation. This can also be seen to a lesser degree in Book 4 with the Spirit Cannon. Varrick creates it by accident after trying to build a power source inspired by Vatu's attack, and they end up turning it into a weapon which is eventually used to destroy half the city. They fucked with nature using technology in a way that they weren't supposed to, and it bit them straight in the ass. Of course, there are also the heavier ways in which this theme is present, and one is in regards to the return of the Airbenders. Like we discussed with Tenzin, the new Air Nation, by virtue of their creation, cannot be exactly like the old one. Their teachings and culture may live on through the scripture they've left behind, but the true way that they lived will be forever lost. Tenzin realizes this and instead tries to modernize the Airbenders, both by leaning into tradition and moving away from it at the same time. Nations and cultures evolve, and it was long past due for the Airbenders to get with the times. I mean, it's kind of hard to do when you're all 6 feet under, but you get the vibe. In a similar vein to this, Korra is also a show about modernization, and how old traditions adapt in a rapidly evolving world. Of course, there's the increasing use of technology that in some ways replaces the need for bending that used to be the norm. Bending has been traditionally used for a lot of things and has become ingrained into how the world works, but of course, not everybody can do it. So now technology has been developed for the purpose of allowing non-benders to do the same things that benders can. This coincides with a distinct change in the fighting styles of each element, as unlike Avatar, where there is a heavy emphasis on the use of traditional styles, the fighting in Korra is much more modern, resembling shit like MMA and boxing. The tradition of benders learning to bend the right way has seemingly eroded as technology became more common, resulting in much less rigid fighters among the younger generation, while the older characters almost always use the traditional styles. There's a generational gap of sorts, and while this doesn't necessarily mean that the core martial arts of bending are going anywhere, they're definitely going to be less common among regular citizens going forward. And lastly for this theme, the purpose of the Avatar is brought into question all throughout the series. It's been an ageless tradition for thousands of years, but after Avatar Aang created a time of peace for the world, what reason is there for Korra to even exist? At least, that's the issue that the Society of Republic City, and to a lesser extent the rest of the world, raises. Is there a place for an Avatar in a world that's close to full globalization and doesn't have massive wars between nations anymore? With these spirit portals now open, what purpose is there for a bridge between the worlds? Has society gotten to a point where it no longer needs the Avatar and can function on its own? In some ways, this can be viewed as a redemption story. Not in the Zuko sense where he was bad but now he's good, but rather of proving yourself in a world that doesn't necessarily like you. Time and time again, Korra needs to face the public perception of herself, and most of the time, it's not very favorable. She's pretty hit or miss with the citizens of Republic City, the president doesn't really like her, nor does the Earth Queen, and when she goes on hiatus, people seem to have forgotten that she even exists. Korra needs to prove herself to these people, that even though they might not like her or the way she handles things, that she is the Avatar, and you gotta deal with it. You know, people might not want the Avatar around anymore, they might think that they don't need one because of how the world has modernized, but the Avatar will always be necessary, because as long as there is imbalance in the world, the Avatar must be there to correct it, because the Avatar is meant to be the best of us. Through all of the innovation and modernization that the world goes through, the Avatar is the one thing that grounds us to the past and paves the way for the future. As we all know from Avatar, everything is connected, and this idea is also played within Korra in a few interesting ways. Of course, the swamp represents connection and how we're all connected in some way, and Korra expands on this by now having this connection more closely tied to the other broad concept of balance. This is shown in a literal sense when Kuvira's empire starts tearing down the swamp for resources. The swamp and the spirits react negatively to this upset in balance, which thereby leads to further imbalance. Even before that, harmonic convergence somehow gave people airbending, resulting in the rebirth of an entire nation. Nature is quite literally fighting back against and actively correcting imbalance because it's all connected in ways that we can't even comprehend. Nature is healing. Going back to the swamp, it's here that Korra meets Toph, which has a lot of layers to it. For one, this is the new Avatar meeting the friend of the old Avatar, and subsequently being trained by her in the same way. These two were simply destined to meet again, and as it turns out, friendships can last more than one lifetime. On another layer, these two meet at the swamp, the very place where Aang first saw Toph before they even met. Toph's ability to see with earthbending makes the swamp perfect for her, as she can see the entire world through the vines, making her less blind than most people. Of course, this is a lesson that she passes on to Korra, which she learns a little bit differently than Aang. When Aang sat at the Banyan Grove tree, he learned on a literal and metaphysical level how everything is connected. We are all people, time and death are illusions, all that big brain shit. Korra takes this lesson a bit more personally though. She understands that everything is physically connected and even a bit on a spiritual level, but in her hiatus fails to do so emotionally. As Toph says,
"Your problem is you've been disconnected for too long. Disconnected from the people who love you and disconnected from yourself."
It's here that Korra learned that she has lost who she is, and to reconnect with herself, she first needs to reconnect with others. If everything is connected, then there is no such thing as solitude. But now let's get deep and spiritual on some fucking real shit. Much like its predecessor, Korra is about cycles, but it has a specific focus on the cycle of death and rebirth, and how that manifests itself in different ways. Each villain minus Amon all seek to rebuild what has been destroyed, another form of death and rebirth. Unalaq and Zaheer, in their own respective twisted ways, both sought to destroy our current way of life in order to establish peace in the aftermath, and Kuvira sought to rebuild the crumbling Earth Kingdom. However, a much more underlying theme in this vein is that death and rebirth does not necessarily mean the destruction of the old and formation of the new, but can rather be as simple as changing what is already there. I think an interesting lens to view this through is with the villains and how they reflect Rava and Vaatu and their dichotomy of order versus chaos. Again, while this doesn't quite apply to Amon unless you want to stretch it a bit, this theme is present in Book 2 onwards. Zaheer and Kuvira are the clearest to see, as they each sought to bring extreme chaos and extreme order respectively, as a way to establish establish their ideas of balance. These two complement each other in this way, as they are both two extremes the same way that Rava and Vaatu are. Vaatu and Zaheer wanted to establish chaos, while Kuvira, much like Rava, wanted to create order. But like we see, neither side ends very well. Unalaq had a perverted view of the relationship between Rava and Vaatu, believing that Vaatu deserves to go free and unleash chaos for 10,000 years to balance out Rava's reign, and he seeks to even it out further by becoming the Dark Avatar. He did not understand the difference between order and balance, as in the context of change, the two are actually very different. And that's really what this is all about. Change. I mean, it's literally the subtitle of book 3. It's not exactly a secret, you know? Something that Korra learns throughout the latter 3 books is that maintaining balance requires there to be change. There are times where the very thing that Korra thinks will upset the balance is actually the very thing the world needs in order to change. Leaving the spirit portals open is one such instance, where the original goal was to close them again, but Korra leaves them open because it's a change the world needed to maintain balance in the long run. The Earth Queen's death sent the Earth Kingdom into chaos, but without that big change, Kuvira would have never taken over, and if she hadn't been defeated, then Wu wouldn't have abolished the monarchy and established a democracy. Mako's journey is about changing his view of people, since we must accept that others change over time in order to change ourselves to maintain that personal balance. But more obviously is Korra's journey, as she must accept that she has changed a lot, some ways good, some ways bad, and therefore she must course correct to maintain her inner balance. And I think that leads me into my final theme of the day. Much like its predecessor, The Legend of Korra is about spirituality, but Korra takes a different approach to the topic than Avatar did. Spiritualism isn't just being connected to the spirits, whatever the fuck that means, but rather is about discovering who you are and reaching some form of self-actualization. While this is present in Avatar to some degree, Aang was kinda already there for the most part, so many of his spiritual experiences were much more literal. In Korra, this is much more prominent, so above all else, The Legend of Korra is a show about being human, shown through the lens of Korra's character arc. Without repeating what I said at the very beginning of this video, Korra's journey is that of discovering her identity in a world that constantly challenges that identity. She greatly values her bending and it shapes who she is, so how does she react when she loses that piece of her? She gains access to the Avatar state and becomes a fully realized Avatar, so how does that further change how she views herself? When she is in a more zen state of mind and is ready to help, how does she react when the people she's trying to protect reject her for who she is and what she's done? When she almost dies doing her job, how does she mentally recover from that? And how does her view of that job change? While we've already discussed the answers to these questions earlier, I think it's clear to see that Korra's identity, her perception of herself, changes drastically as the series progresses, and she comes out of it with a much more well-rounded personality. She begins as stubborn, aggressive, eager, and kinda spoiled at times, but through her struggles became much more caring, compassionate, and understanding of even her worst enemies. She once viewed herself as the unstoppable Avatar who nobody could step to, but ends up realizing that she is just as vulnerable as anyone else. And that is the key to understanding this show. Korra, through finding out more about herself and who she really is, becomes more and more human. You know, recall the old saying, Aang was a good person who needed to be the Avatar, Korra was an Avatar who needed to be a good person. To be a good person is to be human and understand that everyone else is human too. Being human is experiencing extreme misfortune and being able to bounce back. It is reaching our lowest point, but being open to the greatest change. Like I've been saying, The Legend of Korra is a thematically rich show, but I feel that not many people truly understand it. You know, people always talk about how The Legend of Korra is mature and has mature themes, and while that is certainly the case, labeling them as mature themes and praising it on that merit alone misses the fucking point, if you ask me. This is also present with the original show as well, but just to a much lesser degree. For whatever reason, people love to circle jerk around how mature the show is without actually understanding why it's mature. Like, yeah, you know, it handles realistic topics like trauma and politics, and in the case of the original show, genocide and war, but these things aren't mature because they're adult or whatever, they're mature because of how the show represents them. The ideas are presented in a way where the nuance of the situation is put on full display. The villains often have a point, and the heroes don't always make the right calls, and the beauty of that is that it's up to the viewer to decide who was right and who was wrong. You know, a lot of fans think that Kuvira was actually based for reuniting the Earth Kingdom, or that Korra was wrong for leaving the spirit portals open. And those are both equally valid interpretations because the show indirectly makes a case for both of them by showing the good and bad that comes from them. It's not mature because it's dark, you know, fucking top 10 darkest moments in kids shows, fucking head ass. It's mature because at no point does it tell the viewer what the right answer is, even though there technically is one. Unfortunately though, despite the hype around the series when it was first coming out and the many things it would later become known for, The Legend of Korra was vastly corporately mistreated by Nickelodeon. As is common knowledge within the fandom, the series was originally intended to be a 12-episode miniseries. Book 1 was originally all it was intended to be, but before the series even premiered, Nick ended up renewing Korra for 14 more episodes. Before production on the second season was even finished, Nick ordered 26 more episodes, resulting in books 3 and 4 also starting production at the exact same time. time. This was clearly a lot of pressure put on the creative team, as they were literally working on 3 seasons of television at once, which as far as I'm aware, is kind of unheard of in the industry. While this likely added to the cohesion of ideas between these seasons, I highly doubt that it was healthy for the team, whether that be creatively or in terms of crunch, and I'd be willing to bet that this is why Mike and Brian have taken such a long break from the franchise since then. When you consider how messy this production cycle was, it makes sense that the show itself was just as messy. There are gaps that aren't filled and a bunch of stuff that could have been really easily fixed if the team had more episodes to work with, more time to work on them, and a regular production cycle. In a marketing sense, the first 2 seasons of Korra were advertised quite frequently. New episode premieres for books 2 and 3 received primetime slots, and clearly the series was popular enough in book 1 to renew it for more episodes in the very strange way that they did it, despite its Saturday morning time slot. They realized that it could be their next big hitter the same way that Avatar was. However, there also exists this little thing that I like to call the SpongeBob effect, which describes the way that Nickelodeon treats any animated show that isn't immediately making the same levels of money that SpongeBob does. When they realize this, they essentially leave that series to die. New episodes will be given terrible time slots, barely advertised, or shipped off to Nicktoons Network. This has happened to plenty of shows in Nick's history, most recently Rise of the TMNT, and this is almost exactly what happened to Korra. In fact, it's actually a pretty unique case, with the first half of Book 3 premiering 2 episodes per week, and every episode from the second half of Book 3 onward not even premiering on TV, instead opting for an online streaming release. Reminder that this was at a time just before Netflix and streaming in general was really popping off, so this was like a double death sentence at the time. It may seem weirdly ahead of its time to ship off one of its best shows quality-wise to online streaming as some exclusivity thing, but we all know that it was a money thing. Despite its crazy production cycle and Nick not really giving it the chance, it's honestly a miracle this show came out as good as it did. In kind of an ironic twist, having low ratings on TV causing the show to be moved to streaming was exactly what it needed, since apparently the show did way better online than it ever did on TV. And in some ways, that's for the best, because it allowed the fandom to thrive in a way that it otherwise wouldn't have, but at the same time, you'll rarely ever see Korra associated with Nickelodeon at large because it doesn't really fit in with all the network's other programming at the time, or even now. They had every reason to drop the ball, and Nick had every reason to cancel it, but somehow it persevered, and I think that's pretty thematically fitting. So, we've just spent several hours talking about the Legend of Korra, and if you've made it this far, you're fucking insane, but also, you're a real one. Smash that like button. If you haven't smashed the like button yet, what the fuck are you doing? You know, it's no secret that I'm rather passionate about how people view this show, and I know a lot of you are as well, with my Defending Korra video obviously being my most popular Avatar video to date. You know, assuming last week's one didn't pop off, but I don't know yet, because it doesn't exist yet. Anyways though, because of that video, I've always viewed the series through that defensive lens, and as a fan, it's sometimes hard not to. I've tried to avoid, you know, like, defending the show throughout this video, and while I've definitely broken once or twice throughout the video and gone defense mode, and yes, I am, in fact, spitting, I think this is a horrible lens to view the show through. If all you look for in it is flaws that people could potentially twist into hatred, or for things that disprove some of the common criticisms, you completely miss the point of the show. I know that some people took the message of my original Korra video to heart a little bit too much, so let me just set the record straight right here. Korra is nowhere close to being a perfect show. There are so many problems: missed opportunities, writing flaws, pacing issues, focus issues, characters that got too much and ones that got too little, and all of those are very valid critiques. But the whole point of the show is that we need to find balance within ourselves in order to become better people, and I think we should apply this in a meta context for Korra. Pointing out its flaws and defending the show when it needs to be are fine, but when you stray too far into either direction, you become either a cynic or a fanatic, and neither of those are a good lens to view media through. I have been on both ends of it with this series. I was an avid fucking psycho who refused to hear anything negative about the show around the time I made the original video. Sometime before that video, I was fully on board the whole season 2 bad train, and after the video, I became much more aware of the validity of a lot of the show's larger criticisms. In experiencing both sides of that spectrum, I have since reached a middle ground with it, where I can acknowledge what it gets wrong, but also appreciate what it gets right, as cliche as that sounds. Much like Korra herself, I came to view things with a more balanced perspective, and I love the show way more now because of it. Through my back and forth with it, I've gained an understanding of the show that I don't think many people really have, and while that's kind of pretentious to say, I think this video stands as proof of that. I've learned to just feel the vibe of the show, if you know what I mean, right? I'm in such a zen place with it that whenever I sit down to rewatch it, which is very rarely because I'm very fucking busy these days, I don't notice all the, you know, stupid dumb flaws or feel the need to justify and defend every tiny detail. And once you stop viewing the show through that lens, you can see it for what it truly is and understand what it's truly saying. And you know what? While I'm at it, if I ever have to read anything along the lines of, yeah, Korra isn't as good as Avatar, but ever again, I'm gonna fucking lose it. Like, yeah, we know. Please shut the fuck up. Like, why the fuck do you need to preface any praise of the show with a disclaimer that it's not as good as the other show? The fact that we collectively feel the need to do this is just fucking tiring. You add absolutely nothing to the discussion when you say this. In fact, you actually detract from it because now everybody's thinking about how good Avatar is without actually viewing Korra for what it is. You know, it can't exist in a vacuum, but it certainly can exist without being compared to its predecessor every fucking time. And I don't say this at all as like a whole like, well guys, can you please not compare this to the show that's obviously better? That's simply just not fair. Because that's fucking dumb, right? If you think the show is good, just say that it's good. You don't need to preface it with an acknowledgement of its flaws. This isn't even a Korra specific thing anymore. This is just general. Shut the fuck up, please.
But anywho,
this show is very flawed in a lot of ways, but it also excels in so many others, and that is exactly why I love it. There's so much depth to every aspect of this show. You know, Korra, the villains and their politics, the multitude of themes, and the callbacks to Avatar in the least soy Reddit way possible. The fact that I've been able to talk about this show for as long as I have today with mostly praise and the occasional good faith criticism is very telling with how much is truly here, and to deny that is just kind of fucking insane. Korra's journey mirrors the show's journey in many ways, where it's flawed. You know, it has problems that keep it from being the best it can be, but they work through those problems and rise above them by accentuating their own strengths. I do not give a fuck about what anyone says about it anymore, because I still love this series, and I cannot deny that I always get a little bit teary-eyed when I hear those last 5 notes. I've been MattCMG, and I'll see you next week. Thanks for watching.
My name is Korra. I'm the Avatar.
I'm the Avatar! You gotta deal with it!
You are the Avatar.
I don't know what that is. The cycle is over. I'm the last Avatar.
People used to think I was unstoppable, but now they don't think I'm capable of anything.
I am trying to understand why this happened to me, but nothing makes any sense. I'm tired, Katara. I'm so tired.
Do not give in to darkness. You are the Avatar.
I've realized that even though we should learn from those who came before us, we must also forge our own path. My mission will always be to use Rava's light spirit to guide the world toward peace and balance.
You think you're finally able to forget about what Zaheer did to you?
No, but I am finally able to accept what happened, and I think that's gonna make me stronger.
When we hit our lowest point, we are open to the greatest change.
I know I was in a pretty dark place after I was poisoned, but I finally understand why I had to go through all that. I needed to understand what true suffering was, so I could become more compassionate to others, even to people like Kuvira.
My name is Juan, and I will show you how I became the first Avatar.
I'm the worst Avatar ever. I just feel alone.
There is nothing else I can teach you. You are the Avatar.
I'll follow you into battle no matter how crazy things get.
I've never had a girlfriend to hang out with and talk to before, except for Naga.
You are one of a kind, Korra. But we're still a team! The new Team Avatar!
We got your back, Korra.
My name is Korra. I'm the Avatar.